What if Harry Potter was raised by Frank Castle the Punisher to wage a one-man war on wizarding crime? A Savage Harry crossover 7 chapters. Chapter 1 Godric's Hollow Killing. Welcome to Savage Harry. Today's adventure. What if Harry Potter was raised by Frank Castle the Punisher to wage a one-man war on wizarding crime? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin. October 31, 1981. Godric's Hollow, rain. Frank Castle sits at a window in a rented cottage 300 meters off the lane. Bottle of Irish whiskey on the sill, half full, maybe half empty. He stopped tracking that maths. He stopped tracking a lot of math the day they buried Maria, the day they buried Lisa, the day they buried Frank Jr. He drinks, he watches the road, he does not feel the cold, he does not feel the damp wool on his back, he does not feel his own hands. Frank feels nothing because feeling something is a luxury he cannot pay for, and the few times he has tried, the bill has come due in places that bleed. He thinks about the playground sometimes, not on purpose. The thought arrives the way bills arrive in the mail. He is in the kitchen of the cottage, frying an egg, and he is also in Central Park, hand in hand with Lisa, walking past the carousel toward the seal pool, and Lisa is asking him what kind of fish a seal eats, and he is saying, I think mostly herring, baby, and Lisa is saying, what is a herring? And the egg burns black in the pan, and the kitchen fills with smoke, and Frank stands at the stove and does not move, and the alarm above the door goes off, and he does not move, and the smoke detector goes for 9 minutes before he lifts a hand to wave it off. That is what feeling does. Feeling burns the egg, so he stopped, so he sits, so he watches the road. England was a mistake. The English countryside was a worse one. He came here because Kurt told him to come here. Kurt said, Frank, you need to be somewhere that doesn't remind you of New York. Kurt said, Frank, you need to drink a continent away from anyone you might hurt. Kurt was right about both of those things and wrong about one thing. Kurt thought that distance fixes a man. Distance just gives him longer roads on which to keep being the same man he was. So Frank sits, Frank drinks, Frank watches. There is a house down the lane, white siding, roses out front, dead now in October. A young couple lives in it, a baby. Frank has seen them 3 times. The father is tall and laughs too loud. The mother has red hair and walks like she owns the road, even when she's pushing a pram. The baby is dark-haired. The baby smiles at strangers. Frank knows the kind of stupid hope that goes into a baby that smiles at strangers. Frank has buried that hope twice already. The clock on the kitchen wall says 10 of 8 when Frank sees the man on the road. He sees him because Frank watches roads. That is muscle memory. He cannot stop watching roads. He cannot stop counting silhouettes against tree lines. He cannot stop clocking cars by their headlight spread. The man on the road has no car. The man on the road wears black, long coat, tall. Walking like a man who does not believe other men will see him. Frank sets the bottle down. The man stops at the gate of the white-sided house. The man does something with his hand. Frank cannot tell what, a gesture maybe. The gate opens. The man walks up the path. Frank stands. He stands because 30 years of being Frank Castle has taught him that men in long coats who walk up paths at 8 o'clock at night to houses with babies in them are not selling Bibles. Frank stands, and Frank picks up the M1911 he keeps inside his belt and the .45 he keeps on the table and the Browning high power he keeps in a shoulder rig that he never quite takes off, even sleeping, even drinking, even now. Frank goes out the back door. The rain is steady. The grass is long. Frank crosses 2 fields and a stone wall and is at the back of the white-sided house in less than 3 minutes. He is breathing through his nose. His vision has narrowed. His hands have stopped shaking, which they have not stopped doing for 9 months, but they have stopped now because this is work, and Frank does not shake when there is work. He hears the front door far off. He hears a man's voice. Cold voice like a knife drawn slow from a sheath. The voice says something Frank cannot make out. Then there is a flash of green at the front windows. Green, not muzzle flash, not lightning, green like a chemical flare, green like the inside of a sick man's eye. The flash lasts a half second, and then the inside of the white-sided house is dark again, and Frank hears the soft sound of a body hitting the floor. Frank goes up the back porch. The back door is unlocked. He pushes it open with his offhand. His shooting hand has the Browning out and low and forward, and his head is doing what his head does, which is photograph the room in a single sweep. Kitchen, table set for 3, kettle on the stove, high chair pushed back from the table. Crayon drawings on the fridge. He goes through the kitchen. He goes through the hallway. The tall man is on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. The tall man is dead. The tall man's eyes are open. There is no blood on him. There is no wound on him. He looks like a man who was switched off mid-sentence. Frank has never seen a body like this. Frank has seen a lot of bodies. This is a new one. Frank goes up the stairs. He goes up the stairs the way he was taught. Tight to the wall, weapon high, offhand on the rail for balance and not for noise. The stairs do not creak under him. He has shifted his weight the way the seal who trained him at Bragg told him to shift his weight. Heel to toe outside edge first. At the top of the stairs there is a door, the door is open, light spills from it. There is the cold voice again. The cold voice says, "Stand aside, you silly girl, stand aside." A woman's voice says, "Not Harry, please not Harry." A pause. The cold voice says, "Stand aside now." The woman's voice says, "Not Harry, please, I'll do anything." A pause. The cold voice says, "This is my last warning." The woman's voice does not waver. The woman's voice says, "Not Harry, please, have mercy." Have mercy. Frank is 2 steps from the door. He hears the green flash before he sees it. There is a sound to it that is not exactly a sound. It is the absence of sound. It is what the universe sounds like when somebody pulls a plug. He steps into the doorway. The woman is on the floor, red hair on white carpet, hands stretched toward the crib. The crib is across the room. In the crib there is a baby. The baby is sitting up. The baby's eyes are very green and very awake. The baby is not crying. The baby is looking at the man in the long coat who has his back turned to the door, who is raising a long, thin piece of wood toward the baby. Frank shoots him. The Browning High Power has 13 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. Frank puts 6 of them into the man's back. Center mass, tight group. The first round hits between the shoulder blades. The second drifts a half-inch left, the rest cluster. Frank has put 6 rounds into a man's back at 15 feet 1,000 times in training and 100 times in Vietnam and twice in New York, and he knows what a man should do when he takes 6 rounds in the back. The man does not do that. The man does not fall. The man stands. The man begins slowly to turn. The long coat moves around him like smoke. Frank fires 4 more rounds. The bullets pass into the man's chest. Frank watches them go in. There is no resistance. The man does not bleed. The man's mouth opens. The man laughs. The laugh sounds like a knife being dragged backwards down a chalkboard. The man's body comes apart. It does not fall apart. It comes apart like ink in water, like smoke in wind. The long coat sags to the floor empty. From the floor rises a pale cloud, a vapor, a not quite shape that is almost a face, long-jawed, red-eyed mouth working, and the vapor pours up toward the ceiling. And in the half-light of the nursery, in the smell of cordite and burnt wool and a child's bedding, the thing in the air does not look like smoke and does not look like a man and does not look like anything Frank has a name for. It looks like the negative space of a man, the absence where a man used to stand, with a hate so old in it that the air around it goes cold and the lampshade on the dresser frosts at the rim. Frank does not flinch. Frank has flinched at exactly 2 things in his adult life, and both of them were small caskets. Frank empties the Browning into the vapor. He puts the last 4 rounds straight up. The vapor shrieks. It is a sound the air itself makes. The vapor twists, tightens, gathers itself into something almost solid for half a heartbeat, and Frank calmly, professionally drops the spent magazine, slaps in a fresh one from his belt, racks the slide, and puts 13 more rounds into the cloud at point-blank range. The vapor comes apart. It does not retreat. It is not a thing that retreats. But it has not been built to take 14.5 grain hollow points fired at the rate of 2.5 a second by a man who shoots like Frank Castle shoots, and whatever holds the vapor together is not strong enough for that. The vapor unravels. Strands of it peel off and burn into nothing in midair. The red eyes flicker. The mouth makes one last sound, low and outraged, and then the cloud is gone and the ceiling is ordinary plaster again and the room is full of cordite and a baby's silence. Frank stands very still. Frank counts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He counts to 10. He listens. He hears the rain. He hears the kettle somewhere far away beginning to whistle on the stove. He hears the small wet sound of his own breath and nothing else. Frank lowers the Browning. He goes to the woman. He kneels. He puts 2 fingers under her jaw, no pulse. He puts the back of his hand to her open mouth, no breath. The skin of her cheek is still warm. Her eyes are wide and green and exactly like the baby's eyes. Frank closes them with 2 fingers. He stands. He goes to the crib. The baby is sitting up. The baby is staring at him. The baby has a cut on its forehead, small cut, lightning shape, bleeding a little. The baby is not crying. The baby's eyes are tracking Frank the way a baby tracks a face. Frank looks at the baby. The baby looks at Frank. Frank says, "Kid." The baby says nothing. Frank says, "Your mom's not getting up." The baby blinks. Frank says, "Your dad's downstairs." He's not getting up either. The baby's lip wobbles. The baby does not cry. The baby reaches out one small hand. The hand is open, fingers spread. The hand is asking to be picked up. Frank looks at the hand. Frank thinks of a different hand. A smaller hand, Lisa's hand, the hospital, the morning of, the afternoon of, the hand cool and small and not closing around his finger when he put his finger in it. The hand never closing around anything again. Frank's chest does a thing. Frank does not name the thing. Frank picks up the baby. The baby is heavier than he remembers babies being. The baby smells like baby. The baby grabs his collar with one fist and does not let go. The baby puts its forehead, the bleeding forehead, against the side of Frank's neck. The blood smears on Frank's skin and Frank does not move to wipe it. Frank stands there a long time. A long time is maybe 30 seconds. Frank says very quiet, "Okay, okay, kid." He turns, he carries the baby out of the room. He goes down the stairs, he steps over the tall man at the bottom, he goes through the hallway, he goes through the kitchen, the kettle is whistling, Frank reaches over without breaking stride and turns off the burner, the whistle dies, the house is very quiet, he goes out the back door the way he came in. He is halfway across the second field when he hears voices on the lane behind him, he drops to a crouch. The baby in his coat front does not make a sound, the baby's hand is still fisted in his collar. Frank waits, 2 men come down the lane. He sees their silhouettes against the headlight of a vehicle that is now drawn up at the gate of the white-sided house. A vehicle that was not there before. There was no vehicle a minute ago. There was no vehicle 1,000 minutes ago. The vehicle is just there, headlamp burning, engine off, no driver behind the wheel that Frank can see. A large bearded man, very tall, a short man on a motorcycle, also bearded, gesturing wildly. The tall man is sobbing. He can hear the sobbing from 40 meters away across 2 fields in rain. Frank waits. He waits, prone in the wet grass, baby tucked inside his coat, browning out and forward. He counts breaths. The baby has fallen asleep against his ribs. Of all the things tonight that have surprised him, this is the one that does not surprise him at all. Babies sleep where it is warm. The 2 men go into the house. There is shouting. There is the bearded man's voice, big and wet with grief. There is the short man's voice, sharp and asking questions. Then there is an old man's voice, very calm. Frank did not see the old man arrive. The old man is just there. The voices speak about a baby. The voices ask, where is the baby? The voices do not find the baby. The voices argue. The voices come outside. The bearded man is howling now. The old man stands very still on the path. The short man kneels in the grass and runs a hand through it as if a baby could be in the grass. The old man speaks again. The voices retreat into the house. Frank moves. He moves while they are inside. He covers 2 more fields, then a stone wall, then his rented cottage's back garden, then the cottage. He goes inside. He locks the back door. He locks the front door. He pulls the curtains. He sets the baby on the kitchen table, on a folded towel, because he is not in possession of anything that constitutes a clean bed. The baby remains asleep. The baby's hand is still in a fist around the collar of Frank's coat. Even though the coat is off Frank now, draped over the chair back, and the baby is on the table and the collar is on the chair and the small fist is still closed around it. Frank stands at the table. He looks at the baby. The baby is, by Frank's rough estimate, a year and some change old. Frank knows the size of a 1-year-old. Frank knows the size of a 15-month-old and an 18-month-old and a 2-year-old. Frank knows these sizes the way other men know the dimensions of a baseball field. The baby has Lily Potter's eyes. He saw them open on the floor of the upstairs bedroom. The baby has a cut on its forehead in the shape of a lightning bolt, which is the kind of cut that should not be in the shape of a lightning bolt, and which is not bleeding anymore, and which Frank has cleaned with a clean dish towel and a little of his whiskey. The whiskey on the cut should have made the baby cry. The baby did not cry. Frank does not know what to make of any of this. Frank pulls out a chair. Frank sits. Frank puts his hands flat on the kitchen table on either side of the sleeping baby. His hands are steady. Frank looks at his hands and is surprised they are steady. He has not had hands this steady in 9 months, Frank thinks. He thinks for an hour. He thinks about the cloud that came out of the long coat. He thinks about a green flash that switches off a young man as he crosses his own threshold. He thinks about a woman who says, "Please have mercy," 4 times in the steady voice of a person who knows she is going to die and is not going to bargain. He thinks about a baby who does not cry when whiskey is poured into a cut on his head. He thinks about a tall bearded man and a short bearded man and an old man with a very calm voice, none of whom drove up the lane, none of whom walked, who came out of the air, who were just there. Frank thinks about what kind of people just appear. Frank thinks about what kind of people throw lightning bolts at babies and walk away in vapor. Frank does not have categories for these people. Frank constructs new categories. Frank labels the new categories with words like operators and unknown faction and not from around here. Frank does not believe in magic. Frank believes in technology he does not understand, which is a different thing, and which, in his experience, can always be killed with bullets if you put the bullets in the right place. He just demonstrated that. The cloud came apart. Frank looks at the baby. The baby's chest goes up and down. The baby's mouth is open a little. There is a smear of blood, his own, from the cut on the baby's cheek. Frank reaches out and wipes it with his thumb. His thumb is big and rough, and the baby's cheek is small and very soft. He thinks about the old man on the path. The voices spoke about the baby. They came looking for the baby. They cared about the baby. Maybe they cared about the baby the way the long-coated man cared about the baby, which is the kind of caring that ends in a green flash and a small body on a carpet. Maybe they cared about the baby the way Frank cares about a baby, which is a different kind of caring. But in Frank's experience, the two have a way of looking identical from the outside. Frank thinks about handing the baby over. He thinks about leaving the baby on the porch with a note. He thinks about putting the baby in a basket on a doorstep the way it's done in the storybooks Maria used to read to Lisa. He thinks about walking into the village pub at opening and saying, "I found this kid in the road, here's your kid back," and walking out. He thinks about it for 10 minutes. He thinks about the woman saying, not Harry, please, mercy." He thinks about the long-coated man saying, "Stand aside." He thinks they came for the kid first, not the parents. The parents stood in the way. The kid is what the long-coated man wanted dead. He thinks whoever wanted this kid dead is not the only one. People like that work in groups. Groups of people who can step out of the air, groups of people who throw green light. He thinks, if I give this kid to the old man on the path, I do not know if the old man is on the side of the long-coated man or on the other side. I do not know if there are 2 sides or 4 sides. I do not know how many of the people who can step out of the air want this kid dead. I do not know if the old man is the kind of caring that ends in a green flash. I do not know. He thinks, I just killed something that does not die, or at least I made it go away. Other people did not. The kid's parents did not. The big bearded man did not. He arrived after. The old man did not. He arrived after. I arrived during. I am the only one in this house, in the White House, in the village, and probably the country who, when the long-coated thing showed up, killed it. He thinks, if they come for the kid again, who do I trust to be in the room? The answer is short. Frank looks at the baby. Frank says, okay. Frank says, okay, kid, okay. He gets up. He moves around the cottage. He packs. He packs the way he learned in the Marines, and then in MARSOC, and then for a 3rd time on his own. He packs in 3 minutes. He packs the M1911 and the Browning and the .45 and the boot knife and the 2 spare mags he had laid on the table and the box of ammo from the closet and the wad of cash from inside the radiator cover and the passports from inside the lining of the duffel bag and the cleaning kit from the dresser and the bottle of whiskey from the windowsill, because he is not certain when he will see a bottle again. He does not pack any of the clothes. The clothes are for a man who is leaving in the morning. He wraps the baby in his coat. He puts the duffel bag over his shoulder. He puts the baby in the crook of his off arm. He picks up the Browning with his shooting hand. He goes out the back door. He does not bother to lock it. He walks for 2 hours through fields and along hedgerows. He keeps to the dark. He does not use the road. The rain stops at some point. He does not notice. The baby sleeps the whole way except for one stretch of about 10 minutes when the baby wakes and looks at his face and reaches up and puts the small hand against Frank's jaw and looks at him and then closes its eyes and goes back to sleep. He reaches a town. He reaches a rail station. He pays cash. He boards a train south. He sits in the back of a car that is otherwise empty. He puts the duffel between his feet. He keeps the baby inside the coat. The baby does not make a sound. The train moves. He is on the 3rd train sometime after midnight when the baby wakes up and gets hungry. Frank has in his duffel exactly one item that approximates baby food, which is a single Hershey's bar he has been carrying for 2 months because Kurt gave it to him. Frank does not give the baby chocolate. Frank does not know much about babies anymore, but he remembers that you do not give an under 2 a chocolate bar. He gets off at the next station. He finds an all-night chemist. He buys in cash a tin of formula and 2 glass bottles and a packet of nappies and a clean cotton shirt small enough to fit the baby. He pays. He does not make eye contact. He returns to the station. He mixes the formula in the bathroom sink with hot water. He tests the temperature on the inside of his wrist. The baby drinks the whole bottle. The baby's eyes do not leave Frank's face the entire time. Frank cleans the baby in a station bathroom. The baby does not protest the changing. The cut on the forehead has scabbed. The scab is very neat. Frank thinks that should not have scabbed that fast. Frank thinks this kid heals fast. Frank thinks that's gonna come in handy. He reboards the train. By dawn, he is at the docks. By noon, he has bought passage on a freighter to Rotterdam. By dawn the next day, he is in Rotterdam. By noon, he is in a friend's basement in Antwerp. The friend is named Bert. The friend does not ask questions. The friend looks at the baby once, looks at Frank, and pours coffee. Bert says in his thick Flemish accent, "Whose baby?" Frank says, "Mine." Bert nods. Bert says, "For how long?" Frank says, "For as long as he's got use for me." Bert nods again. Bert hands Frank the coffee. They stay in Bert's basement for 3 weeks. Frank reads everything he can find about magic. He reads about it in the public library in Antwerp. He reads about it in a bookstore on a cobbled street. He reads about it in a Dutch translation of a book called The Golden Bough. He reads about it in pamphlets from a fortune teller's parlor in the red light district that he visits twice with the baby on his hip, because the fortune teller is the kind of person who might know things she is not supposed to know. He learns, in those 3 weeks, what a man can learn about a subject he is not supposed to know exists. He learns that in 17 languages and 4,000 years of recorded history, there is a single shape that keeps repeating, a small secret society of people who can do what other people cannot do. He learns that the names change: mages, cunning folk, sorcerers, wizards, witches. He learns that the structure stays the same: hidden meeting places, a council, a priesthood, an armed wing, a taboo against showing themselves to the larger population, a police force internal that enforces the taboo. He reads it in books pretending to be folklore and books pretending to be history and books openly claiming to be true. He reads it in a backroom edition of an Italian grimoire whose binding feels too warm to the touch. He reads it in a pamphlet on Belgian witch trials in which one accused woman, in the year 1612, is described as having killed her interrogator by saying a word and pointing a stick. A word and a stick. Frank thinks about a word and a stick. Frank thinks about the long, thin piece of wood the man in the long coat was raising toward the crib. Frank thinks, a wand. Frank thinks they use wands, they use words, the words come out of the wands, some of the words are green and they switch off a man, some of the words must be other colors and do other things, there are colors I have not seen, there are things I have not seen done. Frank writes a list in a notebook he buys for a guilder, the list has 2 columns, the left column says known. The right column says GUESSED. Known, they use wands, they use words, they can appear and disappear, they wear long coats and robes, there is a green word that kills. There is an old man who runs at least some of them, there is a school. He learned about the school from the pamphlet at the fortune tellers. The fortune teller called it the place they take the children. The children are taken when they are 11. Guessed, there are dozens or hundreds of these people, maybe thousands. They organize themselves into factions. The long-coated man's faction wants kids dead, at least this one. The old man's faction wants the kid alive, for reasons Frank does not yet understand and therefore does not trust. There are weapons against them. There are always weapons against everything. Frank closes the notebook. Frank puts the notebook in the duffel. The notebook will go with him for the next 10 years. He goes to a hardware store on the 2nd day of the 3rd week. He buys silver, he buys a soldering iron, he buys a small electric kiln, the kind of jewelry hobbyist uses. Bert raises an eyebrow. Frank says, old recipe. Bert nods. Bert does not ask. Bert pours coffee. That night Frank sits at Bert's workbench and melts silver and pours it into the noses of 50 count of 9mm parabellum and 20 count of 45 ACP. He works methodically. He works without rushing. He works the way he was taught in a barracks in North Carolina by a gunsmith named Yusuf who had 9 fingers and the patience of a saint. The silver cools. The bullets are pretty. The bullets are also bullets. Frank puts them in a hard case. The hard case goes in the duffel. He does not know if silver will work. He has read that it might. He has read that it might not. He has read in the back of a thin English book called Iron Against the Hidden Folk that cold iron pierces a glamour and silver pierces a spirit and salt grounds a working and oak holds a binding. He has no oak. He has plenty of salt. The salt goes in the duffel too. The cold iron is already in the duffel in the form of every weapon he owns because his guns are made of steel and steel is iron alloyed with carbon, and Frank has decided to interpret the book generously. He is becoming in those 3 weeks a man building an arsenal for a war he has not yet declared on an enemy he does not yet have a map of. He is also in those 3 weeks becoming the closest thing the baby has ever had to anything. He warms the bottles. He changes the nappies. He learns the baby's 2 cries, which are wet and not wet, and which can be addressed in 2 distinct ways. He learns the baby's 8 expressions, which are hungry, tired, curious, content, scared, surprised, focused, and the one Frank does not have a word for, which is the look the baby gives him when Frank comes through the basement door after an hour out at the library. The look is small and steady and is not exactly a smile. The look is the look of a 1-year-old confirming that the universe has done what the universe was supposed to do. Frank lives for the look without admitting he lives for the look. On the 15th day, in the middle of the night, the basement window rattles. Frank is awake in a half second. He is off the cot in a full second. He is at the window with the browning out in a second and a half. He is looking out into Bert's small back garden, which is empty except that on the snow-dusted flagstones 6 feet from the window there are footprints. Footprints that go from the back wall to the window. Footprints that do not anywhere come from a person. There is no figure in the garden. There is no figure on the wall. There is only the line of footprints, and where they end at the window, a smudge in the frost on the glass that might be the shape of a hand. Frank holds the browning very still. He waits. Nothing happens. The hour goes by. The snow keeps falling. The footprints fill in. Frank does not sleep again that night. In the morning he tells Bert. Bert listens. Bert says slowly, Frank, in this country we have stories. Frank says, I know about the stories now. Bert says, some of the stories know us back. Frank says, time for me to go. Bert nods. They drink coffee. By noon Frank is on a train to Brussels. By evening he is on a plane to JFK on a passport that says his name is Daniel Mahoney. By morning, he is in a walk-up in Bay Ridge that he paid for in cash through a third party in 1979 and never used. The baby sleeps the whole flight. The baby is, by now, almost 14 months old. The baby has begun to make a sound when held that is not crying and not babbling, that is something else, that is a kind of low, contented humming. Frank does not know what to call it. Frank, sitting in the back row of the cabin with the baby against his collarbone, thinks, that's the sound of a kid who's safe. That is the sound I am supposed to make this kid keep making. The fortune teller in Antwerp, before he left her parlor for the last time, took Frank's wrist and turned his palm up and traced a line down it with a fingernail. She said, "This line, you see this line?" Frank said, "I see it." She said, "This line is going to break." Frank said, "Hands break, ma'am." She said, "Not the hand, the line. The line is going to break in half and then the broken pieces are going to grow new lines. You will live longer than the line says. You will live for as long as the boy needs the line. After that, the line will close." Frank said, "That's a long time." She said, "Number it is exactly the right time. It is the time the boy has. You have agreed to walk to the end of his line. You did not know you were agreeing. You agreed when you picked him up." Frank said, "Yeah, well." She said, "Do you understand what they want, the ones who came for him?" Frank said, "They want him dead." She said, "They want him dead because what is in him is what was in the dead one. The dead one put a piece of himself into the boy when he tried to kill him, and you killed what was left of the dead one before the dead one could take the piece back. The piece is in the boy, the piece will pull at him." Frank said, "Then I take the piece out." She laughed, the laugh was kind. She said, you will, soldier. You will pull the piece out the way you pull a splinter out. You will pull it out with the work you teach him. You will pull it out with the work he does. By the time he is grown, the piece will be small. By the time the dead one comes back to look for the piece will be a thread, not a rope. And then the boy will cut the thread and the dead one will fall and the line in your hand will close." Frank said, "That's a lot of faith in a 1-year-old. She said, "It is a lot of faith in the man with the 1-year-old. Frank said, "You don't know me, ma'am." She said, "I know your hand. I know your hand killed something tonight that nobody in this city knew could be killed. I know your hand is a hand that does not lay down. I know your hand. I do not need to know the rest of you." Frank took his hand back. He put a 50 in her saucer. She did not touch the 50. She said, free to you and the boy, always free. Just bring him back through here when he is grown." Frank does not bring him back through there when he is grown. By the time Harry is grown, the fortune teller is dead of natural causes. Frank thinks of her sometimes in the years that follow. He thinks of her smile when he is teaching Harry how to clear a room. He thinks of her smile when Harry at 6 learns to field strip a Beretta in 84 seconds. He thinks of her smile when at 9 the kid does the thing in the alley in Juarez. He thinks, she knew what I was going to teach. She knew somehow before I did, but that is later. In November of 1981, in a walk-up in Bay Ridge with a kid on a folded blanket on the floor and a Browning on the kitchen counter and a notebook on the table, Frank Castle sits cross-legged and lays out, for the first time, the shape of the next 10 years. He writes in the notebook. He writes age 1-3 basics, walking, talking, English, routines, sleep, food, trust. He writes age 4-5 observation, counting cars, counting people, counting exits, eye contact, reading faces. He writes age 6-7 weapons, disassembly, cleaning, storage, safety, dry fire, iron sights. He writes age 8-9 live fire, range, then real, then the code. He writes age 10-11 the code, internalize, kill the deserving, protect the innocent, never kill cops, never kill kids, never kill a man for what he might do, only for what he has done. He writes age 11, hand him to them, Hogwarts, mole. He underlines the last word. He looks at the kid on the floor. The kid is asleep with his mouth open, fist closed around a corner of the blanket. The kid does not know any of the words on the paper. Frank closes the notebook. He puts it in the duffel. He picks up the kid. He carries the kid to the cot he has rigged in the corner of the bedroom out of a milk crate and a folded sheet. He lays the kid down. He pulls the sheet up. He sits on the floor beside the cot, back against the wall, Browning on his knee until the sun comes up over Brooklyn. He does not sleep. He does not need to. He has, for the first time in 9 months, something to do in the morning. Across the Atlantic, in a tall castle in Scotland, a very old man in a starred robe sits at his desk and asks his portraits a question that none of them can answer. The portraits say, the boy. The portraits say, gone. The portraits say, the body of you-know-who is not in the house. The portraits say, there were 18 shell casings on the floor of the nursery. The very old man says, shell casings. The portraits say, yes. The very old man says, slowly, as if learning a word in a new language, shell casings. The portraits say, from a Muggle weapon. The very old man takes off his spectacles. He cleans them on his sleeve. He puts them back on. He looks out the window of his office in the direction of the south, the direction of England, the direction of the place that should have been the scene of one tragedy and one miracle and is now the scene of one tragedy and one mystery that he cannot account for and cannot trace and cannot scry. He says, find the boy. The portraits say how. The very old man says, quietly, discreetly, tell no one, not even Minerva, not yet. The portraits look at one another. The portraits say nothing. The very old man sits very still for a very long time. He sits the way a chess player sits when his opponent has played a move that is not on the board he has been studying, a move from a different game, a move from a game whose rules he does not yet know. He sits and he watches the smoke of his fire curl up the chimney. He sits and he tries to extend 10 years of intricate prophecy, 10 years of patient placement and gentle steering into the new shape that the board has taken without him. He cannot, the board has been kicked. He says to nobody he survived. He says to nobody, of course he survived, the prophecy said so. He says to nobody but the body. The body of the Dark Lord, there should have been a body, the portraits do not answer. The portraits are oil and varnish and they know only what their painters knew and none of their painters knew about shell casings. The very old man, after a long time, takes a pinch of powder from a small dish on his desk and lets it fall through his fingers. The powder hangs in the air, he watches it hang, he watches it not fall. He says, very quiet, whatever you are, sir, whoever you are, wherever you have taken the boy. I will find you because the boy is the only chance the world has. And I cannot leave the only chance the world has in the hands of a man I do not know. The powder in the air makes the faint shape of an arrow. The arrow points west across the ocean away from him. The very old man sighs. He says, of course, the other side of the ocean where I cannot easily go. He turns to his fire. He says almost to himself, almost as if he is reading aloud from a book he wishes he had not opened. 10 years, then, I will give you 10 years, sir. I will give the boy 10 years to grow up wherever you have taken him. And then he will come to me because the letter will come to him at 11, and the letter goes everywhere, and the letter cannot be refused. The Hogwarts letter goes to every child of magic in Britain, and the Potter boy is the most magical of all of them. He will come, and I will see him, and I will see you, sir, the man who stole him out of his mother's house at the muzzle of a gun. He pauses, he says, and then we will see whose hand is on the boy. When the sun comes up over the castle, the very old man is still sitting still, and the boy is on a milk crate 4,000 miles away, and a man is sitting on the floor beside the milk crate with his hand on the kid's foot and a Browning high power across his knees and a job at last after 9 months of nothing to do. End of chapter 1, Snow Oak. He has chapter 2. 10 years of training, Brooklyn, 1982. The kid is 14 months old. The walk-up in Bay Ridge has 3 rooms, living room, bedroom, kitchen with a window that does not close all the way. The fire escape goes down the side of the building into a courtyard nobody uses. Frank likes it for the fire escape. Frank likes it because the building is a corner, 2 streets to watch, 2 exits, 3 if you count the roof, which he counts because Frank counts roofs. He buys a crib at a Salvation Army on 86th Street. He buys it for $9. He carries it home over one shoulder, baby in the other arm. The lady at the Salvation Army watches him go and shakes her head. She is thinking that man does not look like a father. She is right and wrong about that in proportions she does not know. He puts the crib in the bedroom. He puts the bedroom against the interior wall. He puts the kid in the crib. He puts 2 pillows behind the crib against the wall to muffle any sound from the next apartment. He puts a baby monitor on top of the dresser. He puts the receiver in his pocket. He keeps the receiver in his pocket for the next 10 years. The receiver becomes a series of receivers, each smaller and better than the last, but the principle does not change. Frank wants the kid in his ear always. The first month he learns how to feed a baby. He learns that babies eat every 3 hours. He learns that the kind of formula that comes in the round can is better than the kind that comes in the square can. He learns that a baby will not eat green beans but will eat carrots if you mash them. He learns that a baby will eat anything if you put a little bit of apple in it. He learns that bananas are a tool. He learns the calculus of nap times. The second month he learns that the kid sleeps better when Frank's hand is on the kid's back. He sits beside the crib in a folding chair with one hand through the bars and reads, by the light of a single bulb, every book on child development that the Brooklyn Public Library has on its shelves. He reads Spock, he reads Brazelton, he reads Erickson, he reads a book called The Magical Years that he buys at a thrift store, and that turns out to be about the imagination of 2 to 4-year-olds and not about the imagination Frank is concerned with. He keeps the book anyway. He underlines passages. The third month the kid says a word. The word is Dada. The kid says it at 3 in the morning, reaching through the bars, looking at Frank, who is sitting in the folding chair, who has not moved in 2 hours. Frank does not say anything for a long time. Then Frank says, yeah, kid, yeah. The kid is 2 when Frank starts the observation games. The observation games are simple. Frank carries the kid in a backpack carrier through the streets of Bay Ridge. Frank stops. Frank says, how many red cars on this block? The kid says after a long pause, 3. Frank says, right. Frank walks another block. Frank says, how many men in hats just walked past us? The kid says 2. Frank says, right. The kid is 2 years old. The kid is right almost every time. By 2.5 the kid is right every time. By 3 the kid is the one who asks. The kid says from the carrier on Frank's back, Dad, 4 men, black coats, across the street, watching the deli. Frank turns. Frank looks at the deli. There are 4 men in black coats. They are watching the deli. They are watching it the way men watch a place they are about to rob. Frank crosses the street with the kid on his back. Frank goes into the deli. Frank tells the deli owner, a Cypriot named Costa, that he should close early today. Costa looks at Frank's face. Costa closes early. The 4 men in coats stand on the corner for 40 more minutes and then they walk away. The kid says in the carrier in his small voice, Dad, good. Frank says, good kid. The kid says, why did they leave? Frank says, because we saw them, because they knew we saw them. Bad guys do not like to be seen. The kid says, are we good guys? Frank says, after a long pause, we are guys who see. The kid considers this. The kid says, finally, okay. The kid does not ask again that year. The kid asks again at 6. By 6, the kid has a better question. Belfast, 1986. The kid is 4 going on 5. They go to Belfast because Bay Ridge is starting to feel watched. Frank is good at feeling watched. Frank notices that the corner where he goes to buy the paper has had a new bodega clerk for 3 weeks. Frank notices that the bodega clerk looks at him for a half-second too long. Frank notices that the new clerk's hands are too soft for a man who works a register. Frank notices that the new clerk wears a watch on the inside of his wrist, the way men wear watches when they spend a lot of time with their hand cupped around something and need to see the time without turning the hand. Frank does not confront the clerk. Frank goes home. Frank packs. By morning, Frank and the kid are on a plane to Reykjavik on different passports than the ones that brought them in. By evening, they are on a second plane to Glasgow. By the next morning, they are in a row house on a street in West Belfast that a man named Sean rents to him for cash with no questions and a long handshake. Belfast in 1986 is not New York. Belfast in 1986 is a city where boys with rifles stand at corners and where men in unmarked cars drive past slowly and where the windows of certain pubs are armored against fragmentation. Frank does not mind. Frank knows cities like Belfast in 1986. Frank lived in cities like Belfast in 1986 from the ages of 19 to 23 with a different uniform and a different rifle and a different reason. Frank teaches the kid the rules of cities like Belfast. Rule 1, walk on the outside of the sidewalk, not the inside. The inside is where a car bomb throws shrapnel. The outside is where you can step into the street and behind cover. Rule 2, do not stop at a window. Windows are for snipers to look through and for kids to be seen through. Rule 3, do not take the same route twice in a row. If you go to the chemist on Tuesday by way of Falls Road, on Wednesday you take Springfield Road, on Thursday you take a back lane. Rule 4, count the cars on your block. Know which ones are new. Know which ones are different. Know which ones have a man in them who is not eating, not reading, not on the phone. Rule 5, when you hear a bang, do not look at the bang. Look at the people who already are. The people who do not look are either dead or they are the people who made the bang. The kid learns the rules. The kid learns them not the way a kid learns Goodnight Moon, but the way a kid learns to ride a bike. The kid learns them in his body. The kid is 5 years old and is already moving on the outside of the sidewalk by reflex. The kid asks one question about the rules. The kid says, Dad, why are we learning these? Frank says, because someday somebody is going to come for us, and when they come, we are going to be ready. The kid says, who is going to come? Frank says, after a long pause, the people who killed your mom. The kid says, my mom. Frank says, yeah, you had a mom before me. She had red hair. Her name was Lily. Her name was Lily Potter, and your dad's name was James, and they had you and they loved you and they tried to keep you alive when the bad men came and they died for it. The kid does not cry. The kid takes the news the way kids take news when they have only ever known one parent. The news is a paper that arrives in the mail. The news has the name of a woman the kid does not remember on it. The kid says, very quiet, did you know her? Frank says, I saw her face. Once. I do not think I would call that knowing her. The kid says, but you took me. Frank says, I took you because the bad men were going to come back for you and I was the only one who was going to stop them. The kid considers this for a long time. The kid is 5 years old and is sitting on the kitchen floor of a row house in West Belfast in the spring of 1987, and the kid is considering with the seriousness of a tax accountant the central event of his own life. The kid says, finally, did you kill the bad man who killed her? Frank says, I killed what was left of him. There is still a piece of him left. We are going to kill the rest of him too, together, when you are bigger. The kid says, okay. The kid stands up. The kid goes and gets his jacket. The kid says, walk. Frank says, walk. They walk. They walk on the outside of the sidewalk. They do not stop at any windows. They do not take the same route twice. They count the cars on the block. There are 2 of them and the city around them is the city it is, and the kid is 5 and is moving like a soldier, and Frank is 40 and is for the first time in his life a teacher. The first gun is in Belfast. The kid is 6. Frank does not give the kid a gun. Frank gives the kid a piece of a gun. The piece is the barrel of a Beretta 92F, stripped, oiled, in a kitchen cloth on the kitchen table. Frank says, this is a barrel. Show me where the round comes out. The kid points. Frank says, good, show me the cooling slots. The kid points. Frank says, there are no cooling slots on this gun. This is a pistol. Pistols do not have cooling slots. You said yes too quick. Do not say yes too quick. Look, then say. The kid looks for a long time. The kid says there are no cooling slots. Frank says, good. The next day the slide. The next day the recoil spring. The next day the locking block. The next day the firing pin. The next day the trigger group. The next day the frame. The next day the magazine. The next day the assembly. The next day the disassembly. The next day the assembly again, eyes closed. The kid is 6. The The kid is 6 and is field stripping a Beretta blindfolded in 84 seconds by the end of his second month. The kid does not handle a loaded round for another year. The kid does not pull a trigger on anything other than a dry-fired empty pistol for another year. Frank is patient. Frank is patient in a way Frank's old instructors at Bragg would have recognized and approved. Frank teaches the kid the 4 rules. Rule 1, every gun is loaded until you have personally checked it, until you have racked the slide and looked into the chamber and put your finger in the chamber and felt nothing and racked it again. Until then it is loaded. Even then it is loaded. You do not get to relax about this. Ever. Rule 2, do not point a weapon at anything you are not willing to kill. Not a wall, not a chair, not a friend joking, not your reflection in a mirror. Nothing. Rule 3, keep your finger off the trigger until your sights are on the target. Rule 4, know what is behind your target always. A bullet that misses is a bullet that goes somewhere. The somewhere it goes is your responsibility. The kid memorizes the 4 rules. The kid recites them in the morning and in the evening and before every dry-fire drill. The kid recites them in his sleep. Frank has heard him. The kid does not touch a gun loaded with a live round until he is 7. When he does it is on a hillside in County Tyrone with a Ruger 1022 against a paper target nailed to a fence post, with Frank kneeling behind him and Frank's hands not on the kid but close enough to catch any wild movement. The kid puts the first round through the X-ring at 25 meters. The kid puts the second round inside the first. The kid puts the third round inside the first 2. The kid is 7 years old and Frank, kneeling behind him, has a tightness in his chest that Frank does not name. Sarajevo, 1988. The kid is 7 going on 8. They go to Sarajevo because Belfast got noisy. A man in a Vauxhall got out twice on the same block in 2 days, and Frank does not believe in twice on the same block. They go to Sarajevo because Frank knows a man in Sarajevo who owes Frank a favor from a hot afternoon in 1972 that neither of them speak about. The man's name is Goran. Goran is 63 years old and runs an antique store on a quiet street in the Old Quarter and keeps a Heckler & Koch MP5 under the counter that has not been fired since the 1979 invasion of someplace neither of them speak about either. Goran takes them in. Goran puts them in the apartment above his shop. Goran teaches Harry in Serbo-Croatian the names of the parts of every weapon Goran owns. Goran owns a lot of weapons. Goran does not own them as a collection. Goran owns them as an inventory. In Sarajevo, the kid learns languages. The kid already speaks English and a little of the Belfast Irish-inflected version of English. In Sarajevo, the kid picks up Serbo-Croatian in 8 months. By the end of the first year, the kid is speaking it well enough to argue with the baker's daughter about the price of a loaf. By the end of the second year, the kid is speaking it well enough to translate between Goran and a Russian arms broker who does not speak any English. Frank watches the kid translate. Frank watches the kid go from Russian to Serbo-Croatian to English and back. Frank watches the kid's eyes track the conversation between 3 adults and the kid's face stay neutral, professional, calibrated. Frank thinks, whatever else this kid is going to be, he is going to be a kid who hears things people did not mean to say in front of him. Frank says after the Russian leaves, how much of that did you actually understand? The kid says, all of it. Frank says, all of it. The kid says, Goran is buying 10 kilos of Czech plastic explosive from the Russian. The Russian thinks Goran is overpaying. Goran is paying in dollars, but the dollars came from Goran's brother in Vienna who runs a furniture business and skims off the top. Goran is going to use 4 of the kilos and resell 6 to a man in Mostar that he hates. The Russian does not know that. The Russian wants to know if Goran has a sister. Frank says, Goran does not have a sister. The kid says, Goran said he has a cousin. Frank says, Goran does not have a cousin either. The kid considers this. The kid says, does Goran ever say true things? Frank says, Goran says true things about weapons. Goran says true things to me. Goran tells me the truth because Goran owes me his life. Goran does not tell the truth to Russians who buy plastic explosive. Goran does not tell the truth to men in Mostar. Goran does not tell the truth to his brother in Vienna. The truth is a tool, kid. You use it on people who have earned it. You do not waste it on people who have not. The kid says, what about me? Frank says, I tell you the truth, always, even when the truth is bad. The kid says, tell me a bad one. Frank says, your scar bleeds in your sleep sometimes. I have to put a washcloth on it. You do not know because by morning it is healed. There is a piece of the bad man in your forehead and the piece does not like to sleep. We are going to take it out someday. Until then I am going to wipe up after it. That is bad, that is true. The kid puts his hand to his forehead. The kid feels the scar. The kid says after a long moment, thanks for telling me. Frank says, you asked. The kid says, I am going to keep asking. Frank says, I am going to keep telling. The kid is 8 and learns to drive. Goran has a 1972 Yugo. The Yugo is a small bad car that runs the way small bad cars run, which is unreliably and with a sense of grievance. Frank teaches the kid to drive the Yugo in a parking lot behind an abandoned cement works. The kid is barely tall enough to see over the wheel. Frank puts 2 phone books on the seat. The kid drives. The kid does not stall the car after the third lesson. The kid is shifting clutch and throttle by the sixth. Frank teaches the kid how to drive away from a fight. He teaches the J-turn on gravel at 20 miles an hour. He teaches the bootleg. He teaches the kid to pop a curb at low speed without ripping a tire. He teaches the kid that the most important thing about a car in a fight is not the gun in the car, it is the steering wheel. The steering wheel is the gun. The kid learns the J-turn in 3 weekends. The kid learns the bootleg in 2 more. By 9, the kid is driving Goran's Yugo through the back lanes of Sarajevo by moonlight, headlights off, third gear, while Frank sits in the passenger seat and times him with a stopwatch. The kid is 9 when he kills his first man. Mexico City, 1990. The kid is 9.5. They are not in Mexico City for a vacation. They are in Mexico City because Goran got picked up for a thing involving the Czech plastic explosive, and Frank does not want to be in the same country as a man who is in the same prison as people who can pay people in the prison to pay people in the city. So they go fast. They land in Mexico City with 2 duffel bags and a fake passport apartment Frank has had on retainer for 6 years, and the rough understanding that they will be here a year and then they will be in a 4th country, and that is the way it is going to be. Mexico City in 1990 has cartels. Frank has avoided the cartels for the entire decade. Frank has avoided them because Frank does not pick fights he does not have to pick, and the cartels have not come for the kid, and Frank does not want to draw the kind of attention a cartel war draws. Frank wants to be invisible. Frank, in Mexico City, lives in a 4-room apartment above a barbershop in Colonia Doctors. Frank is to the neighbors a quiet American who came south after his wife died and brought his son to grow up in the sun. The neighbors are kind. The neighbors are wrong about half of that. The neighbors leave food at the door at Easter and bring the kid a wrapped present at Christmas. The kid receives the presents with the polite gratitude of a child who has been raised by a man who is grateful for kindness even when he cannot say so. The cartel is not interested in Frank. The cartel is interested in the barber shop. The barber's name is Hector. Hector is 58 and has been cutting hair on this block since he was 19. Hector pays his protection money on time. Hector does not skim. Hector does not talk to police. Hector keeps his head down and his clippers oiled and his store open 6 days a week. Hector is, by every standard Frank has, a man who has earned the right to keep cutting hair. The cartel raises the protection money. The cartel raises it twice in 3 months. Hector cannot pay. Hector tells Frank in the alley behind the shop that he is going to close. He is going to close and move to his sister's in Veracruz. He has had a good run. He has cut the hair of 3 generations. He cannot pay what they are asking now. He is sorry. He liked the kid. Frank thinks about this for a day. Frank thinks, I am not here to start a war. I am here to raise a kid. The kid is 9. The kid is not ready for a war. Frank thinks, the barber is a good man. The barber has done nothing wrong. The barber's hands shake when he tells me he is closing. I have seen those hands cut hair for 2 years without shaking. The cartel did this to those hands. Frank thinks, kill the deserving, protect the innocent. Frank pulls down a duffel bag. Frank does the cartel man in the alley behind the barber shop at 10 of midnight on a Tuesday. The cartel man is the collector. The collector comes once a month. The collector has been coming once a month for 9 years. Frank has watched him for 2 months. Frank knows his car, his driver, his schedule, his weapon, his weak hand, his approach angle to the back door of the shop. Frank takes the collector with a single round to the back of the head from 12 feet away with a .22 with a homemade suppressor. The collector goes down. The collector does not say a word. The collector's driver, who is in the car at the mouth of the alley, does not see the collector go down because the alley curves and the alley is dark and the driver is doing what drivers do, which is smoking a cigarette and looking at the wrong end of the alley. Frank moves to the driver. Frank does not see the second man. The second man is new. The second man is the collector's nephew. The second man is 22 and is the kind of 22 that has been waiting all his life for an excuse to draw the gun his uncle never let him draw. The second man comes around the corner of the alley behind Frank. The second man sees his uncle on the ground. The second man draws. Frank turns. Frank's .22 is on the driver. The .22 is small and has only 1 round in the chamber and is wrong for a man at this range. The other gun, the Glock, is at Frank's belt under his jacket. Frank can get to the Glock in 1 seconds. The kid behind him cannot get to anything in 1 seconds because the kid is 9 and is not supposed to be here. The kid is here. The kid is here because the kid followed Frank. The kid followed Frank because the kid noticed that morning that Frank had 3 magazines in his coat instead of 2, and the kid knows what 3 magazines means. The second man fires. The second man fires at Frank. The second man hits Frank in the right shoulder. Frank goes down to 1 knee. The .22 falls out of Frank's hand. The kid behind a dumpster picks up the .22. The kid steps out from behind the dumpster. The kid puts the .22 on the second man. The second man is bringing his pistol back around toward the kid. The second man's face is doing something the second man's face has never had to do, which is process the existence of a small boy in an alley with a gun. The second man has in this moment 2 seconds. The second man uses one of them being surprised. The kid uses neither of his. The kid puts the round with the .22 he has practiced with for 2 years at the range, on paper, on bottles, on rotting fruit at distance. The kid puts the round into the second man's right eye at 9 feet. The second man drops. The second man drops the way a man drops when his motor cortex is offline. He drops in pieces. His knees go first, then his hips, then his hand opens and the pistol clatters. Then his head goes down with a sound that Frank will remember and that the kid will not. The kid stands there with the .22 still up. The driver finally looks. The driver sees his boss on the ground and his boss's nephew on the ground and a small boy with a gun and a wounded man on one knee. The driver's brain does what a driver's brain does. The driver puts the car in gear. The driver drives away. The driver does not look back. The driver, in the city of his employment, will tell a version of this story to his cousin tomorrow that involves 5 gringos and a tactical team and absolutely no 9-year-old. The driver will be believed because the truth in his telling is unbelievable. Frank on one knee says, "Kid." The kid says, not lowering the .22, "Are you okay?" Frank says, "I am fine." Shoulder through and through, lower the gun. The kid lowers the gun. The kid is breathing fast. The kid is not crying. The kid is, Frank can see in the alley light, going pale. Frank says, "Sit down." The kid sits. Frank gets up. Frank crosses the alley. Frank kneels in front of the kid, one hand pressed to the shoulder under his jacket, blood already through the shirt. Frank says, "Look at me." The kid looks. Frank says, "You broke one of the 4 rules. Do you know which one?" The kid says, voice small, "I pointed it at him." Frank says, "You pointed it at him and you fired. You were willing to kill him. That is rule 2. You did rule 2 right. What is rule 1? The kid says, "Every gun is loaded." Frank says, "Was it?" The kid says, "I checked. I racked the slide. Before I came out, I checked." Frank says, "Good." Rule 3. The kid says, "Finger off the trigger until the sights are on the target." Frank says, "Was it?" The kid says, "Yes." Frank says, rule 4. What was behind him? The kid pauses. The kid pauses for a long time. The kid says, very quiet, "The wall of the laundry, brick, 2 stories, no windows on this side. Anything that went through him hit brick." Frank exhales. Frank says, "Kid, you did all 4 rules. You did them under fire. You did them at 9 years old in an alley at midnight with your father bleeding out on the pavement. You did them." The kid says, "Are you going to die?" Frank says, "Number the round went through, missed the artery, missed the bone, hurts like hell, not going to die." The kid says, "Good." The kid does not say anything else for 2 hours. They walk home through back streets. Frank with one arm against his ribs, holding pressure on the wound. Frank with the other arm around the kid's shoulders. The kid silent. The kid moving like a soldier coming back off a patrol. Frank knows the walk. Frank has done the walk. Frank has done the walk with the men who taught him the walk. Frank has not done the walk with a 9-year-old. At the apartment, Frank lays out the field kit. The kid, without being asked, sterilizes a needle in the gas flame of the kitchen stove. The kid threads the suture. The kid hands the needle to Frank. The kid sits beside Frank while Frank stitches his own shoulder, the kid holding the lamp at the right angle, the kid keeping his eyes on the wound, the kid not flinching at the smell of iodine or the small red sounds. When the stitching is done, Frank says, "Kid." The kid says, "Yeah." Frank says, "You killed a man tonight." The kid says, "Yeah." Frank says, "How do you feel about it?" The kid is quiet for a long time. The kid is sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor in a Mexico City apartment at 3 in the morning with iodine on his fingers and an empty .22 on the table in front of him and a father with a sewn shoulder beside him. The kid is 9. The kid says, "Finally, I feel like I was supposed to." Frank says, "You were not supposed to. You were in the right place at the right time and you did the right thing. There is a difference. Tell me you understand the difference." The kid says, "You are saying I am not a soldier." Frank says, "I am saying you are not a soldier yet. I am saying you will be a soldier when you are older if you still want to be. Tonight you were a kid who saved his dad. Tomorrow you are still a kid. Next week you are still a kid. Next year still a kid. I do not want you in another alley until you are bigger. You hear me?" The kid says, "I hear you." Frank says, "Promise." The kid says, "I promise." The kid keeps the promise. The kid does not put a round into another man until he is 14. The kid does in the next 2 years train. The kid does in the next 2 years get better at everything. But the kid does not pull a trigger on a living person again until Frank says so. The kid is, in this, a good son. Frank that night lies on the floor of the kitchen because he cannot make it to the bed, and the kid lies down beside him on the floor with a blanket pulled over both of them, and the kid puts his small hand into Frank's hand the way he did at 14 months on the kitchen table of a cottage in Godric's Hollow, and the kid closes his eyes and the kid sleeps. Frank does not sleep. Frank lies awake on a tile floor in Colonia Doctors at the age of 50 with a fresh suture in his shoulder and a 9-year-old's hand in his and thinks, "This is not the way I was supposed to raise this kid. This is the way the kid has chosen, given what I am, to be raised. I did not give him the choice. I gave him me, he chose with the only thing he had to choose with to walk where I walk. Frank thinks I am going to be worthy of that. Frank thinks I am going to give him every tool and then I am going to give him a way out. Frank thinks the way out is what the code is for. Mexico City, 1991, the kid is 10. The code is the thing Frank cannot give the kid in a single lesson. The code is the thing Frank gives the kid the way you give somebody a religion, which is over years in small pieces, by example and by repetition and by waiting for the moments where the code applies and then naming them when they come up. Frank teaches the code first by what they do not do. They do not on a Sunday in May kill a man who curses at the kid in the market. The man is drunk. The man is angry. The man calls the kid a gringo dog. The kid puts a hand on his belt where the kid does not wear a weapon because the kid is 10 years old. Frank beside him does not turn. Frank beside him does not even look up. Frank beside him says walk. They walk. Back at the apartment, Frank says, why did we not do anything to that man? The kid says because he was just talking. Frank says right. The kid says talking is allowed. Frank says talking is allowed. Talking is not a reason. The man was a bad man with bad words. The man has not earned a bullet. We do not give bullets to men who have not earned them. We do not give bullets to men who have only earned a punch. We do not give bullets to men who have only earned a slap. We give bullets to men who have earned bullets. Do you know what earns a bullet? The kid says killing. Frank says killing the innocent, killing for money, killing for fun, killing for somebody else's flag when the flag belongs to bad men. That kind of killing earns a bullet. Hurting kids earns a bullet even without killing. Raping a woman earns a bullet. Selling a child to be hurt earns a bullet. Selling a child anything earns a bullet. Running a system that does any of those things earns a bullet. Do you have a question? The kid says, what about the cartel man in the alley? Frank says the cartel man in the alley had killed before 11 men by my count in the last 4 years, 2 of them women, one of them a 16-year-old who tried to leave the trade. He had a list of men he was going to do this year. The barber was on the list. The cartel man had earned a bullet 30 times over before I put one in him. The nephew had earned his by drawing on us. The driver had earned nothing. The driver got to drive away. The kid says, how did you know about the 11 men? Frank says, I watched him for 2 months. I followed him home some nights. I saw who he met with. I made a list. I checked the list against the police pages of the newspapers. I checked the list against the missing persons posters in the church. The list was real. The men on the list were real. The dead they had killed were real. By the time I put a round in the man, I had the case. I always have the case. The kid says, you always have the case. Frank says, always. You do not put a round in a man unless you have the case. You never act on rumor. You never act on a feeling. You act on evidence. You act on the case. The case is what separates us from them. The kid says, what are we if not them? Frank says, we are the people who do what the law cannot do because the law is for sale or because the law is afraid or because the law does not know how. We are not police. We do not arrest. We do not testify. We do not call the press. We do the thing the law would do if the law were honest. We do not enjoy doing it. We do not advertise it. When it is done, we go home. Do you understand? The kid says, I understand. Frank says, tell me the code from the top. The kid says the way a kid recites the Pledge of Allegiance in school, kill the deserving, protect the innocent, never kill cops, never kill kids, never kill a man for what he might do, only for what he has done, always have the case. Never enjoy it when it is done, go home. Frank says one more. The kid says never let it touch a kid who did not ask for it. Frank says right. The kid says I asked for it. Frank after a long pause says you did kid, you asked for it when you took my collar in your fist on the night your folks died. I did not understand then that you were asking. I understand now. I have not stopped understanding for 10 years. The kid says I am still asking. Frank says yeah. I see that. The kid says good. 11. The kid is 11. The kid is 11 and Frank has given him almost everything Frank has to give. The kid can field strip a Beretta blindfolded in 84 seconds. The kid can run a J-turn in a Yugo on gravel at 20 miles an hour without spilling a cup of coffee in his lap. The kid can shoot a Ruger 10-22 at 50 meters from sitting, kneeling, and prone with 5-round groupings of under an inch. The kid can shoot an M1911 at 25 meters with 3-round groupings of under 3 inches. The kid can drive a stick. The kid can pick a tumbler lock with a paperclip and a bobby pin in under 90 seconds. The kid can find north without a compass. The kid can identify by sound every common pistol caliber from a 22 to a 45 ACP. The kid can do a tourniquet on his own arm one-handed. The kid can suture a wound. The kid can clean a wound. The kid can read a topographic map. The kid can read a man's face. The kid can read a room. The kid cannot do a lot of other things. The kid cannot ride a bicycle in a park with other kids because Frank has not let him do that. The kid cannot play soccer in a league because Frank has not let him do that either. The kid does not have friends his own age. The kid has Goran in a Sarajevo prison who writes him a letter twice a year. The kid has Hector, the barber, who hugs him every time he comes downstairs for a haircut, and who has, after the night in the alley which Hector knows about and does not speak about, looked at Frank with something Frank cannot meet. The kid has Bert in Antwerp who he has seen twice more since the basement. The kid has the lady at the bodega in Bay Ridge from when he was 3, who once gave him a Tootsie Roll. The kid has Kurt, who came down to Mexico City in 1990 for a long weekend and brought the kid a baseball glove that the kid has never used. The kid has Frank. The kid has Frank, and the kid has the code, and the kid has a notebook of his own now, started at age 7 in Sarajevo, in which the kid keeps lists. List of what he has read, lists of words in 3 languages, list of birds he has seen out the windows of apartments in 4 cities, lists of lately the things he wants to be when he is grown. The list of things the kid wants to be has on it in order: soldier, detective, engineer, father, doctor, teacher. The list does not have Punisher on it. Frank has noticed this. Frank does not raise it. The kid is 11 and is by every measure Frank has a young man. The kid is also in ways Frank cannot measure still a child. The kid still wants Frank to sit beside the bed for the first half hour of the night. Not every night, sometimes. The kid does not ask. The kid just does not close the door. Frank, on those nights, takes the folding chair from the kitchen and sits in the hallway with his back against the door frame and reads a book by the light of the kitchen. The kid sleeps. Frank reads. On one such night in May of 1991 in Mexico City, in the apartment above the barbershop, with the kid asleep at the age of 11 years and almost 7 months, an owl lands on the iron railing of the kitchen window. The owl is large. The owl is brown. The owl has a yellow envelope in its beak. The owl is, by any measure Frank has, a thing that should not be on the kitchen window of a 4th-floor apartment in Colonia Doctors at 10:30 at night in the month of May. Frank sets down the book. Frank picks up the M1911 from the kitchen table. Frank goes to the window. The owl looks at him with the patient, slightly contemptuous expression that owls have always had for the species that owls have always shared the planet with. The envelope in the owl's beak has on it in green ink the words, Mr. H. Potter, the bedroom above the barbershop, Calmir y Pesado 187, apt. 4 Colonia Doctors, Mexico City, Mexico. Frank reads the address twice. Frank looks at the owl. Frank says in a voice that the kid in the bedroom does not wake to, but that the owl somehow hears with what it has instead of ears, all right. Frank opens the window. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, The Owl Frank Shot. There is a clarification owed to the historical record. Frank does not, on the night of the first owl, shoot the first owl. Frank, on the night of the first owl, opens the window and accepts the letter from the owl's beak and puts it on the kitchen table and gives the owl a strip of leftover steak from the fridge, and the owl considers the steak and considers Frank and decides in its owl way that the steak is acceptable and eats the steak and flies back into the Mexico City night without looking back. Frank reads the letter at the kitchen table. The letter is written in green ink on a heavy parchment that Frank, who knows the weight of military letterheads from 3 governments, identifies as something between calligraphy paper and the kind of stationery a bank uses for foreclosure notices. The letter says in Frank's paraphrase, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Term begins September 1. We await your owl no later than July 31. Sincerely, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. Enclosed, a list of books, a list of supplies, a list of approved wand makers, a note about cauldrons. A note about pets. Frank reads the letter once, he reads it twice. He reads it a 3rd time, he reads the books list, he reads the supplies list, he reads the note about cauldrons. He spends a particularly long time on the note about pets, which informs Mr. Potter that students may bring an owl, a cat, or a toad. A toad. Frank thinks, a toad. Frank, very quietly in the kitchen of the apartment in Colonia Doctors at 10:45 at night in the month of May 1991, with the kid asleep 10 feet away through a doorway, says, Toad. Frank shakes his head. Frank reads the letter a 4th time. He sits at the table for an hour. He reaches twice for the bottle of mezcal on the counter and does not get up to fetch it. He has not had a drink in 9 years and 3 months. He has lately stopped counting. He starts counting again at the table because the letter has reminded him that there are days sometimes on which a man should be reminded of his counts. He thinks they found us. He thinks it took them 10 years. The fortune teller was right. They were blind for 10 years. They are not blind now. They sent an owl. The owl found us. The owl found the right address. The owl crossed the Atlantic. The owl is in their service. He thinks they have not come for the kid yet. They have sent an owl. They have sent a letter. They are not coming with men in coats. They are not coming with green flashes. They are coming with stationery. He thinks, what does it mean that they are coming with stationery? He thinks for a long time. He thinks it means they want him back. They want him in the school. The school is the place they take the children, the fortune teller said. The school is where they form them. The school is where they teach them the work. The school is where, presumably, they make a wizard out of a kid who has so far only been allowed by Frank to be a soldier. He thinks, the school is also where they would be vulnerable to a kid the school does not know is also a soldier. He thinks the kid would not be a student. The kid would be a mole. He thinks the kid would be the only mole. He thinks the kid is 11 years old. He thinks for another hour. In the morning, after he has slept 3 hours on the kitchen floor with the M1911 within reach and the letter folded under a coffee mug so it does not blow off the table in the breeze from the open window, Frank wakes the kid by setting a glass of orange juice on the bedside crate. The kid wakes the way the kid always wakes, which is the way a soldier wakes. One eye, then the other, then the body, then a sweep of the room, then the question. The kid says, "What?" Frank says, "Letter for you." The kid says, "From who?" Frank says, "From them." The kid sits up. The kid says after a pause, "How?" Frank says, "An owl." The kid says, "An owl." Frank says, "An owl." Kid, "A real one, came in through the window, had the letter in its beak, left when I gave it some steak." The kid says very quietly, "That is the kind of thing you said was going to happen." Frank says, "I said it was the kind of thing that could happen. I did not know when, I knew if. Today turns out to be the day of the if." The kid says, "Show me the letter." Frank shows him the letter. The kid reads it. The kid reads it the way the kid reads everything, which is with absolute attention. The kid reads it twice. The kid reads the book list. The kid reads the note about cauldrons. The kid, like Frank, spends a longer than expected amount of time on the line about toads. The kid says, looking up toad. Frank says, "Yeah." The kid says, "Are toads good for anything?" Frank says, "Magically, possibly. Practically number." The kid says, "Got it." The kid sets the letter down. The kid puts his hands on his knees. The kid looks at Frank. The kid is 11 years old in a t-shirt and underwear, sitting cross-legged on a bed in a Mexico City apartment, with the morning light coming sideways through the window onto his hair. The kid says, "What is the play?" Frank says, "That is what we are going to figure out." The kid says, "Now." Frank says, "Now, get dressed. We are going to walk to the cafe on the corner and we are going to drink coffee like grown-ups and we are going to lay this out." They walk to the cafe. The kid orders in his Mexico City Spanish a café de olla and a sweet bread. Frank orders in his Mexico City Spanish a black coffee and nothing else. They sit at the corner table at the back where Frank can see the door and the kid can see the window and they can both see the kitchen in case anyone tries anything from the kitchen, which has been known to happen in cafes in cities that Frank has spent time in. Frank lays it out. Frank says, 3 options. The kid says, "Hit me." Frank says, "Option 1, we tell them number we send the owl back with a number we pick up tonight and we move to a 5th country and we change passports and we never let them find us again. We can probably keep moving until you are old enough to make your own way and then you make your own way and the wizards never know what happened to you." The kid says, "Cost." Frank says, "You never learn the magic you have. The piece in your forehead does not get resolved. The dead one in the air might come back and we do not know when and we do not know how. We are looking over our shoulder for the rest of our lives. They never stop looking, kid. Owls find addresses. Owls will find us in country 5 and country 6 and country 7. We will outrun for a while, we will not outrun forever." The kid says, "Option 2. Frank says, "Option 2, we take you in, we let you be a student, you go to the school, you learn what they teach. You come out at 17 with a wand and an education and you live a wizarding life. I retire, I go someplace warm, I die in 5 years of liver failure or in 10 years of a bullet or in 20 of old age. You are alive. You are a normal wizard, you have wizard friends, you marry a wizard, you have wizard kids. The dead one comes back, the wizards handle it, you do not handle it. The wizards have been handling things for centuries. You let them." The kid says, "Cost." Frank says, "The dead one comes back, the wizards do not handle it, they have not handled it before, the kid's parents were not handled. The kid's parents are dead, the wizards lost, the dead one was on his way to a new round of winning when I shot him, the wizards do not have a record, I trust on this. Letting the wizards handle it is letting the people who failed your folks handle the thing that killed your folks. Also, you in there around them without me, with a piece of the dead one in your forehead, with no idea how to use the piece against the dead one when the dead one comes back. You are bait in option 2, you are bait wearing a school uniform." The kid says, "Option 3. Frank says, "Option 3, you go in with everything I have given you. You go in as a mole, you learn what they teach, you learn it well, you also learn what they do not teach. You map the place, you map the players, you find out who from the old war is still walking around, you build a list, we work the list together, I come in too in some capacity. Groundskeeper, janitor, cook. Something that lets me be in the building and lets me have a perimeter on you 24/7. We work the list for a year, we work it for 2. We work it for as long as it takes to take down everyone the dead one used to work with. We bring the dead one out of hiding, we do the dead one, we come home, you go back to school for the rest of the years to finish the wizarding education that, by the way, will then be a finer thing because you finished it after winning." The kid says, "Option 3, Frank says, "I have not finished." The kid says, "I have." Option 3, Frank says, "Here the cost." The kid says, "Tell me the cost." Frank says, "You spend 7 years in a school full of children who are not what you are. You will have to pretend every day to be a normal kid. You will fail at it sometimes and people will look at you funny and you will have to pass it off. You will not have friends except maybe 1 or 2 who do not know what you are. You will not be a kid, you will not get a kid year. You will have killed by the end of the first year, kid, maybe more than 1. You will kill in there every man on the list. You will do it without being caught. You will do it without being suspected. You will do it because if you are caught, they will not call it justice, they will call it a crime, and they will throw you into a wizard prison that nobody comes out of, and I will not be able to get you out because the prison is in a place I cannot reach and you are 11 years old. The kid says, heard. Frank says, anything else? The kid says, how long? Frank says, 7 years to finish school, probably 4 years for the list if we go fast, maybe 6. After the list, the dead one. After the dead one, you decide what kind of life you want and we go build that life. The kid says, option 3. Frank says, you are sure. The kid says, I have been sure since I was 5 years old and you told me my mother was named Lily and they killed her. I have been sure for 6 years. You are asking me now because I am old enough to be asked. I am old enough. Option 3. Frank looks at the kid. The kid does not look away. Frank says, finally, wizards killed your parents, kid. Now you go kill the wizards who knew about it and let it happen. The kid says, yes. Frank says, okay. They walk back to the apartment. They walk on the outside of the sidewalk as they have walked since Belfast in 1986. They do not stop at any windows. They count 3 new cars on the block since this morning. None of the new cars have men in them who are not eating, not reading, not on the phone. At the apartment, Frank writes a letter back. Frank writes the letter on a piece of plain white printer paper because Frank does not own parchment. Frank writes the letter in block capitals because Frank's handwriting in script is unreadable. The letter says in Frank's paraphrase to Deputy Headmistress McGonagall, Mr. Potter accepts. He will be at the school on September 1st. He will require an escort to your shopping district as he has no familiarity with your currency, customs, or location of vendors. The escort should plan to spend a full day. The escort should be told that Mr. Potter will be accompanied by his legal guardian who is also unfamiliar with said district. Please arrange a date and time. Address communication via owl to this apartment before noon. Mr. Potter and his guardian will not be available after 9 in the evening. Regards, F. Castle. Frank reads the letter twice. Frank crosses out the signature. Frank writes instead, regards, Mr. Castle. Frank thinks less is more. The less they know about who I am, the longer they take to figure it out, and the longer they take, the more time I have to be ready for them figuring it out. Frank folds the letter. Frank waits. The owl does not come back that day. The owl comes back the next morning at 6. Frank, who is already up because Frank is always up, hands the owl the folded letter. The owl takes the letter and considers Frank. The owl considers briefly Frank's coffee. Frank gives the owl a strip of bacon. The owl accepts the bacon and flies away. The kid spends the day cleaning every weapon in the apartment. This is not assigned. This is something the kid does when the kid is thinking. The kid sits cross-legged on the floor of the kid's bedroom with a kitchen towel spread out, and a small cup of solvent and a brush and a rag, and the Beretta and the Ruger and the M1911 and the Glock and the 22 with the homemade suppressor and a backup, 380 from Frank's ankle holster, and the kid disassembles each, cleans each, lubricates each, reassembles each. The kid does this for 4 hours. The kid does this in silence. The kid does this with the door open, which is the kid's way of saying that Frank can come in if Frank wants. Frank does not go in. Frank in the kitchen sits at the table and writes a list. The list is in Frank's notebook, the one from Antwerp, the same notebook he has carried for 10 years. The notebook is 2/3 full. The list is on a fresh page. The list is headed, Wizarding War, known bad ACTORS. Frank writes from the things the fortune teller said and the things he has read in the 4 wizarding history books he had Kurt mail him from a Manhattan antiquarian when the kid was 8. VOLD immortality. The dead one, status, half dead, reduced to vapor on Halloween 1981 by F. Castle, vapor dispersed, body absent, possible return vector, ritual reincarnation, known followers, see inner circle, known members at time of disappearance, Lucius Malfoy, wealthy. Financier lives in a manor. Status, rumored to have escaped prosecution by claiming imperious curse. Has a son near the kid's age, verify. Avery, operations man, status, same imperious claim, verify, not. Recruitment specialist, status, same claim, has a son near the kid's age, verify. Crabasar, muscle, same claim, son near the kid's age. Golasar, muscle, same claim, son near the kid's age. Mulciber, torturer, status uncertain. Yaxley, ministry man, status cleared, currently employed by ministry. Macnair, executioner, status employed by ministry as an executioner of magical creatures. Frank looks at the list. Frank thinks 8 names, 8 high-value targets. 3 of them have sons the kid's age. The sons go to the school. The sons are not the targets. The sons are leverage and intel, and if it can be helped, are also off the list. The kid is going to be in a class with the sons of his enemies. The kid is going to be in a class with kids whose dads I am going to kill. Frank thinks this is a hard ask for an 11-year-old. Frank thinks this is not the hardest ask the kid has been asked. Frank thinks the kid is going to do this. The second owl comes 2 days later. The second owl is bigger than the first. The second owl is a tawny. The second owl has a letter in its beak written this time in red ink. Red ink means in some bureaucracies Frank has encountered urgent. Red ink means in other bureaucracies hostile. Frank does not know which it means in this one. Frank, when the tawny lands on the railing, has the M1911 out before the bird's feet touch the metal. Frank, having seen the letter is in a beak and not a claw, lowers the M1911 most of the way. The second letter is from a Mr. R. Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and the second letter is written in a large round hand that, at the kitchen table looking down at it, Frank reads with the half-pleased recognition of a man reading a sergeant's handwriting that he last saw in 1968. The letter says, "Mr. Potter, I'll be coming to fetch you and bring you to Diagon Alley for your school things on the morning of August 7. Be ready at 9, tell your guardian I'll handle the flu, looking forward to meeting you and to making your acquaintance. There's lots to be excited about. Sincerely, Rubius Hagrid." There is a postscript. The postscript says, "Tell your guardian I am 6.5 feet tall and have a beard. I do not want him to be alarmed." Frank reads the postscript. Frank says in the kitchen to the tawny, "He does not want me to be alarmed." The tawny looks at him. Frank writes back. Frank writes back on a second piece of printer paper in the same block capitals, "Mr. Hagrid, acknowledged. Mr. Potter and his guardian will be ready at the apartment at 9 on August 7. Note that the apartment is on the 4th floor and is reached by a back stairway. Suggest meeting at the door of the barbershop on the street level, Mr. Castle." The tawny takes the letter. The tawny does not wait for bacon. The tawny is evidently a Hagrid owl and is therefore on a schedule. The tawny flies. Frank watches the tawny go. Frank does not lower the M1911 all the way until the tawny is a speck. That night Frank goes through the apartment. He goes through every drawer. He goes through every closet. He goes through the false bottom of the steamer trunk in the bedroom. He goes through the cavity under the floorboard beneath the kitchen sink. He goes through the heating duct in the hallway and the back of the medicine cabinet and the gap behind the kick plate of the stove and the inside of the toilet tank where there is a watertight plastic bag with $3,800 in 20s and 3 different passports for him and 3 different passports for the kid. He inventories 5 handguns, 12 magazines, 240 rounds of 9mm, 60 rounds of 45 ACP, 40 rounds of 380. 100 rounds of 22 LR including the 20 rounds with the silver tips that have ridden with him since Antwerp, the Ruger 1022, 2 boxes of 22 long rifle, the boot knife, the folding knife, the kitchen knives which are kitchen knives and the small fixed blade utility knife that lives in the side pocket of the duffel, $6,100 in US currency, $1,800 in pesos, 2,400 Deutschmarks, a roll of 38 British 20s he has been hoarding for the express purpose of buying a kid's school clothes when the day came, 6 passports, 3 for him, 3 for the kid. The kids 3 are Daniel Mahoney Jr., Harry James Potter, and a third one, made by Frank himself with stolen forms from a contact in San Antonio, that says Henry Castle, born Brooklyn, January 14, 1980. The third is the only one with the right name. The third is the one Frank uses when the kid needs medical care. The kid has, growing up, been Henry. He has been Harry to Frank in private. He has been Harry to Goran and to Bert. He has been Henry at school in Brooklyn for the year he attended kindergarten and at the doctors in Belfast and at the dentist in Sarajevo and at the chiropractor in Mexico City. He has been Daniel exactly twice, both times during border crossings. He has been Harry James Potter never in his life in any context in 11 years. He will be Harry James Potter at Hogwarts. Frank turns the passport over in his hand. The passport is a clean piece of work made by Kurt in 1981 with a baby photo Frank took with a Polaroid in the basement in Antwerp. The passport has been updated twice with new photos. The passport is good for 5 more years. The passport is the kid's true name and his true face and the only thing in the world that on paper ties him to Lily and James Potter. Frank puts the passport on the kitchen table. Frank says quietly to the empty kitchen, "It is time." The kid is sitting on the floor of the hallway. The kid has evidently been there for a while. The kid has been listening. The kid says Henry or Harry. Frank turns. Frank says, "At school, Harry. You will be Harry James Potter. You will use your real name. They know your real name. They expect your real name. You are going to walk in there as the kid they have been writing to for 10 years. The kid says, "Out of school, around you." Frank says, "Up to you, kid. You have been Henry to me at the doctor's. You have been Harry to me in the dark. You have been kid to me always. Pick what you want. I will use what you pick." The kid is quiet for a long time. The kid says, "Finally, Harry. At school I will be Harry. With you I want to be Harry too, then I do not have to switch. I have switched my whole life. I want one name for the next part." Frank says, "Harry then." The kid says, "Harry." Frank says, "Hi, Harry." The kid almost smiles. The kid says, "Hi, Dad." Frank does not sleep that night. Frank instead sits at the kitchen table and writes a long letter to a man named Micro in Queens with whom Frank has not been in contact for 9 years. The letter says in Frank's paraphrase, "Micro, I need a complete intelligence package on a person. Subject, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Position, headmaster, school in Scotland called Hogwarts. Approximate age, eligible for Social Security 4 times over. Known to be one of the most powerful operators in his community. Known to be politically influential. Known to have, over the last 50 years, taken in young men of promise as protégés and steered them toward roles in the larger structure. I want what he eats for breakfast. I want his pattern of life. I want his protégés. I want his enemies. I want his weaknesses. I want everything you can dig up that is on paper anywhere. I will pay your usual rate. I will pay you in cash. I need this by August 1. A second package, lower priority. Subject: Lucius Malfoy, English aristocrat, head of an old wizarding family. Same depth as above. Reply to P.O. Box 47, Mexico City, Federal District, Mexico. Burn after reading. Frank reads the letter twice. Frank seals it in an envelope. Frank in the morning walks it to the post office at the corner of Reforma and mails it. Frank pays in pesos. Frank does not say his name to the clerk. Frank walks out. Micro replies in 19 days. Micro replies in the form of a 6-pound manila envelope delivered to P.O. Box 47 by a courier in a Volkswagen. Frank picks up the envelope. Frank takes the envelope home. Frank takes the envelope into the bedroom and sits on the floor with his back to the door and reads, by the light of the bedside lamp, for 4 hours. Dumbledore. Dumbledore is a problem. Dumbledore, by the time Frank closes the file, is a man Frank has read about for 4 hours and feels he has known about for 40 years. Dumbledore is a 110-year-old man with on his record a war won against a previous dark wizard in the 1940s, a successful directorship of a school for 50 years, a chairmanship of the Wizarding Supreme Court, a chief warlock position, several international diplomatic appointments, a long history of placing his protégés in positions of power across the wizarding world, and a personal pattern of life that involves daily walks on the grounds of the school. A fondness for sherbet lemons, a recurring tendency to keep important information from people who need to have it, and a record of, over 50 years, having watched a series of young men go bad on his watch and continuing to insist that the next one would be different. Frank reads the section on the young men who went bad. The first young man who went bad on Dumbledore's watch was Gellert Grindelwald, the dark wizard from the 1940s. Grindelwald and Dumbledore were friends as young men. Grindelwald started a war. Dumbledore ended the war. Frank reads twice the line that says Dumbledore and Grindelwald are believed to have had a personal relationship in their youth. Frank notes the line. Frank does not draw a conclusion. The second young man who went bad on Dumbledore's watch was Tom Marvolo Riddle, also known as Lord Voldemort, also known as the Dead One. Riddle was a student at Hogwarts. Riddle was top of his class. Dumbledore noticed early that Riddle was unwell. Dumbledore did not act. Dumbledore kept Riddle in the school. Dumbledore wrote letters. Dumbledore had concerns. Dumbledore let Riddle go out into the world. Riddle started a war. The war is the war that killed Lily and James Potter. The war is the war that put a piece of the Dead One into the kid's forehead. Frank reads this section 3 times. Frank thinks 2 for 2. This is a man who, with 2 young men who could have been stopped, did not stop them. This is a man who lets things play out. This is a man who watches. This is a man who is a chess player. The fortune teller said 10 years ago in a back room in Antwerp that the people who took the boy would be looking, and they would be looking for a long time, and when they found him they would have a plan for him. Frank reads the section on Dumbledore's pattern of life with the kid he is about to take in. Dumbledore, the file says, has prepared a placement for the Potter child since the death of the Potters. Dumbledore, the file says, intended to place the child with the child's maternal aunt's family in Surrey. Dumbledore, the file says, has watched that placement be denied to him for 10 years by a stranger. Dumbledore, the file says, is going to want to meet the stranger. Frank thinks, yeah, he is. Frank thinks, good. Frank puts the file down. Frank gets up. Frank goes to the kitchen. Frank says to the kid who is doing homework that the kid assigns himself, which is reading a Time Life book on World War II for the second time. Kid. The kid looks up. Frank says, when we go to England, I am going to want to sit down with the old man. The kid says, the headmaster. Frank says, the headmaster. The kid says, should I be in the room? Frank says, number, I want him alone. The kid says, are you going to hurt him? Frank says, I am going to explain things to him, the way you explain things to a chess player, by showing him a piece he did not know was on the board. The kid says, which piece? Frank says, me. The kid nods. The kid goes back to the Time Life book. The kid, with great concentration, turns to the next page. The night before they leave for England, the kid sits with Frank at the kitchen table and they go through the rules. The rules are not the 4 rules of weapons. The 4 rules of weapons the kid has memorized for 5 years. The rules are the rules of the mission. Frank says, first, you are a student. You are a normal student. You are an 11-year-old who is excited to be at a school of magic. You wear that face like a coat. You wear it at all times around all people. You take it off only when you are alone with me. The kid says, understood. Frank says, second, you make no friends but you appear to. You will need cover. You will need to look like a kid who fits in. The way to look like a kid who fits in is to have a kid or two who sits next to you in the dining hall and asks how your day was. Pick kids who will do that. Pick kids who are useful for information. Pick kids whose families are positioned in ways that might tell us something. Pick kids who are unlikely to ask you hard questions. Be friendly. Do not be vulnerable. There is a difference. The kid says, understood. Frank says, third, you learn the magic, you learn it as fast as you can. Magic is going to be the most important weapon you have in there. You came in untrained, they will treat you as untrained, you will use the assumption against them. By the end of year 1 I want you ahead, by the end of year 2 I want you ahead and hiding it. Top quartile in your class but not first, first is suspicious, top quartile is plausible, be plausible. The kid says, understood. Frank says, fourth, you report to me every day, we will figure out the channel. Probably an evening walk on the grounds, probably some kind of dead drop. We will work the channel before we work the targets. We do not move on any target until I have a verified channel from you to me and from me to you that is undetected for 30 days. The kid says, understood. Frank says, fifth, you do not kill anyone the first year, you do not even start working a target. The first year you build the dossier, you watch the kids in your class, you listen at meals, you map the castle, you map the patrols, you learn the patrol schedules of the teachers, you learn the patrol schedules of the ghosts. You learn the secret passages, you learn the staff hierarchy. By the end of year 1 I want a map of that place that is better than the map any of the staff has. The kid says, understood. Frank says, sixth. You do not break the code, not once, not for any reason. You do not kill a kid in your class no matter what the kid does. You do not kill a teacher no matter what the teacher does. You do not kill an auror, which is what they call their cops. You do not kill anyone you cannot make a case on. The case has to be airtight. The case has to be on paper somewhere in your handwriting, and you bring me the paper before the bullet leaves the gun. We do this clean or we do not do this at all. The kid says, understood. Frank says, seventh, if at any point you want to stop, you tell me and we stop. We do not stop because it is hard. We do not stop because you are tired. We stop because you have decided this is not the work you want to be doing. That is a real reason. If you ever feel that reason, you tell me and we walk away. We pick a fifth country, we start over. The mission is not bigger than you. The mission is for you. You are not for the mission. Are you hearing me? The kid says, I am hearing you. Frank says, tell me back. The kid says, the mission is for me. I am not for the mission. If I want to stop, we stop. The mission is not bigger than me. Frank says, right. The kid says, but I do not want to stop. Frank says, I know. The kid says, I have wanted this for as long as I could want a thing. Frank says, I know. The kid says, did you ever ask yourself if you should have raised me different? Frank, after a long pause, says, every day. I ask myself every day. The kid says, and what is the answer? Frank says, the answer is that I do not know. The answer is that maybe a different father would have given you a different life and a happier one. The answer is also that you did not get a different father, you got me. And the man you have become with me is a man I would have walked into a foxhole with at 20. The man you have become, kid, is the best thing I have ever made. The kid is very quiet. The kid says, finally, I am not going to make you regret it. Frank says, I already do not regret it. The kid says, I am still not going to make you regret it. Frank says, okay. The kid stands. The kid clears the table. The kid washes the 2 coffee cups and sets them upside down on the dish rack. The kid walks past Frank toward the bedroom. The kid stops at the doorway. The kid does not turn around. The kid says, Dad. Frank says, yeah. The kid says, thank you for picking me up. The kid goes to bed. Frank sits at the kitchen table for another hour. Frank is not crying because Frank does not do that, but Frank's face, in the dim light from the street lamp outside, is the face of a man who is doing the thing that men do when they do not cry, which is everything else. Outside, the city of Mexico City goes on, cars pass. A radio plays from an open window across the street, a dog barks, the night turns. Frank at the table opens the notebook and writes on a fresh page a single line. The line says August 7, Diagon Alley, Phase 1 begins. He underlines the line, he closes the notebook. He sleeps 4 hours on the kitchen floor. He dreams for the first time in 10 years of Maria. Maria is reading a book. Maria looks up. Maria says, very quiet, you did okay, Frank, you did okay. Maria smiles. The smile is the smile he has not seen since June of 1981. Maria goes back to her book. Frank wakes up at 5. Frank gets up. Frank in the bathroom looks at his face in the mirror. His face looks like a man's face. The face has not looked like a man's face for 10 years. The face has looked like a weapon. Today in the mirror it is a man's face. Frank says to the mirror, very quiet, okay Maria, okay. He goes to make the coffee. A note, however, on the owl that Frank shot, because Frank in the time between the first owl and the second owl did shoot an owl. Frank shot the third owl. The third owl was, as it would turn out later, the personal owl of Deputy Headmistress Minerva McGonagall, dispatched to confirm receipt of Frank's letter and to clarify the meeting time, and Frank, who had set up a folding chair on the roof of the apartment building the second night with the Beretta and a thermos of coffee and the kid asleep 4 floors below, had been waiting for exactly this kind of follow-up. The owl came in over the Reforma at 3 in the morning. The owl was a small gray thing with the bearing of a magistrate. The owl was 40 feet up. Frank picked up the owl in his peripheral vision the way Frank picks up any moving object against the city sky. Frank stood. Frank brought the Beretta up. Frank squeezed. The Beretta cracked once in the warm air over Colonia Doctors at 3 on a Tuesday morning. The round, by any honest accounting, struck the owl center mass. The owl did not fall. The owl, in fact, did not break stride. The owl flapped twice with the air of a magistrate who has just had to remove an irritating fly from her cape and continued her descent toward the iron railing of the kitchen window 2 floors below Frank. The owl landed. The owl arranged her wings. The owl looked up at Frank on the roof. The owl, Frank would later swear, raised one eyebrow. Frank lowered the beretta. Frank said out loud on the roof to the owl on the railing 2 floors below, "Okay." Frank that night went down to the kitchen and gave the owl a piece of cheese and apologized. The owl, who had come bearing a brief professional note about meeting times signed M. McGonagall, accepted the apology in the form of cheese and took, in her beak, Frank's brief professional response, and flew away into the Mexico City night with the dignity of a bureaucrat who has put a small problem politely back in its place. Frank, on the roof for the rest of the night, made an addition to the notebook. The addition said, "New data. Bullets do not work on certain animals belonging to certain people. Assume certain people are themselves so protected. Strategy must account for this. Silver rounds, cold iron, ritual conditions untested. Test AT earliest opportunity. Also by MCGONAGLL Flowers." Frank closed the notebook. Frank, on the roof of the apartment building in Colonia Doctors at 4 in the morning on August 6, 1991. With his shoulder against the brick chimney and his coffee gone cold in the thermos and his son asleep 4 floors below and a small gray owl winging eastward across the lights of Mexico City carrying a folded piece of printer paper with the words Mr. Castle on the outside, was, for the first time in his adult life, going into a fight in which he could not be sure his gun would fire on his enemy. Frank thought, good. Frank thought, that is going to be educational. The night of August 6, the kid sits on the edge of his bed and Frank stands in the bedroom doorway and they go through the kid's go bag. In the go bag, 3 changes of Muggle clothes, 2 sealed envelopes containing the cash Frank has set aside for the term and the cash Frank has set aside in case of emergency exit, a small first aid kit packed by the kid himself, a clean folded handkerchief. A photograph of Frank and the kid in Sarajevo, taken by Goran with a Polaroid in 1988, in which the kid is 7 years old and grinning and holding a wooden duck that Goran had carved for him, and Frank is squinting at the camera and not quite smiling. A spare pair of glasses because the kid started wearing glasses at age 8 after Frank insisted on a real optometrist's appointment that had revealed a moderate astigmatism. 3 notebooks, brand new, college-ruled, pens, a small steel mirror hand-sized. The Beretta is not in the go bag. The Beretta is not coming to Hogwarts. They have, in conversation, decided that the kid will go in unarmed at first, on the principle that an 11-year-old with a Beretta is something that no school in any country will tolerate noticing, and they cannot count on his trunk being uninspected. Weapons, if needed, will be procured on site in pieces over time in the manner Frank has practiced for 30 years. The kid asks, looking at the go bag, "What is the steel mirror for?" Frank says, "It is a signal mirror, 40 miles on a clear day. If you ever need to signal me from a window or a hilltop and I am within line of sight and conditions are right, you flash me. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, the standard SOS, you know the standard." The kid says, "I know the standard." Frank says, "Hopefully you never use it." The kid says, "Hopefully." The kid closes the go bag. The kid sets the go bag at the foot of the bed. The kid lies down. The kid, with great deliberation, folds his hands behind his head. The kid says, "Dad." Frank says, "Yeah." The kid says, "When this is done, when it is all done, can we go fishing?" Frank in the doorway blinks. Frank says, "Fishing?" The kid says, "I read a book in Sarajevo. There was a kid in it who went fishing with his dad. They went out on a lake in a boat and they did not catch anything and they ate sandwiches. I want to do that." After, Frank says, "After what?" The kid says, "After the dead one, after the list, after the school." Frank says, "Kid, after all of that, we can go fishing every day for the rest of my life. I will buy a boat. I will buy a lake. I will buy you a tackle box big enough to live in." The kid almost smiles. The kid says, "1 boat will be enough." Frank says, "1 boat." The kid says, "With sandwiches." Frank says, "With sandwiches." The kid says, "Okay." The kid closes his eyes. Frank stays in the doorway a long time. Frank watches the kid breathe. Frank, in his head in the dark of the hallway, makes a note. The note is not in the notebook. The note is in the place behind the notebook, the place Frank has not used in 10 years, the place that has the room shape of Maria's hand against his shoulder and Lisa's voice saying "Daddy" and a small folded set of pajamas in a drawer somebody else closed. The note says, "A boat, a lake. Sandwiches, you owe the kid all 3. Frank turns off the hallway light. Frank goes to bed. Frank, for the second night in his life since June of 1981, sleeps without sitting up. In the morning, Mr. Rubius Hagrid arrives at the door of the barbershop at the corner of Calmir y Pesado at 8:59 local time, 6.5 feet tall, with a beard, with a pink umbrella, with a slightly dazed expression, and the next phase begins. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4, Diagon Alley and the Headmaster Conversation. Mr. Rubius Hagrid does not so much arrive at the door of the barber shop as condense, all at once, into the space between the awning and the curb. He is, by Frank's estimate, 6'8", 290 pounds, beard the size of a beagle, coat made of the kind of waxed canvas that has not been waxed since the second Roosevelt, eyes wet kind, slightly alarmed. He holds the pink umbrella in his right hand the way a man holds a thing the man is not allowed to be without. The pink umbrella, Frank's eyes note, has a slight bulge at the handle in the shape of almost certainly a concealed wand. Frank had wondered if the wizards did this. The wizards do this. Frank steps out of the barbershop's front door. Frank is wearing a denim jacket over a plain gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and the kind of work boots that look like work boots from any distance over 4 feet. Under the jacket, in a small back holster, is the M1911. At his ankle, in a soft holster, is the 380. Inside his coat pocket are 3 spare magazines for the M1911 and 1 for the 380, and a small flat object that, if asked, Frank will describe as a billfold, but that is, in fact, a thin folding knife. Frank is dressed for what Frank is dressed for. Frank does not wear a tactical glamour because Frank does not own one yet. Frank today is Frank. The kid steps out behind Frank. The kid is wearing jeans and a t-shirt the kid picked out himself in a department store in the Colonia Roma yesterday afternoon, on the principle that an 11-year-old who has been living in 2 t-shirts for 3 months will draw less suspicion at a school of magic if the 11-year-old shows up looking like an 11-year-old. The t-shirt has the logo of a Mexican football club the kid does not follow. The jeans are a little too long and are rolled at the cuff. The kid looks up at Hagrid. The kid says in clear and unaccented English, "Mr. Hagrid." Hagrid says, voice the size of a barn door swinging open, Harry Potter, by all that's wandering, look at you." The kid extends a hand. The kid says, "Pleased to meet you." Hagrid takes the kid's hand. Hagrid's hand swallows the kid's hand to the wrist. Hagrid does not crush it. Hagrid, in this small gesture, demonstrates a level of physical control that Frank notes with quiet approval. Hagrid is large. Hagrid is also careful. Hagrid says, "And you must be the guardian." Frank says, "Castle." Frank, "Castle." Hagrid says, "Right. Right, Mr. Castle." Pleasure. Hagrid's mind, they shake. Hagrid's grip is the grip of a man who has caught full-grown horses by the leg. Frank's grip is the grip of a man who has, in his time, removed teeth from men's faces using only an open hand. The two of them, in the moment of the handshake, communicate without speaking the rough boundaries of a treaty. Hagrid says, "So, Diagon Alley, we're going by flu. Have you used the flu network before, Mr. Castle?" Frank says, "Have not." Hagrid says, Right, it's a powder you throw in a fire and you step in and you say where you want to go and the fire takes you. Sounds mad, works fine, I'll go first. Then Harry, then you'll come out at the leaky cauldron. It's a pub in London, we meet at the bar. Sound good? Frank says, "It sounds like a transportation system that requires me to step into a fire." Hagrid says, "It does, yeah." Frank says, "Where is the fire?" Hagrid says, "I figured we could use the one in the barber shop if your friend Mr. Hector doesn't mind. I brought my own flu powder." Frank says, "Hector minds nothing for me, use the fire." The fire in Hector's barbershop is in the back room where Hector keeps the kettle for his tea and the spare bottles of Pinard. It is a small wood stove with a cast iron door and a chimney that runs up through the second floor and out the roof. Hagrid kneels in front of it. Hagrid touches the stove with the tip of the pink umbrella. The stove, which has been cold for 2 months because it is August in Mexico City and Hector heats his tea on a hot plate, fills with green flame. Frank behind Hagrid watches with the still attention of a man watching a fuse burn. Hagrid takes a pinch of gray powder from a pouch on his belt. Hagrid throws the powder into the green flame. The flame turns greener. Hagrid says in his big voice, "Leaky cauldron, London." Hagrid steps into the fire. Hagrid is gone. The fire returns to ordinary green. The kid looks at Frank. Frank says, "Go." The kid steps forward. The kid takes a pinch of the powder from the pouch Hagrid has left on the floor. The kid throws the powder into the fire. The kid says in a clear voice, "Leaky cauldron, London." The kid steps into the fire. The kid is gone. Frank stands alone in the back room of the barbershop with a fire that runs through space and a pouch of powder on the floor and a feeling in his chest that he has just watched the kid walk into a country Frank cannot follow him into. Frank takes the powder. Frank throws the powder. Frank says, "Leaky cauldron, London." Frank steps into the fire. The fire is not hot. The fire is, by every sensory measure Frank has, a hallway. Frank, with the M1911 still in his belt and the 380 still on his ankle and the kid's voice still in his ears, walks the hallway with his shooting hand free. And at the other end of the hallway is a brick fireplace in a dim wood-paneled pub in central London where his son is standing waiting for him with a smudge of soot on the kid's cheek and a half-smile on the kid's face, and Hagrid behind him gesturing at the bar. Frank steps out of the fire. Frank says very quietly to no one in particular, "I am going to need a drink at some point." The kid says, "Later." Frank says, "Later." Diagon Alley, the wizarding shopping street, is reached by tapping a specific brick in the wall of the courtyard behind the leaky cauldron with the tip of a wand. at which point the bricks reorganize themselves into an archway and a small alley becomes visible. An alley that does not, as far as Frank can determine, occupy any of the space it ought to be occupying given the geometry of the street, and an alley that is when one walks into it. A riot of shops and signs and people in robes that look like they were sewn between the 17th century and last Tuesday. Frank, walking into Diagon Alley, takes 13 seconds to assess the alley. He counts the entrances. He counts 3, the leaky cauldron arch behind him, a narrow lane on the left 2/3 down that says Nocturne Alley, and a small unmarked door beside a robe shop that he will later determine leads to a courtyard with a side gate. He counts the floors. The buildings are 3 to 4 stories. The roofs are tiled, the roofs are walkable. He counts the windows on each floor. He counts the chimneys. He counts the gargoyles, of which there are an unreasonable number, and he marks 2 of them as gargoyles that have, with the gentle slowness of statues that are not quite statues, just turned their heads toward him. He counts the people. Approximately 140 visible from his position at the alley mouth. Mostly families, children with parents. A few wizards alone, in robes the colors of which Frank cannot find a pattern for. 2 men in red leather coats standing at the entrance to a bookshop who, by Frank's read of body language, are private security or low-level enforcement. 3 men in plain dark robes standing at intervals along the alley, eyes moving in the same patterns Frank's eyes move in, who are almost certainly aurors, cops. He counts the roof lines for snipers. There are no snipers. There is no obvious sniper position. There is no obvious counter-sniper position. There is also no obvious sniper culture in this place. The wizards, Frank deduces, do not shoot from rooftops. The wizards have not yet imagined that anyone might shoot from a rooftop. The wizards are in this respect 10,000 years behind the Muggle world. Frank files this observation. Frank files it carefully. Hagrid says beside him, "First stop, Gringotts, the bank, you'll have a vault. Your parents left it for you." The kid says, "Lead the way." Gringotts is white marble and bronze doors and goblins. The goblins are short. The goblins have long fingers. The goblins have, when one looks at them long enough, the eyes of people who have been doing one job for 50 generations and are no longer particularly impressed by any human. Frank likes the goblins immediately. Frank likes the goblins because the goblins, in their bearing, remind Frank of the longshoreman crew at the Brooklyn Naval Yard who used to be his clients when he was a young Marine on shore patrol. Hard workers. No bullshit. Will outlast you. The kid's vault is in the bowels of the building. They reach it by a small mining cart that flies down a track at a speed Frank, who has driven Yugos sideways on gravel, finds professionally impressive. The kid sits beside Frank. The kid's eyes are bright. The kid says into Frank's ear over the noise, "This is great." Frank says, "Yeah, kid, the vault when they arrive contains gold. Gold in piles, gold in stacks, gold in a small mountain. Gold of 3 denominations that Hagrid identifies with some patience as galleons, sickles, and nuts." Frank does the math in his head with the exchange rate Hagrid mentions and concludes in approximately 4 seconds that the kid has in his possession the rough equivalent of 300,000 US dollars in liquid currency. Frank does not say anything. The kid does not say anything either. The kid takes with care exactly the amount Hagrid says is needed for school supplies and not 1 galleon more. The kid puts the money in a small leather bag that the bank provides for this purpose. The kid steps back. The kid says to the goblin who has been waiting at the vault, "Thank you." The goblin nods. The goblin, as they leave, looks at Frank. The goblin says in his quiet voice, "Sir." Frank says, "Sir." The goblin says, "This vault is older than the bank itself." The vault belonged to the boy's great-great-grandfather. There are wards on this vault that have not been triggered in 90 years. Frank says, "I am not planning to trigger any wards." The goblin says, "I did not think you were, sir. I am only saying that if anyone else tries, the wards will trigger and the bank will hold the trespasser and the bank will, with the boy's permission, inform you." Frank looks at the goblin for a long moment. Frank says, "That is very generous of the bank." The goblin says, "The bank is not generous, sir. The bank dislikes the same people you have come here intending to dislike. The bank has dealings with those people which have not gone well for the bank for 2 centuries. The bank is offering you what the bank can offer without violating the bank's neutrality." Frank says, "Understood." The goblin says, "Welcome to England, Mr. Castle." Frank says, "Thank you, sir." They go back up the rails. Diagon Alley in approximately 2.5 hours yields 1 Hogwarts uniform set including the robes. Frank notes that the robes have inner pockets large enough for an 11-year-old to conceal up to 4 magazines and a folding knife. Frank does not say this in front of the witch at the fitting counter. The kid, who has noted the same fact, does not say it either. 1 trunk, black, reinforced corners, brass clasps. 2 internal compartments. The trunk Frank chooses because the trunk has, as the wizard salesman demonstrates, a charm that allows the trunk to be locked against opening by anyone whose name is not Harry James Potter. Frank pays an additional 5 galleons for an extension of the charm that allows Frank Castle to also open the trunk. Frank pays an additional 10 galleons for the salesman's silence. 1 cauldron pewter standard size 2, a scale, a telescope, a set of brass weights, a book of spells. Several other books with titles like a standard book of spells, grade 1, and a history of magic. Frank notes which books are by which author. Frank notes which books are unsigned, which means censored, which means worth reading later for what they do not say. A wand. The wand happens at Ollivander's. Ollivander's is a long, narrow shop with 1 chair, 1 counter, and 10,000 small boxes stacked floor to ceiling. The shopkeeper, Mr. Garrick Ollivander, is small and pale and old and has eyes like a man who has spent 50 years looking at children and trying to read them. Ollivander looks at the kid as the kid steps through the door. Ollivander says, Mr. Potter, I wondered when I would see you. The kid says, good afternoon, sir. Ollivander says, I remember every wand I ever sold, Mr. Potter. Your father had a fine wand, mahogany 11 inches, good for transfiguration. Your mother had a willow wand, swishy 10 1/4, lovely for charms. Ollivander says, his eyes flicking to the cut in the kid's forehead, I am sorry to say I also remember the wand that gave you that scar, 13 1/2 inches, you with a phoenix feather core, a powerful wand, Mr. Potter, a terrible wand, powerful in the wrong hands. The kid says very evenly, yes. Ollivander says, yes. Ollivander begins then the long ritual of trying wands. He hands the kid a wand. The kid waves the wand, nothing happens. Ollivander takes the wand. He hands the kid another. The kid waves it. A flower vase shatters. Ollivander takes the wand. He hands the kid another. The kid waves it. A small breeze stirs. Ollivander takes the wand back, then pauses, then puts it down with a different expression than he has had so far. Ollivander goes deep into the shelves. Ollivander comes back with a long, thin box. Ollivander opens the box. Ollivander says, holly, 11 inches, nice and supple, core of a single phoenix tail feather, try it. The kid takes the wand. A warmth runs up the kid's arm. A small wind moves through the shop. A series of golden sparks shoots from the end of the wand and hangs in the air for a long second before settling slowly onto the floor like snow. Ollivander is very still. Ollivander says, curious, curious. The kid says, sir. Ollivander says, I remember every wand I sell, Mr. Potter. The phoenix whose tail feather is inside that wand in your hand gave another feather, just one other. It is very curious that you should be destined for this wand when its brother was the wand that gave you that scar. The kid looks at the wand. The kid says, sir, the other feather, the other wand, where is it? Ollivander says, I do not know precisely, Mr. Potter. The wand was sold in 1938 to a young man named Tom Riddle. The wand was lost on Halloween of 1981. It has not been seen since. I have not been asked to make a replacement, which suggests its owner has not had occasion to need one. The kid looks at Frank. Frank by the door with his hands in his coat pockets nods once. The kid turns back to Ollivander. The kid says, thank you, Mr. Ollivander, this wand will do. The kid pays. The wand goes into the inside pocket of the kid's new robes. The kid, on the way out, does not look back at the old wand maker. The old wand maker, behind the counter, watches the kid go, with the look of a man who has been waiting many years for a particular page to turn, and who is unsure whether he is relieved or terrified that he has now turned it. They eat lunch at the Leaky Cauldron. Hagrid, who has over the course of the morning formed an evident attachment to the kid, orders 3 steak and ale pies and offers one to Frank, which Frank declines on the grounds that he does not eat large meals when he is on a job. Hagrid does not press. Hagrid is, Frank notes, a careful man who picks up cues. Hagrid is a man Frank, in a different life, would have spent more time getting to know. Hagrid says between bites, there is one more stop if you don't mind. The kid says, where? Hagrid says, a pet, you're allowed one, owl, cat, or toad. I thought you might fancy an owl. The kid says, looking at Frank, an owl. Frank says, owls are useful. The kid says, owls deliver mail. Frank says, owls deliver mail. The kid says, owls also can carry small objects like notes or keys. Frank says, yes. The kid says, an owl, Mr. Hagrid. Let us go look at an owl. They go to Aelip's Owl Emporium. The kid, after a long, careful inspection of 24 birds, picks a snowy owl that is, in the kid's words, looking back at him in a serious way. Hagrid says it is a fine choice. Frank, looking at the snowy owl, sees a bird that is, in fact, looking back at the kid in a serious way and recognizes the look. The look is the look of a creature that has just selected its handler, not the other way around. Frank thinks, good for the kid. They name her Hedwig. The kid picks the name from a book of magical names Hagrid hands him at the register. Hedwig was, in the book, a saint. Frank does not comment on the choice. Frank, in his private accounting, marks Hedwig as the kid's first piece of dedicated infrastructure in the wizarding world. It is at the end of the day, when Hagrid is shepherding them back toward the Leaky Cauldron, that Frank does the thing Frank has been planning to do all afternoon. Frank says, Mr. Hagrid. Hagrid says, "Yes, Mr. Castle." Frank says, "I would like a word with the headmaster of your school." Tonight, Hagrid stops walking. Hagrid looks at Frank. Hagrid's face does several things in slow succession. First surprise, then the slow caution of a man who realizes he has been walking a fence line that after all has a wire in it, then finally a careful blank. Hagrid says, "Professor Dumbledore." Frank says, "That is the one." Hagrid says, "Tonight." Frank says, "Tonight." Hagrid says, he's a busy man, Mr. Castle. He's in Edinburgh today on a thing. I could probably arrange a sit-down for next week if you'd like, but tonight is going to be a stretch." Frank says, "Tonight?" Hagrid says, looking at Frank's face, "Right, tonight, I'll send him an owl. I'll send him an owl from the bar." Hagrid sends an owl from the bar. Hagrid drinks 2 pints while waiting for the response. The kid drinks a butterbeer, which Hagrid orders for him with the explanation that butterbeer has only a trace of alcohol and is essentially a child's drink in this culture. The kid sips it slowly. The kid is, Frank notes, taking small careful sips and not letting the beverage interfere with his peripheral attention. The owl returns in 40 minutes. The owl carries a small folded note in violet ink. Hagrid reads the note. Hagrid's eyebrows go up. Hagrid says, "The professor will see you tonight, Mr. Castle, at his office. Hogsmeade, the village beside the school. You'll flew to the 3 broomsticks." The professor's office is reached by a stone gargoyle in the main castle. The password is sherbet lemon. Hagrid hesitates. Hagrid says, "The professor says he is looking forward to meeting you." Frank says, "Tell him that goes for me as well." Hagrid nods. Hagrid does not press. Frank in his head in a private quiet room behind his face files the note's response time, the violet ink, and the absence of a security protocol with which to verify Frank's identity before granting a sit-down. The wizards, here as in Diagon Alley, do not yet know what to do about a man with a gun in a holster on his hip. They are improvising. They are improvising, importantly, from a position of curiosity rather than caution. That is going to make the conversation easier. The kid stays at the Leaky Cauldron with Hagrid. The kid will sleep in a rented room above the bar. The kid will be picked up in the morning and flued back to Mexico. The kid will then in 2 weeks be flued back to platform 9 3/4 and put on the train to Hogwarts. Frank, before he goes, sits with the kid at a small table in the corner of the pub. Frank says, "I will be back by midnight. If I am not back by midnight, you take Hedwig and you go to the goblin we met today and you tell him I sent you. The goblin will get you on a portkey to New York. From New York, you call Kurt at the number in your wallet. Kurt will take you in. You stay with Kurt until you are 18. Kurt knows where the safe deposit boxes are. The kid says, you will be back by midnight. Frank says, I will be back by midnight, but you have the contingency. The kid says, I have the contingency. Frank says, eat your butterbeer. The kid says, I have eaten my butterbeer. Frank says, eat another butterbeer. The kid says, I am not going to be drunk when you get back, Dad. Frank, almost smiling, number you are not. Frank stands. Frank puts his hand on the kid's shoulder for 1 short second. Frank goes. The 3 Broomsticks is a pub. Frank steps out of the fireplace with the smell of wood smoke on his clothes and the M1911 unobtrusive at the small of his back. The pub is busy. The barmaid is competent. Frank tips his head to her and walks out into the street. Hogsmeade in August is a village of low stone houses with thatched roofs lit by lanterns that on inspection contain no candle and yet glow at the brightness of 40-watt bulbs. The street curves up a hill. At the top of the hill, 3/4 of a mile distant, stands a castle of 7 towers, lit window by window in the falling dusk, which is the school for which Frank's son has just bought a wand. Frank takes the walk slow. Frank takes the walk slow because Frank is committing the path to memory. Doorways, alleys, roofs, the window of the pub above the bar where one would put a rifle, the hill behind the castle and the dip in it where one would put a forward observer. The walls of the castle and the angles at which they would receive incoming fire and the lengths of the gravel paths, and the distances between the courtyards and the shape of the entry and the placement of the lamps and the number of large trees within 50 meters of the front entrance, of which there are 4, 3 of which would conceal a man. By the time Frank reaches the gates of the school, he has mapped the village. The gates of the school open as he approaches. There is, when he passes through them, a small pressure against his skin, a feeling like passing through a curtain of warm air, wards. Frank takes the pressure as data. Frank notes that the pressure did not stop him. Frank notes that the pressure recognized him as expected. Frank notes that whoever opened the gates for him is paying attention. The stone gargoyle is in a side corridor on the 2nd floor of the central tower. The gargoyle, when Frank arrives, is sitting placidly in front of a closed wall. Frank says, conversationally, sherbet lemon. The gargoyle blinks. The gargoyle steps aside. The wall behind the gargoyle reveals a spiral staircase, slowly turning under Frank's feet as it ascends. Frank steps onto the staircase. Frank rides the staircase up. The staircase deposits him in front of a heavy oak door which opens slowly as Frank reaches it. Beyond the door, a circular room, bookshelves, instruments, a perch on which a red and gold bird sits with its eyes half closed, a desk. Behind the desk, an old man. The old man stands when Frank enters. The old man is tall. The old man has a beard the color of clean snow that reaches to his belt. The old man's eyes are blue and clear and have, in them, the look of a man who has spent 90 years not being surprised. The old man is wearing robes of midnight blue with small silver stars. The old man is, by every metric Frank has, the most dangerous person Frank has been alone in a room with since 1972. The old man says, "Mr. Castle, I have been looking forward to meeting you for 10 years. Frank says, "Sit down." The old man, after a half-second of recalibration, sits down. Frank does not sit down. Frank walks instead around the room. He walks the perimeter slowly. He looks at the instruments. He looks at the books. He looks at the bird, which opens one eye at him and closes it again. He looks at the windows. He counts the exits, of which there is one, the door he came in by, and possibly two if the bird's perch covers a hidden alcove, which Frank, by the angle of the wall behind it, suspects it does. The old man waits. The old man, Frank notices, has folded his hands on the desk and is not reaching for the wand that is presumably on his person. Frank completes his circuit. Frank comes to a stop in front of the desk. Frank, with one smooth motion, draws the M1911 from the small of his back, racks the slide partway to confirm the round in the chamber that he loaded an hour ago, and lays the M1911 on the desk between them with the muzzle pointed at his own stomach. Frank says this is a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol manufactured by the Colt Company in 1958. There is a round in the chamber, the safety is off. The trigger pull is 4.5 pounds. The weapon will fire if you pick it up and pull the trigger. The weapon will also fire if I pick it up and pull the trigger. The old man looks at the weapon. The old man says after a moment, "I see." Frank says, "I am putting it there to demonstrate that I am not going to use it on you today. I am putting it there so that we can have a conversation without the weapon being an unspoken thing. The weapon on the desk is a spoken thing. I would like the conversation to be about the boy." The old man says very slowly, "Yes, I would also like that." Frank says, "I am going to ask the questions. You are going to answer them. If you lie, I will know. If you try magic on me of any kind, I will respond in the manner I have been trained to respond. I have killed in my professional capacity on 3 continents over the course of 30 years. I have not in any of those years lost a fight that I started. I would like for you to consider, before you do anything, that I am here in your office at my own initiative. You did not bring me here. I came. Tell me, please, what that suggests about my confidence in this situation." The old man says, "It suggests that you have in some manner planned for every contingency that I might present." Frank says, "That is right." The old man says, "Mr. Castle, before we begin, I would like to say one thing. I would like to thank you. I owe you an enormous debt that I am unsure how I shall ever repay. You saved the boy's life on the night of his parents' death. You have kept him alive in a manner that I, who am supposed to be among the best of our world at such things, could not have hoped to manage. You have, against the assumptions of every wizard I know, raised him to be, by the few signs I have so far been able to glean, a young man of considerable competence and apparent moral seriousness. For all of this, I thank you. Whatever happens between us today, please understand that gratitude is what I begin with." Frank does not move. Frank says, "Thank you, Professor. Tell me the prophecy." The old man's eyes do not move. The old man is, Frank can see, instantly calibrating a question he was not asked. The old man says, "Mr. Castle, the prophecy is a piece of information that I have, until this moment, shared with only 3 living people." Frank says, "Tell me, please, the prophecy." The old man says, "Yes, I will. I will tell it to you because you have asked, and because I have 10 years of debt to begin paying, and because you are correct that this conversation can only proceed on the basis of full disclosure." The old man recites from memory, "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not. And either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the 7th month dies." Frank stands very still. Frank says, "Neither can live while the other survives." The old man says, "Yes." Frank says, "That is a fancy way of saying the kid has to be the one who finishes the job." The old man says, "Yes." Frank says, "You knew this on the day I took him." The old man says, "I knew it on the day he was born." Frank says, "And you intended to set him up for it?" The old man, after a long pause, says, "Yes." Frank says, "How?" The old man says slowly, "I had intended to place the boy with his maternal aunt and her family in a household of frankly indifferent love. I had intended to allow him to grow up unaware of his fame, his history, and his enemies. I had intended for the boy to come to me at 11, untrained, vulnerable, and entirely without resources, save those I would at the appropriate moments provide. I had intended, in plain English, Mr. Castle, to raise him as a lamb." Frank says, "A lamb for what?" The old man says, "For the slaughter, or so it would have appeared. The prophecy says that neither can live while the other survives. I had, in my deepest considerations, concluded that the boy would, at the appropriate hour, need to face the Dark Lord and submit to a killing curse, in order that the piece of the Dark Lord's soul that is lodged in his scar might be destroyed thereby. Whether the boy would survive that submission, I could not be certain. I hoped he might. Frank says, very quiet, you hoped. The old man says, I hoped, Mr. Castle. Frank says, you hoped. The old man says, yes. Frank says, stand up. The old man stands up. Frank picks up the M1911. Frank, in one smooth motion, walks around the desk, takes the old man by the front of his robe with his off hand, and pushes the old man back into the wall behind the desk, and places the muzzle of the M1911 under the old man's chin, and pushes up until the old man's head is tilted back, and the old man's blue eyes are looking down their length at Frank's face from 6 inches away. The old man does not reach for his wand. The old man does not in any visible way react. The old man, Frank notes, has done this before. The old man has, at some point in his long life, been pressed against a wall by a man with a weapon and has decided that the way to survive such a moment is to make oneself a thing the other man does not need to shoot. The old man is making himself, against Frank's chest, very small. Frank says, voice very low and very even, you hoped my son would die so your prophecy would be satisfied. The old man says, Mr. Castle. Frank says, listen to me. The old man listens. Frank says, from this moment forward, the prophecy is mine, the plan is mine. The boy is mine. You do not get to make plans for him. You do not get to set him up. You do not get to send him into rooms unarmed. You do not get to withhold information. Anything you have on this, anything you suspect about it, anything you know about the Dark Lord's likely return, anything you know about the piece of soul in the boy's scar, anything you know about the men the Dark Lord used to work with and where those men are now, all of it, you write it down, you put it in a box. You give the box to me. Tonight, the old man says, yes. Frank says, second, I am coming with the boy to this school. I am going to be on these grounds. I am going to be in the building. The old man says, Mr. Castle, that is most irregular. Frank says, I am not asking, I am telling. You will employ me as a member of your staff. You will give me the cover of a position that allows me to walk the grounds and live near the boy and have keys to whatever I need keys to. The old man says, I have a position. The keeper of keys and grounds. The current keeper, however, is Mr. Hagrid, who I am exceedingly fond of and who has held the post for over 40 years and who would be heartbroken to lose it. Frank says, Mr. Hagrid is on vacation. The old man says, I beg your pardon. Frank says, as of tomorrow morning. You are giving Mr. Hagrid a year's paid sabbatical with a generous travel stipend to go and study magical creatures in the locations of his choosing. He will be delighted. He has been the keeper for 40 years. He is overdue. You will tell him so. You will tell him today, the old man says very slowly and in his absence. Frank says in his absence you have a new groundskeeper, a muggle unfortunately named Frank Castle, new to the position, quiet man, carries a gun. Has the boy's complete trust. Lives in the keeper's hut at the edge of the forest, has been recommended to you by a personal acquaintance. You will write the letter of recommendation yourself. The old man in the long second that follows considers many things. The old man's eyes track Frank's face. The old man's eyes track the M1911. The old man's eyes track last the door behind Frank through which the old man could in principle summon a great deal of help. The old man does not summon help. The old man instead exhales. The old man says, Mr. Castle, may I make a counter-proposal? Frank says, you may. The old man says, I will accede to all of your terms on one condition. Frank says, name it. The old man says, the boy is not to know that the prophecy describes a death he is supposed to seek. The boy is to be told the prophecy with my full account when he is 16. Until then, what is between us, professor and headmaster, stays between us. I will not lie to the boy. I will, if asked directly, answer, but I will not approach him with it. I will not put him on the path I had once put him on. The boy is yours, Mr. Castle. The path he walks is yours to choose. I ask only that you let me, when the time comes, give him what I know in my own voice on my own terms. Frank considers this. Frank says, the boy is going to ask me. The old man says, I will leave to you, Mr. Castle, the decision of when and how to tell him. Frank says, agreed. Frank lowers the M1911. Frank steps back. Frank reholsters. The old man straightens his robe. The old man, with surprising composure, walks back around the desk and sits. The old man says, I will write the letter of recommendation tonight. Frank says, good. The old man says, I will also tonight place upon you the wards necessary to allow you to live and work on these grounds without your presence being constantly remarked upon by the castle's other defenses. Frank says, are those wards going to interfere with the operation of a firearm? The old man, looking at the M1911 at Frank's hip, says, no, Mr. Castle. The wards I will place are wards of recognition, not of restraint. The grounds will not regard you as a threat. The grounds will recognize you as a member of staff. The grounds will, in fact, help you in subtle ways if you require help. Your firearm will fire as it always has against whomever you choose to fire it. Frank says, including against members of staff. The old man says, including against members of staff. Frank says, good. The old man, after a pause, says, Mr. Castle. Frank says, yes. The old man says, there are 8 of them I am most concerned with. I have a list. Frank says, I have the same list. The old man says, of course you do. Frank says, I would like to compare lists. The old man says, Mr. Castle, I had not until this evening dared to hope that I would be allowed to help in this way. Frank says, you are not allowed to do anything but help, Professor. From this day forward, every door you have, every record you have, every favor you are owed is open to me. I am not asking, I am telling, you are an asset now. Treat the position with the dignity it deserves. The old man very slowly smiles. The smile is small. The smile is on the old man's face, a strange thing, the smile of a man who has spent a lifetime moving pieces on a board and who has just been told by a new player that the board is the new player's now. The old man says, I shall, Mr. Castle. The old man takes from a drawer a sheet of parchment. The old man, in violet ink, in a slow, careful hand, begins to write. The first 8 names appear on the parchment in the order Frank has them in his own notebook. The order is alphabetical. The wizards, like the soldiers, write lists. By the time Frank walks out of the office and back down the spiral staircase and out the gates of the castle and through the village of Hogsmeade and back to the fireplace at the 3 broomsticks, the parchment is folded inside his coat, with 8 names on it in violet ink, in the steady hand of a 110-year-old man who has, for the first time in his long life, found himself outranked, and who, to his own surprise, finds that he does not mind. Frank flews back to the leaky cauldron at 23 minutes to midnight. The kid is awake in the chair by the bar. The kid says, well, Frank says, I have a list, I have a job, I have permission to be in the building. The kid says, all of them. Frank says, all of them. The kid says, good. Frank says, bed. School in 2 weeks. Mexico tomorrow. The kid says, bed. Frank says, walk. They walk. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5, the hit list. The kid is sorted into Slytherin. This is, by the count of the people in the Great Hall on the first night of September 1991, a surprise. The sorting hat on the kid's head takes 9.5 minutes. The sorting hat in his ear in a soft conversational tone says many things. The kid beneath the hat says many things back. The sorting hat at the end of the 9.5 minutes says in a voice that carries to the rafters, Slytherin. The hall does not cheer. The Slytherin table cheers with the half-shocked enthusiasm of a table that has just been handed the most famous boy in Britain. The other 3 tables sit very still. A red-haired boy at the Gryffindor table, who had been smiling at Harry as Harry approached the stool, has gone the color of his hair. A bushy-haired girl at the Gryffindor table has her hand half raised, as if to wave, frozen. Harry walks to the Slytherin table. Harry sits. Harry is greeted on his left by a pale boy with white blonde hair who extends a hand and says, in a voice that is trying very hard to sound older than it is, Draco Malfoy. Harry says, taking the hand, Harry Potter. Draco Malfoy says, yes, we've met at Madame Malkin's. You were trying on robes. Harry says, that is right. Good to see you again, Mr. Malfoy. Draco Malfoy says, almost smiling, Draco is fine. Harry says, Draco. At the staff table on the night of the sorting, the new groundskeeper, a Mr. F. Castle, sits at the end of the table near the door, drinking tea from a chipped mug, and watches the Slytherin table with the calm, absorbed attention of a man watching a kid he has raised perform a difficult assignment that the man knew in advance would be difficult. The new groundskeeper, beside the empty chair where the old groundskeeper used to sit, is dressed in plain dark work clothes. His sleeves are rolled to the elbow. His forearms have on them the lines of muscle that the staff have not yet seen on each other's forearms, because the staff do not, as a rule, spend their days splitting wood and digging post holes. The deputy headmistress beside him has a hand pressed to her brow. The deputy headmistress says very quietly, Mr. Castle. Frank says, yes, ma'am. The deputy headmistress says he was sorted into Slytherin. Frank says, I see that. The deputy headmistress says, the house of awe, the house of regrettably, the families I am told you and the headmaster are monitoring. Frank says, yes, ma'am. The deputy headmistress says, that is, on reflection, perhaps not regrettable at all. Frank says, no, ma'am, I would call it operationally ideal. The deputy headmistress says, he chose it. Frank says, yes, ma'am. The deputy headmistress, after a long pause, says, I taught his mother. Lily was as Gryffindor as the day is long. James was a Gryffindor's Gryffindor. The boy, by the look of him, has been told by the hat what he is and has agreed with the hat. I will say to you, Mr. Castle, that I have known the sorting hat for 50 years, and the sorting hat does not place a child where the child does not in the deepest part of the child belong. The hat reads the child. The child confirms or denies. The boy confirmed. Frank says, yes, ma'am. The deputy headmistress, eyes still on the Slytherin table where the kid is now being introduced to the older boys, says, he is going to be eaten alive in that house, or he is going to learn to eat. Frank says, he is going to learn to eat. The deputy headmistress turns her head very slowly and looks at Frank. The deputy headmistress says, Mr. Castle. Frank says, yes, ma'am. The deputy headmistress says, I do not approve of any of what is going to happen this year. Frank says, I respect that. The deputy headmistress says, I am also not going to stop it. Frank says, thank you, ma'am. The deputy headmistress turns back to the head table, picks up her fork, and addresses her plate of roast chicken with the small, dignified attention of a woman who has decided, just now, on the basis of an internal calculation about responsibility and outcome, to look the other way for the next 7 years. Frank beside her drinks his tea. Year 1, Harry Potter, age 11, learns magic. Harry Potter learns it the way Frank taught him to learn things, which is by reading the books cover to cover the first week, by attempting every spell on the list twice as often as the homework requires, and by treating every professor as a source of information whose biases must be cataloged in parallel with the information itself. By Halloween, Harry is the top student in charms, the top student in transfiguration, the second student in defense against the dark arts, the first being a Ravenclaw girl named Padma Patil who Harry deliberately does not surpass, the second student in potions, the top student in history of magic, the top student in astronomy, and a competent if unenthusiastic student in herbology and flying. The flying instructor, Madame Hooch, watches Harry at the wheel of a broom the first time and says, after some consideration, Mr. Potter, you fly like a man who is going somewhere on purpose. Harry, who has been taught by Frank to never appear to be going somewhere on purpose, mentally corrects the impression and downgrades his flying performance on subsequent lessons to an above-average competence. Harry, in his free hours, walks the castle. He walks it the way he walked Sarajevo at 7 and Mexico City at 10. He walks it on a schedule of his own devising. He walks it at all hours, including the small hours, including the hours in which students are technically not permitted to walk it. He uses, beginning in the second week of term, an invisibility cloak that arrives on Christmas morning addressed to him, in a hand he does not recognize, with a note that says, "This was your father's, use it well." Harry shows the cloak to Frank in the keeper's hut. Frank examines it. Frank says, "Tactical asset, kid, first rate, use it on patrols, do not use it for pranks." Harry says, "I would not use it for pranks." Frank says, "Good." By the end of the first term, Harry has mapped every staff quarter and the typical schedule of the wizard or witch occupying it. Every secret passage of the castle, including four that, to his knowledge, no current staff member is aware of, which he discovers by following a pair of identical red-haired older boys named Weasley who have, in their possession, a magical map that Harry, with the cloak's help, observes them using and that he in time photographs by tracing onto an enchanted parchment of his own. Every ghost's patrol route, and the times at which each ghost is reliably at which location. Every entrance and exit to the castle, of which there are 17, including 6 that are not on any of the official castle plans the Filch the caretaker keeps on file in his office. The schedule of the head house elf, a small creature named Sandy with a kind face and a fondness for buttered toast. The schedule of the caretaker, Argus Filch, and the route of Filch's cat, Mrs. Norris. The schedule of every professor, including in particular Professor Snape, head of Slytherin, potions master, ex-Death Eater, currently spying for Dumbledore against the Death Eater faction status. Under observation, threat level reduced after second meeting, Professor Quirrell, defense against the dark arts instructor, status. Suspicious, threat level uncertain, possibly possessed by something, requires investigation, and the headmaster status. Cooperative, threat level low, contact frequency 1 short meeting per fortnight. Harry shows Frank at the end of term a map of the school that Frank, after 20 minutes of examination, sets down on the table of the keeper's hut and says in his careful voice, "Kid, that is the best piece of intelligence work I have seen anyone do in any country I have ever worked." The kid says, "Thank you, Dad." Frank says, "How long did this take you?" The kid says, 3 months. Frank says, 3 months. The kid says, "I am going to redo it next term." There are still some corridors I have not measured. I want to add the dungeons. The dungeons take longer because some of them move. Frank says, "The dungeons move." The kid says, "Yes, slowly, maybe 2 corridors per week, shift a few feet." The castle is not entirely stable. I am keeping track of the average drift. Frank says after a long moment, "Kid, you are 11. The kid says, "I am almost 12. Frank says, "Almost 12. The kid says, "Yes." Frank says, "I love you." The kid says, a little startled because Frank has not said it that way before in those exact words, "I love you too." Frank says, "Eat your sandwich." There is a sandwich in the basket. Eat it. The kid eats the sandwich. Quirrell is the first thing to happen on the operations side of the ledger, and Quirrell does not technically belong on the list of 8. Quirrell is, on the night of Halloween 1991, in the 3rd floor corridor on the right-hand side, attempting to acquire the Philosopher's Stone, on the instructions of the parasitic shade of Lord Voldemort, which has been living on the back of Quirrell's head for the better part of a year. Harry, who has been mapping the third-floor corridor for 2 months, and who, with Frank in his ear via a small mirror in his pocket and an enchantment Frank has had Goran's prison correspondence supplier procure on the grey market, knows that the corridor is the location of the stone, observes Quirrell entering the corridor at 12:02 a.m. on Halloween. Harry follows. Harry, under the cloak, watches Quirrell argue with himself, which is to say with the back of his own head. Harry watches Quirrell remove his turban and reveal a face on the back of his skull that Harry has known he was going to see for 2 months, ever since the first time he was alone with Quirrell in an empty classroom and felt the piece of soul in his own forehead respond to the proximity of a larger piece of the same soul with a small pressure between his eyes. Harry, with the cloak around him, takes from his pocket the 22 with the homemade suppressor and the silver-tipped rounds that Frank has, with great care, smuggled into his trunk in pieces over the course of August. Harry puts the suppressor against the small of Quirrell's back at the level of the renal artery. Harry says very softly, "Move and I open you up." The two faces of Quirrell freeze. The shade on the back of the skull, which has been arguing with Quirrell about technique, falls silent. The face on the front of the skull, which has been holding the mirror of Arist in shaking hands, stops shaking. Harry says, "Lord Voldemort, I would like a word." The shade says, voice like ash through a sieve, "Harry Potter." Harry says, "I am going to make you an offer." The shade says, "A child does not make me offers." Harry says, "2 offers. First, you leave Professor Quirrell now, you leave him alive. You float out of his skull and you leave the castle, and you do not come back to this castle, and you do not approach me until you have a body of your own. You wait, I wait, we do business with bodies. This is the gentleman's version of how this conversation can end." The shade says, "And the second." Harry says, "Second, you refuse the first. I put a round through Quirrell at this range and you lose your host and you are once again a wisp on the wind. Either way you leave Professor Quirrell. Either way Quirrell does not die by you tonight. The choice you have is whether you leave him alive or whether you leave him as a corpse with a hole in him." The shade is silent for a long second. The shade says, "Why do you care for Quirrell?" Harry says, "I do not. He has earned a bullet. I am not going to be the man who fires it tonight. He is a host. He is not the principal. I am here for the principal. The principal is you. You and I have unfinished business. Quirrell is in the way. I prefer to remove obstacles efficiently." The shade says, "You are cold, child." Harry says, "I was raised cold." The shade says, "I know who raised you." Harry says, "I know that you know. Take the offer." The shade considers. The shade says, "Finally, I will leave him. I will leave the castle. I will return to you, child, when I have a body. We will conclude the matter then." Harry says, "Acceptable." The shade detaches. The shade rises off Quirrell's skull in a slow exhalation of dark vapor that smells faintly of burnt hair and old graveyards. The shade pours toward the window, through the window into the night. The shade is gone. Quirrell, on his knees with the mirror of Arist reflecting nothing back at him, sobs once. Quirrell says, "I'll go to Azkaban for this." Harry says, "No, Professor, you will go on a long sabbatical to a Bavarian sanatorium. You will, by the end of the year, recover your faculties and your sense of self, and you will return to teaching, never of defense against the dark arts, but possibly of Muggle studies, where your sins shall be small and your contributions shall be useful. You will not remember this conversation. The headmaster has, I believe, a charm." Quirrell says, "How do you know what the headmaster has?" Harry says, "The headmaster, Professor, is in the next room." The headmaster in the next room steps out from behind a curtain. The headmaster has on his face the look of a man who has watched something that he had thought would have to be done by him or by no one, get done instead by a child with a small ugly gun and a great deal of self-possession. The headmaster says to Quirrell with the wand raised in a careful gesture, "Obliviate." Quirrell, eyes glazing, falls forward into the headmaster's arms. The headmaster, lowering Quirrell to the floor, looks at Harry. The headmaster says, "Mr. Potter. That was, by every standard I have, the cleanest piece of operational work I have witnessed in my long life." Harry says, "My father will be pleased." The headmaster says, "Your father is in the courtyard with the rifle with the line of sight on the window through which the shade of Lord Voldemort has just departed, and your father, by his own report into the mirror in your pocket, has just confirmed that the shade did not double back. Your father wishes me to tell you, and I quote precisely, 'Good work, kid, see you for sandwiches.'" Harry says, "Then we are done." The headmaster says, "We are done." Harry walks out of the third-floor corridor. The kid is now, by his and Frank's reckoning, on the long countdown. The Lord has been told that the boy will be waiting when the Lord has a body. The Lord, in any sane scheme, will move to acquire a body. The Lord's acquisition will take time, probably years, and will require resources. The resources are the 8 men on the list. The 8 men on the list are now, by every operational metric, on a clock. Frank in the courtyard with the rifle hears the kid's footsteps on the gravel an hour later. Frank lowers the rifle. Frank, in the dark with the kid coming up the path under the cloak, says, "Walk." They walk. The dossier on the 8 by the end of year 1 is 43 pages. Frank keeps the dossier in a safe in the keeper's hut. The safe is a diebold pulled out of a closed bank in Tijuana in 1989 and shipped in pieces over 4 years to 4 addresses on 3 continents and reassembled by Frank in the keeper's hut on the night of his first week as groundskeeper. The safe has a combination. The combination is in Frank's head. The combination is also written in code on the back of a photograph in the kid's wallet in case Frank dies and the kid needs to recover the safe. Inside the safe, in clearly marked folders, the 8 files. Folder 1, LUCIUSABRAXASMALFOY, Function, Financial, Lucius Malfoy is the moneyman. Lucius Malfoy was, during the war, the wallet of the Death Eater operation. Lucius Malfoy laundered the Death Eater's funds through a complex of family businesses, charitable foundations, and ministry contracts. Lucius Malfoy escaped post-war prosecution by paying a substantial sum to the ministry under the cover story of victim restitution. Lucius Malfoy currently sits on the Hogwarts Board of Governors, holds a chair on the Wisengamot, controls voting blocks in 3 departments of the ministry, and continues to fund with deniability several Death Eater families currently keeping low profiles. Address, Malfoy Manor, Wiltshire. Wards, significant but documented in detail by the goblin who built them in 1973, who happens to be one of the bank's most loyal employees, and who, when asked by Harry Potter through proper channels in February, supplies the original schematics. Family, wife Narcissa, knee black, status non-Death Eater but cooperative. Son Draco, Harry's Slytherin housemate, status marked, kept off the list, will be approached as an intelligence asset over time. Daily pattern: tea at home until 10, flew to ministry, ministry until 5, apparate to club, club until 7, flew home, dinner, bed, weak point, pride. Estimated time to remove from board, 6 to 8 months from authorization. Method still being determined. Folder 2, ROIDONAVERY, Function, Operations. Avery ran the day-to-day. Where Lucius moved the money, Avery moved the men, Avery picked the targets, Avery picked the dates, Avery told the muscle when and where to be and what to do when they got there. Avery escaped post-war prosecution by claiming imperious and passing a magical test of veracity that, by the report of the testing orer who Harry, through Madame Bones via back channel involving an owl with an unsigned note in Frank's handwriting, has interviewed, was, in retrospect, almost certainly subverted. Address, a cottage in Hampshire kept by a witch named Mrs. Fawcett, who is, on closer inspection, his sister and a low-level ministry employee. Family, divorced. No children. Daily pattern: 10 in the morning, out for a walk along the river. Pub at noon. Home by 2. In the cellar from 2 to 5, doing what Harry, on inspection of the cellar via small enchanted beetle, will report is dark ritual practice of low to moderate seriousness, nothing comparable to the principal but unwholesome. Evening visits, often to associates. Weak point, routine. Avery has not deviated from his schedule in 2 years. Estimated time to remove, 3 months from authorization. Folder 3. CANTNKERUSNOTT. Function, recruitment. Not senior runs the pipeline, not senior brings the new boys in. Not senior is the man who, when a young pureblood is finishing up his time at Hogwarts and looking for direction, takes the young pureblood to dinner at a small restaurant in Diagon Alley and explains, over wine, the principles of blood purity and the future of magical Britain. Not senior is good at his job. Not senior has, in the years since the war, recruited approximately 18 young men into a loose post-war Death Eater apprenticeship, all of whom Frank now has in a subfolder. Address, Not Hall, Sussex. Family, son Theodore in Harry's Slytherin year, quiet boy with sad eyes, status, not a target, possible long-term asset. Daily pattern: home in the mornings, Diagon Alley in the afternoons, restaurant Tuesday and Friday evenings, same restaurant, same table, same wine. Weak point, visibility, not does his recruiting in a public restaurant. Estimated time to remove, 2 months from authorization. Folder 4, VINCNTCRABB, the elder, function, muscle. Crabbe Sr. breaks bones. Crabbe Sr. is a large man, slow-thinking, fast-handed, and entirely loyal to the cause for reasons that Frank, after reading Crabbe Sr.'s school records, has identified as a sustained childhood resentment of his father, his mother, and the world at large, redirected under the influence of Avery and not into a productive professional anger. Address, Crabbe House, Devon, modest. Crabbe Sr. is not rich. Family, wife, son Vincent the younger in Harry's year, slow-thinking like his father, status, not a target. Daily pattern: he hits people. He hits people Avery tells him to hit. The hits average 2 a week and are documented in the files of St. Mungo's Hospital under various assault entries. Weak point: predictability and a serious drinking problem. Estimated time to remove, 4 to 6 weeks. Method simple. Folder 5, Gregory Goyle the elder, function, muscle, effectively identical to Crabbe. Estimated time to remove, similar. Folder 6, RABASTANMULCIBER, function, torturer. Mulciber is the specialist. Mulciber is the man Avery sends when a target has information that needs to be extracted. Mulciber is, by the report of 3 former Aurors who survived encounters with him during the war, the worst of the 8, the only one of the 8 whose name they cannot speak without lowering their voices, the only one whose post-war freedom is in the Ministry's whisper, the great open scandal of the imperious defense. Mulciber lives in a flat in Nocturne Alley. Mulciber has on his door 3 different sets of wards, of which one is, in Frank's read of the schematics provided by the goblins, a soul trap that would kill the first muggle to cross the threshold. Address: 47 Nocturne Alley, 2nd floor, family, none. Mulciber's wife and son died in a fire of suspicious origin in 1980, and Mulciber, on cross-examination, was unable to account for his whereabouts on the night of the fire. Daily pattern: erratic. Weak point: Mulciber drinks heavily and uses a particular brand of foreign brandy that is sold by only one importer in Diagon Alley. Estimated time to remove: 6 weeks. Special note from Frank scrawled on the bottom of the page: Mulciber is the one that worries me. Mulciber is going to require a clean room and unusual tools. Mulciber goes early. Folder 7, CORBANYAXLEY, Function, Ministry. Yaxley is the man at the Ministry. Yaxley, currently a senior undersecretary in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, has, since the war, quietly placed his hand on the levers of the wizarding police force. Yaxley reviews the assignments of Aurors. Yaxley reviews the prosecutions. Yaxley, in 5 documented instances, has spiked investigations into Death Eater families before the investigations reach charging. Yaxley is, by the assessment of Madame Bones, the head of his department, who Harry has by year's end met 4 times under the cover of student interest in ministry careers, a man Madame Bones cannot fire without political consequences she cannot yet absorb. Address: a townhouse in Wizarding London. Family, wife, no children, daily pattern, ministry from 8 to 6. Weak point: ambition. Yaxley wants to be head of the department, wants to be minister someday, and is therefore careful, which is a kind of weakness when one knows the shape of the carefulness. Estimated time to remove: this one is going to require ministry side intelligence. Estimated planning window: 4 months. Folder 8, WALDENMACNAIR, Function, Executioner. McNair is, in his daily employment, the official executioner of magical creatures for the Ministry's Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. McNair, in his side work, was the Dark Lord's executioner during the war. McNair killed 3 of the 4 Aurors who fell in the raid on the Bones family in 1979. McNair has not, since the war, killed anyone the Ministry has been able to prove. McNair has, since the war, killed approximately 9 people that Frank, with the help of the Bones contact and the goblins and the file of the Daily Prophet for the last 10 years, has been able to attribute to him on reasonable grounds. Address: McNair Cottage, Northumberland, remote, no close neighbors. Family, none. Daily pattern: in the mornings ministry, in the afternoons the moors, in the evenings alone. Weak point: arrogance, isolation, and the fact that McNair, who has used the same axe for 15 years for the executions, sharpens the axe every Friday evening at his cottage alone by candlelight and is at that hour and place the least defended he ever is. Estimated time to remove: 3 weeks from authorization. The dossiers are not on their own an authorization to act. The authorization to act in the castle household requires that 2 conditions be met. The first is that the dossier on a target be complete to the point of certainty. Not only that the target is one of the 8, but that the target's specific acts in the past, the specific people the target has killed, the specific harms the target has done, are documented in such detail that a hostile prosecutor could not, on review, raise a reasonable doubt that the man on the table is the man who has earned the bullet. The second condition is that Frank and the kid, in conference, both agree that the file is ready. By the end of year 1, none of the files is ready in the second sense. By the end of year 1, the kid has in his hand the cases for all 8, but the cases are not yet pressure tested. The cases require triangulation. The cases require, in some instances, the cooperation of sources that have not yet been turned. The cases require, in 2 instances, Yaxley and Lucius Malfoy, an in-ministry asset that the kid does not yet have. The kid spends the summer between year 1 and year 2 not in Mexico City but at a small house Frank has rented in a village in the south of Spain, in which the kid spends his mornings on a beach with a notebook and his afternoons on a hillside with a paper target and his evenings at the kitchen table with Frank and the files, sharpening the cases one by one, refining the language, identifying the gaps. The kid does not see the inside of a wizarding library all summer. The kid does, on Frank's advice, read 4 texts on military history, 2 on industrial labor organization, and 1 on the Cuban Revolution. The kid says at one point in late August, looking up from the Cuban book, "This is interesting." Frank says, "Yeah, kid, cell structure, compartmentalization, we are going to use that in year 2. The kid says, "For what?" Frank says, "For building you a network inside that school." The kid says, "A network? Frank says you can't run an operation alone, not for the long haul, not when there are 8 targets and a lord on the other side. You need people, you need eyes, you need hands. You need other people's specialties. We are going to start putting that together this year. The kid says, who? Frank says, that is for you to decide. You are the operative, you pick the network. I am going to tell you the shape it needs and you are going to fill the shape. The kid says, what shape? Frank says, one inside Slytherin, one inside Gryffindor, one inside the older years, one inside the staff if we can, one at the ministry, one at the goblins, one at the prophet, one with the house elves, one unknown asset, a sleeper for emergencies. The kid says 9 people, Frank says 9 people, some of them you cultivate slowly, some of them you turn fast. Some of them never know they are assets. The goblin already volunteered. The headmaster is a fully aware asset. We start year 2 with 2 and we add 1 a year. The kid says, I have ideas on 3. Frank says, tell me. The kid says, inside Gryffindor there is a girl, Hermione Granger. She is Muggle-born. She is the best student in the year apart from me. She is lonely and she wants a friend and she does not get along with most of the other Gryffindors yet. She is also smart enough to be useful in research and ethical enough that she will refuse to do anything that crosses certain lines. I would not turn her into a knowing asset, I would turn her into an unknowing one. I would befriend her, study with her, and use her library work to multiply mine. Frank says, good. The kid says, inside the staff, Professor McGonagall, not as an asset. As you know, backup, she knew my mother. She is watching me already. She is watching me in the way an aunt watches a kid she is worried about. She does not approve of what I do. She is also not going to stop it. She has said as much. If we have a problem, McGonagall is who we go to. Frank says, I confirmed that on day 1. She told me to my face. The kid says, I know, I overheard. Frank says, you overheard a private staff conversation on day 1. The kid says, yes. Frank says, good. The kid says, inside the older years, there is a 5th year named Diggory. Hufflepuff, decent kid, captain of the Quidditch team, universally liked, not an asset, possibly a source of information about the staff and the other older students, easy to befriend. Frank says, good. That is 3, work on those 3 this year. Slowly, carefully, the kid says, and the goblins. Frank says, I will work the goblins. The kid says, and Madame Bones. Frank says, we are not ready for Madame Bones yet. The goblin in year 1, McGonagall is Overwatch. The students you have named in year 2, Diggory for older intel, Bones in year 3 when we have a hit she can quietly admire. Bones we earn, Bones is not approached, Bones we let come to us. The kid says she will come to us when we start hitting names on the list. Frank says she will. The kid says she is going to figure out it is us eventually. Frank says she is going to figure out it is somebody acting on the list she has been wanting to act on for 10 years and could not. Whether she figures out specifically that it is us depends on us. We are going to make sure she does not for as long as we can. If she does, we are going to make sure she finds it convenient to look the other way. The kid says, how? Frank says, we are going to be very, very clean. We are going to be cleaner than any operation in any country I have ever seen. We are going to be so clean that the only person who could possibly conclude that it is us is somebody who, by the time she concludes it, has also concluded that she does not want anyone else to know. The kid says that is a high standard. Frank says, it is the standard we are going to meet. The kid says, yes. Year 2 begins. The kid, returning to school, walks into the Great Hall on the night of the welcoming feast with a leather messenger bag in one hand and Hedwig the snowy owl perched on his shoulder and a face that is, by the read of every teacher at the staff table, the face of a 12-year-old who has had a quiet good summer. The kid sits at the Slytherin table. The kid greets Draco Malfoy with appropriate warmth. The kid greets the new prefects with appropriate respect. The kid, when the sorting is done and the food appears, eats with the careful pace of a kid who has been taught manners and respects them. The kid is, in every visible respect, an ordinary student. In Frank's keeper's hut at the edge of the forest, on the night of the welcoming feast, Frank sits at the kitchen table with the dossier of Walden McNair open and a calendar pinned to the wall and a pen in his hand. Frank, with the pen, makes a small mark on a Friday in October. The mark is a circle. Inside the circle, in small block letters, Frank writes, MACNAIR. Frank looks at the calendar. Frank says to the empty kitchen very quietly, soon, sir. Then Frank closes the file, walks to the window and looks out across the dark grounds at the lit windows of the castle, and at one window in particular on the 7th floor of the Slytherin Tower behind which his son is, with the same careful focus, opening a small notebook and beginning to write the year's first plan. Year 2 is, for purposes of the operation, a building year. Year 2 is when Harry, on his and Frank's plan, befriends Hermione Granger. The befriending is patient and deliberate and is built around a study schedule in the library that Hermione has been keeping alone since the 2nd week of her first year, and that Harry, sliding into a chair across from her one rainy afternoon in late September, joins without asking, and then, by his quiet competence at the same difficult transfiguration problem she has been struggling with, justifies remaining at. By Christmas, they are working on every assignment together. By Easter, they are co-authoring extra credit essays. By the end of the year, they are, by every appearance, the most academically formidable pair of second years the staff have seen in 20 years. Hermione does not ask, ever, why a Slytherin would deign to befriend a Muggle-born Gryffindor. Hermione is too pleased to have a friend at all to ask. Hermione's parents, who get a hand-delivered letter from Harry once a month, written in Harry's neatest hand, describing his pleasure at having such a brilliant study partner, beam at the praise and never see the careful structure of the letters in which Harry, while ostensibly thanking them for raising such a fine daughter, is also patiently mapping the Muggle dental practice they own in Hampstead in case the practice ever becomes useful. Year 2 is when Harry, on his and Frank's plan, befriends Cedric Diggory. The befriending is easier. Cedric is, as Harry suspected, an open kid, and Cedric, who has been told by his father, a ministry man, low-level, harmless, to keep an eye on the famous Potter boy, is happy to find that the famous Potter boy is, in person, a polite young man who asks intelligent questions about Quidditch and remembers everyone's name. By spring, Harry is, with some regularity, eating lunch on the lawn with Cedric and Cedric's Hufflepuff friends and learning, by the careful application of casual questions, the daily movements of a dozen older students, the patrol patterns of 3 more professors, and the location of 2 more secret passages that Cedric, with the smiling indiscretion of a confident kid showing off, has revealed. Year 2 is when Harry, on his and Frank's plan, undertakes the slow, careful project of becoming, in the eyes of Severus Snape, a Slytherin worth investing in. Snape, who has spent the first year scowling at Harry across the potions classroom in a complicated grief over Lily, is, by the middle of year 2, scowling at Harry with a different kind of scowl, the scowl of a teacher who has noticed that the student in question is, in fact, gifted at potions, and who is therefore engaged in the painful internal renegotiation of decades of prejudice. By the end of year 2, Snape is, against his will, occasionally pleased. Year 2 is when Harry, in the company of Hermione, in the library in the 3rd week of November, discovers, in a footnote of a book on Wisengamot procedure, a passing reference to a series of post-war suicides among low-level ministry employees that, on subsequent investigation, turn out to be, in 3 of the 7 cases, suicides arranged by Avery to remove witnesses to ongoing operations. Harry that night walks to the keeper's hut, hands Frank 3 pages of notes and says, "We have Avery on 3 murders. The cases are airtight." Frank, reading the pages, says, "Add it to the file." Harry adds it to the file. The Avery file is, by Christmas, ready. Year 2 is when Harry, with the help of the goblin who introduced himself at Gringotts, who is named Griffook and who, it turns out, has a specific grievance against Lucius Malfoy stemming from a 1979 dispute over a vault inheritance, acquires the names and current addresses of all 18 of Not Senior's recruited apprentices. Harry adds the 18 names to the Master Operations file. Frank, reading the addition, writes a small note in the margin, Phase 2. After the 8, we work the apprentices, or we let the apprentices learn the lesson from the 8 and walk away. Either way. Year 2 is when Frank, in the keeper's hut, makes friends with the head house elf, Sandy, by the simple expedient of leaving a saucer of milk and a small plate of buttered toast on the kitchen step every evening for a month. Sandy, by the end of the month, has begun appearing in the keeper's hut after dark to drink the milk and to chat with Frank in her soft, creaking voice. Frank does not, in the conversations, ask Sandy for anything. Frank just listens. Sandy, in the course of 3 months of conversations, mentions casually that the house elves have a network of their own under the castle, that the house elves see and hear everything that the house elves do not as a class, like Lucius Malfoy, who has been known to mistreat the family elf at Malfoy Manor, and that the house elves would be, on the whole, pleased if certain people in certain places came to certain bad ends. Frank very gently asks if there are particular bad ends Sandy would like to recommend. Sandy very gently recommends several. Frank very gently takes notes. By the end of year 2, the operation has, in addition to the headmaster as a witting asset, 3 unwitting assets among the students, 1 careful overwatch in McGonagall, a hostile goblin contact at Gringotts, a friendly house elf network under the castle, and a slowly turning Severus Snape on the staff. By the end of year 2, the dossier on Walden McNair has on it a small handwritten note in Frank's hand that reads, simply, G.O. The last week of year 2, on a Friday in the woods near McNair's cottage in Northumberland, Frank Castle, in the dark, in a position he has built over 4 nights of advance reconnaissance, sets up. He sets up at 180 meters. He sets up with the rifle he has owned for 18 years, a Remington 308 with iron sights because the optic he prefers is in a hard case in Mexico City and he has not yet built a second one for England. He sets up prone. He sets up under a canvas the color of the moss, and the canvas is the color of the moss because he has scraped moss onto the canvas with a knife over 3 hours the night before. He waits. At 9:14, on schedule, candlelight blooms in the kitchen window of McNair's cottage. At 9:17, McNair sits down at his kitchen table with a whetstone and the executioner's axe and a small bowl of oil. At 9:20, McNair begins with the slow, contented motion of a man relaxing into a familiar task to sharpen the axe. Frank at 180 meters breathes out, "The kid is not here. The kid is at the school eating an end-of-year feast, sitting at the Slytherin table, laughing politely at something Draco Malfoy has said with Frank's small enchanted mirror in his pocket. The kid will know in 5 minutes in the mirror that the work has been done. The kid will be told only the result. The kid will not be told the angle, the distance, the moment, the breath, the squeeze." Frank, on the principle that the kid is not yet old enough to plan a hit, and that Frank wants to give the kid as many more years as possible of not being old enough, takes the first hit alone. Frank squeezes. The rifle with the iron sights with the 308-round Frank loaded at his bench in Mexico City 8 months ago, sends a single round through the window glass of the kitchen, through McNair's right ear, out the left side of McNair's head, into the back wall of the cottage where it lodges in a beam of 300-year-old oak that the next forensic examination will determine was struck by a projectile of Muggle manufacture fired from outside the building. McNair, holding the axe, holding the whetstone, drops. McNair is, by the time his face hits the table, no longer present in any operational sense. Frank on the canvas in the moss packs his weapon in 9 seconds. Frank in the woods walks out to his car, which is parked 2.5 kilometers down a logging road, in 18 minutes. Frank in the car drives the country lanes of Northumberland for an hour without his lights on, and then, with his lights on, drives normally to a small inn in a village 70 kilometers south, where Frank, in a room booked under a different name, sleeps for 4 hours. In the morning, Frank apparats back to Hogwarts with the assistance of a small portkey the headmaster has on the operations understanding provided. In the morning, at the Slytherin table at breakfast, the kid receives the Daily Prophet with the rest of the school. The kid reads the headline. The kid sets the paper down. The kid eats the sausage on his plate with the careful pace of a kid who has been taught manners and respects them. The kid in his pocket, with the hand that is not on the fork, holds the mirror. Frank in the keeper's hut drinks his coffee. Phase 1 has begun. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6, the hit sequence, Year 3, September. Walden McNair is 6 weeks dead. The Aura Department, by Madame Bones, has assigned 3 investigators to the case. The investigators have determined that the round recovered from the oak beam was, as the first report concluded, of Muggle manufacture. The investigators have determined that the angle of fire is consistent with a position in the woods 180 meters to the west of the cottage. The investigators have determined that there are no magical signatures in the area apart from the routine residual traces of the apparition wards on the cottage perimeter. The investigators have determined that the killer was, in their working hypothesis, a Muggle. The investigators have determined that this is impossible, because no Muggle has ever in the recorded history of magical Britain successfully assassinated a wizard. The investigators, after 3 weeks of frustrated review, file the case under unsolved, anomalous pending. The Daily Prophet runs the case on page 11 for 3 days and then drops it. Madame Bones, alone in her office on the evening of the day the case is filed away, opens a desk drawer. From the drawer, she takes a small black notebook. The notebook is private. The notebook has on its first page 8 names. The notebook has on the page after that dates and methods of all of the post-war wartime suicides she was unable to prove were arranged murders by Avery, and the post-war disappearances she was unable to prove were arranged by Mulciber, and the financial irregularities she was unable to prove were laundered by Lucius Malfoy. She draws with a careful violet line a horizontal stroke through the name WALDENMACNAIR. She returns the notebook to the drawer. She closes the drawer. She does not then or later write a report on her own conclusion. She goes home. September last week, CANTNKERUSNOTT. Frank takes Knot in Diagon Alley at the public restaurant at the same table during the same Tuesday dinner. The method is not a rifle. The method is, on Frank's careful study, a small thin needle of cold iron 3 inches long fired from a custom spring-launched device the size of a fountain pen at a range of 12 feet. In the moment Knot reaches across the table for the salt by Frank, who is seated at the next table over in the long gray wool overcoat of an aging European businessman and the close-trimmed beard he has worn for the last 4 weeks of preparation, with his back partially turned behind a newspaper. With no obvious sightline to the target, the needle enters Knot's neck under the jaw, severs the carotid, and disappears into the muscle. The needle is in Frank's design of cold iron at the front half and of dissolving sugar glass at the back half, so that the back half breaks off in the wound and the front half is, by the time the forensic examination has begun in earnest, lodged invisibly in the deep tissue and is, on the read of the examining healer, a mysterious magical strike of unknown signature. Knot reaches for the salt. Knot pauses. Knot raises his hand to his neck. Knot looks with a small confused frown at his hand, which has come away red. Not says to his dinner companion, a young pureblood named Rosier whom he is in the process of recruiting. I think I have just been. Not does not finish the sentence. Not falls forward into the soup. Frank behind the newspaper finishes his espresso, leaves a 5-galleon tip on the table, stands, walks unhurriedly out of the restaurant, down Diagon Alley into Nocturne Alley, into a side passage, through a door, and disappears into the Muggle London street behind it. Frank is at the keeper's hut by 9. The kid, who has stayed at the school for the evening, walks into the keeper's hut at 9:30. The kid sets the paper down. The kid has, on the paper, the evening edition. The headline says NOTT found dead in Diagon Alley restaurant, AURORS baffled. The kid says too, Frank says too, the kid says Madame Bones drew a line through McNair's name in a small notebook she keeps. Sandy told me the house elves at Bones's house saw her do it. Frank says good, the kid says she will draw a line through not tomorrow. Frank says she will, the kid says she has not assigned an investigator she trusts to either case. Frank says that is because she has correctly inferred that any investigator who solves either case must be neutralized, either by her or by us. She does not want to be in that position. She has therefore assigned the cases to investigators she knows to be moderately competent and who will, after some honest work, give up. The kid says she is helping. Frank says she is helping by failing helpfully. The kid says that is a kind of help we should respect. Frank says we respect it by not making her job harder, we respect it by being clean, we respect it by giving her one less file to choose to lose every time we work. The kid says 2 down, Frank says 6 to go. The kid eats half a sandwich. The kid says, I think Crabbe and Goyle on the same night. Frank says, I have been thinking the same. The kid says there is a pub in Hogsmeade. Both of them drink there on Thursday nights. They are old friends, they drink together, they drink heavily. They walk home along the country lane separately, both of them drunk, both of them on their own predictable route. We can take both on the same Thursday with 2 angles and a 30-second window. Frank says that is what I was working on. The kid lays out the plan. The kid has in his notebook a map of the lane, a sketch of the pub, a list of the regulars, a time stamp for the last call, an analysis of the drift in Crabbe's gate by the 3rd beer and the drift in Goyle's gate by the 4th. The kid has in red ink drawn 2 crosses on the lane at the 2 distinct positions where the 2 men walking separately will be at the moment 30 seconds apart on the Thursday in question. Frank reads the plan. Frank says, this is good work. The kid says, thank you, Dad. Frank says, are you taking one of them yourself? The kid is quiet for a long second. The kid says, I would like to. Frank says, which? The kid says, Goyle. Frank says, why Goyle? The kid says, because his son is the closest to my friend and his son is going to grieve and I want to be present for the killing of the father of a boy whose grief I am going to have to look at in person in the common room every morning for the rest of the term. If I take Goyle, I will carry the weight of Goyle's death. If you take Goyle, the weight will be on you alone and I will have absorbed only the benefit. I do not want only the benefit, I want the work. Frank looks at the kid for a long time. Frank says, that is the cleanest reason I have ever heard offered for a kill. The kid says, it is also true. Frank says, it is. Frank says, you take Goyle, I take Crabbe, Thursday week. The kid says, Thursday week. October 7th, Thursday, the Hogshead Hogsmeade, the 2 of them, Crabbe Sr. and Goyle Sr. drink. The 2 of them, slow-thinking, fast-handed, friends since their own days at Hogwarts 40 years ago, drink the slow-rolling pints of 2 large men whose evenings have not changed in decades. The 2 of them leave the pub at 10 of midnight by Frank's stopwatch, 12 minutes after the publican calls last orders. Crabbe leaves first. Crabbe walks west on the country lane that becomes a footpath that becomes the gravel drive of his rental cottage, where Crabbe is renting for the autumn while a project goes on at his Devon estate. Goyle, who lodges at his cousin's farm on the far side of the village, leaves 3 minutes later heading east. Crabbe is on the country lane. Frank at 60 meters off the lane, in a fold of the field behind a stone wall, prone with the rifle, with the iron sights, with a single round of 9mm parabellum loaded into a small custom bolt-action repurposed for subsonic ammunition with an integral suppressor that Frank, with the help of Goran's prison correspondence supplier, has been quietly assembling for 2 years for exactly this kind of close work in quiet country, takes the breath, takes the squeeze, takes the round. The round, at 60 meters with the subsonic load, makes the sound of a cough at distance and arrives in the back of Crabbe's head with the small dignity of an arrived telegram. Crabbe goes down, Crabbe stays down. Frank watches Crabbe for 30 seconds. Crabbe does not move. Frank in his mind says the small word he says after every confirmed hit, which is not a word for anyone to hear, which is the single syllable of Lisa's name. Frank moves. Frank packs. Frank slips along the line of the wall toward the meeting point. At the meeting point, half a mile across 2 pastures, the kid is waiting. The kid is in the shadow of a hedgerow with the suppressed 22 and the silver-tipped rounds and a face that is the face the kid wears when the kid is working. The kid's face has on it the small composure that Frank has spent 12 years building. Goyle is on the lane. Goyle is 40 meters from the kid's position. Goyle is walking slowly and unsteadily because Goyle has had 9 pints. Goyle is humming badly a wizarding song. Goyle is wearing a heavy coat against the early autumn chill. The kid takes a small, slow breath. The kid with the 22 with the silver-tipped round sights on the spot 2 inches above Goyle's right ear. The kid squeezes, the 22 coughs. The round at 40 meters with the silver-tipped load arrives where the kid has sent it. Goyle stops humming, Goyle stops walking. Goyle, with the slow, surprised dignity of a large drunk man who has lost the use of all 4 limbs at once, sits down on the lane. Goyle for a long second looks at nothing. Goyle falls sideways. The kid stays in the shadow of the hedgerow for 30 seconds, the 22 still up, eyes still on the body. The kid is not breathing fast. The kid is not breathing slow. The kid is breathing the breathing of a person who has just completed a piece of difficult work to standard. The kid lowers the 22. The kid very softly says, "That is for the Aurors who were on duty at the raid on the McKinnons in 1981. The kid steps backward into the hedgerow. The kid is gone. Frank on the other side of the field lowers his glasses. Frank, into the small mirror in his palm, says, "Done." The kid's voice in the mirror says, "Walk." They walk. They walk separate routes by separate angles to separate fallback points to separate apparition signatures to separate destinations, and then in the small hours of morning, back to Hogwarts by separate paths from separate directions and through separate gates. They do not meet again that night. They will meet in the morning at the keeper's hut for breakfast. Madame Bones, the next morning in her office with the Daily Prophet open before her, draws 2 new violet lines through 2 new names. The notebook is, by the end of October, missing 4 of its 8 names. Madame Bones, that evening in her sitting room with a single glass of brandy, says aloud to the empty room, "I do not know who you are. I am going to stop looking. I would like to thank you. I would like, when you are done, for you to know that you have been seen." Then Madame Bones goes to bed. November, Avery. Avery's routine, by every report, has held for 3 years. Avery walks along the river in Hampshire at 10 of the morning every weekday for 40 minutes. Avery walks alone. Avery walks unarmed in the sense that Avery's wand is in his coat pocket and not in his hand. Avery walks the same loop. Avery is, by every operational metric, an easy hit. Avery is, on Frank's analysis, too easy. Avery is so easy that Frank suspects, in his careful read, that Avery may be a trap. Avery may be a man whose enemies have been counting on for years, and whose enemies, by now, have set the trap and are waiting for it to be sprung. Frank does not believe in 3 years of unmodified routine in a man who, when serving the Dark Lord, was the operations chief. Frank believes the routine is bait. Frank takes a week to confirm. Frank, with the help of 2 house elves Sandy has very quietly loaned him for surveillance, monitors Avery's route at staggered intervals. Frank, with the help of the goblin Griffook, who has access to certain Hampshire financial records, identifies a small payment Avery has been making quarterly for the last 2 years to a security firm in Salisbury that specializes in Muggle bodyguards with a particular skill set. Avery has, Frank discovers, 6 paid Muggle ex-soldiers shadowing the route. The 6 Muggles do not approach Avery. The 6 Muggles stay back 500 to 700 meters. The 6 Muggles have in their rotation instructions to engage any approaching Muggle on sight. The 6 Muggles are good. The 6 Muggles are, by Frank's read of their bearing through binoculars at 1,000 meters from a hilltop with a tripod, ex-special air service or close to it, Avery is hunting hunters. Frank, in the keeper's hut with the kid that night, says Avery hired Muggles to kill the Muggle who he believes is killing wizards. Avery's threat model includes me. Avery has hired me a welcoming party. The kid says he cannot use wizards. He cannot tell other wizards he is being hunted by a Muggle. The other wizards would not believe him. The other wizards do not know. Frank says he has hired Muggles because he believes I am a Muggle. The kid says he has not connected you to me. Frank says he has not connected me to you. The kid says, "How do you want to play it?" Frank says, "I want to play it slow. We let Avery's people watch the river for another month. We give them nothing to find. We meanwhile do Mulciber and Yaxley, both of which are harder targets and both of which Avery will react to. When Avery reacts to those 2, we see what he does. If he changes his routine is real. If he keeps the routine, he is bait. Either way, we have learned something. Then we take him in a way the XSAS team is not prepared for." The kid says, "What way?" Frank says, "From the air." The kid says, "From the air." Frank says, "From a broom borrowed." The kid considers this for a long moment. The kid says, "That is funny." Frank says, "It is operationally appropriate." The kid says, "It is also funny." Frank says, "I am allowed to enjoy this sometimes, kid." The kid almost smiles. December, Mulciber. Mulciber is, as predicted, the hardest. Mulciber's flat in Nocturne Alley is warded to a standard the goblin Griffook has, with some professional admiration, sketched out as comparable to the wards on a small ministry depository. The flat has on its threshold a soul trap. The flat has on its windows anti-apparition wards. The flat has on its walls a charm of false direction that would cause an attacker to lose his sense of which door is which once inside. The flat has on Mulciber's person when home a personal shield that absorbs the first 3 offensive spells cast at him in any 30-second window. The flat does not have on its plumbing any defenses whatsoever. Mulciber drinks, as the file says, a particular brand of foreign brandy. The brandy is imported by a small wizard merchant in Diagon Alley. The merchant, on a slow Tuesday in early December, receives a visit from a tall American-accented gentleman who introduces himself as a private buyer and offers an extremely generous price for the merchant's entire current stock of the brandy in question, on the condition that the bottles be replaced in their original cases with bottles supplied by the buyer of an identical brand and label prepared at the buyer's own facility, which the buyer assures the merchant are of slightly superior vintage. The merchant agrees. The merchant agrees because the price is extraordinary and because the gentleman in question has, on the table between them, a small leather purse that contains a number of galleons sufficient to retire the merchant if he so chose. The substituted brandy, prepared in the keeper's hut at Hogwarts over a period of 4 nights by Frank, with the help of a small handbook of medieval Italian poisoning that Hermione, on an offhand request by Harry citing historical interest, has procured for him from the restricted section, has been adjusted at the level of the 8th and last bottle in Mulciber's case, which by the merchant's record will be opened by Mulciber on or about December 18th. Mulciber opens the 8th bottle on December 18th. Mulciber pours himself a glass of brandy at 5 of the evening. Mulciber drinks the glass. Mulciber pours a second glass. Mulciber, between the second glass and the third glass, sits down in his armchair very heavily with a small look of mild confusion. Mulciber, on the 3rd minute after sitting, slumps forward. Mulciber, on the 7th minute, ceases breathing. Mulciber, on the 12th minute, is, by any test a healer can perform, dead, of what the healer will record on examination as a sudden cardiac event of a kind common in heavy drinkers of his age. The brandy bottle on examination is, on every magical test, an unmodified bottle of Mulciber's preferred brand, because Frank, knowing that the body would be examined by healers, has poisoned the brandy with a muggle compound that produces a clinical picture identical to a natural cardiac event, and that, importantly, leaves no magical trace whatsoever. Mulciber is, in the official record, dead of natural causes. The notebook in Madame Bones's drawer, by the morning of December 19th, has another violet line through another name. January? Yaxley. Yaxley, the ministry man, is the target Frank has been most concerned about. Yaxley is a ministry employee. Yaxley spends 9 hours a day inside the Ministry of Magic, which is the most heavily warded building in Britain. Yaxley travels to and from the ministry by flew from his townhouse, which is itself warded. Yaxley lunches at a ministry cafeteria. Yaxley uses ministry restrooms. Yaxley is, in operational terms, almost untouchable. Yaxley does, however, take, on alternate Wednesdays at 1:15 in the afternoon, a quiet walk in the small enclosed garden behind the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, alone to clear his head between meetings. The garden is enclosed. The garden has, by Yaxley's own arrangement, a privacy ward on the perimeter that ensures Yaxley will not be disturbed during the walk. The privacy ward is, in its formal logic, a ward that screens out wizards but not, on the Goblin Griffhook's careful read of its construction, Muggle objects. The privacy ward does not, on its own logic, expect a Muggle object to be present. The privacy ward will, accordingly, pass an inanimate piece of Muggle metal without alerting either Yaxley or the surrounding security. A piece of Muggle metal traveling at, for example, the muzzle velocity of a .22 long rifle round, fired from a position on the roof of an adjoining Muggle building 80 meters above the garden, at an angle that is, by Harry's careful trigonometric work using the department's published blueprints, available from the roof in question through a small window-sized aperture, will, the Goblin confirms, pass the ward as if the ward were not there. The kid plans the shot. The kid plans the shot for 4 weeks. The kid plans the shot with the kind of attention to wind, distance, glass refraction, building stability, and target movement that Frank, reviewing the plan at the keeper's hut, says is the best amateur ballistics work Frank has ever seen. The kid says, "I am not an amateur, Dad." Frank says, "Number, I guess you are not." The kid does the shot himself. The kid does the shot from the roof of a Muggle office building called Whitehall Court, 80 meters above the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's hidden garden on the second Wednesday of January 1994 at 1:22 in the afternoon with a custom-built single shot. 22 with a long barrel and a precision barometer and a high-grade scope, and a small piece of putty over the muzzle to mute the report, with the wind from the southwest at 4 miles an hour, with Yaxley at 33 meters into his walk and turning to retrace his steps. The round travels 80 meters down and 33 meters in. The round enters Yaxley above the left ear. The round exits below the right ear. Yaxley falls in his garden in his moment of head-clearing solitude under his privacy ward, which keeps the falling from being witnessed by anyone for another 17 minutes. The kid packs the rifle in 9 seconds. The kid leaves the roof by the fire stairs. The kid is on a bus across the Thames in 12 minutes. The kid is back at Hogwarts by dinner. At dinner, Hermione Granger, sitting next to Harry on a bench at a long Gryffindor-Slytherin study session in the library after the meal, says, "You look tired today, Harry." Harry, opening his arithmancy book, says, "I had a long day." Hermione says, "You should eat more at dinner." Harry says, "I will." Hermione says, "My mother says boys at our age need to eat regularly or they fall asleep over their books." Harry says, "Your mother is right." Hermione, with great seriousness, pushes a small bowl of treacle tart toward Harry. Harry, with equally great seriousness, eats the treacle tart. February, AVERY, take 2. Frank's analysis, after watching Avery's response to the December and January killings, is confirmed. Avery does not change his routine. Avery is bait. Avery's 6 XSAS men remain in their 500-meter perimeter. Avery, by Frank's read of Avery's intercepted owl correspondence, intercepted by the friendly house elf Sandy through a network the elves have woven under the entire wizarding postal system that no Auror knows exists, is in fact paying the 6 men double rates for February in the expectation that the killer is closing in. Frank closes in from above. The borrowed broom is a clean sweep 7, taken without ceremony from the Hogwarts broom shed on a Sunday night by Harry with the headmaster's tacit understanding, returned by Monday morning. Frank, who has not flown a broom in his life, learns to fly the broom over the course of 6 clear evenings in late January, on a small private meadow inside the Forbidden Forest, with the kid riding behind him as instructor and a thermos of hot tea waiting on a flat stone at the meadow's edge for the breaks. By the first week of February, Frank can fly the broom in a straight line at speed and in slow, controlled hovers at altitudes up to 400 meters. Frank cannot do any of the fancy maneuvers. Frank does not need to. Avery walks the river at 10 of the morning on a Thursday. The fog is heavy. The visibility on the ground is 30 meters. The visibility from the river's surface, looking up, is, by Frank's tested calculations, less than 10 meters. Frank is at 400 meters above the river in the fog on the broom. Frank, with the rifle slung across his back and the wind muffled by the fog and the position braced by a small charm of stability that the headmaster, on Frank's request, has applied to the broom for the day, brings the rifle up. Frank sights through the optic, downward, through a thin patch in the cloud, on the small figure of Avery on the riverside path. Frank confirms the figure against the photographs the file holds. Frank breathes out. Frank squeezes. The round, from 400 meters above in fog, with a slight downward drift correction, arrives in the top of Avery's head at the angle of a sharp blade dropped from a great height. Avery falls. Avery's 6 XSAS bodyguards in their perimeter on the ground hear nothing, see nothing, and detect nothing for the next 19 minutes. By the time the lead bodyguard on the schedule of a check-in he is paid to make at 1:15 walks down to the river, Frank is 12 miles south, descending through a clear patch over Salisbury Plain on his way to a small farm where Hermione's parents practice as a friend who keeps a few horses, and where Frank lands the borrowed broom in the corner of a far field, dismounts, walks to the road, hails a taxi, and is back in Hogsmeade by tea. The Daily Prophet headline the following morning says, "Second Ministry death in a week, AURORS baffled. Madame Bones, alone in her sitting room with brandy, says aloud to the empty room, 6. By the first week of March, 6 of the 8 are dead. The Death Eater social network, in the careful word of the headmaster, has collapsed. The remaining 2, Lucius Malfoy and Goyle Sr.'s friend Crabbe Sr. Wait, that is in the past tense since Crabbe is dead. The remaining 2 are Lucius Malfoy and the last one on no list that Madame Bones keeps but on every list Frank keeps. The last one is Bellatrix Lestrange. Bellatrix, technically, escaped Azkaban 2 weeks ago in a small, unreported jailbreak that the Ministry has buried in the back pages, because the Ministry does not want to admit that the most committed of the Dark Lord's lieutenants is at large. Bellatrix, by Frank's analysis, will be hunting the killer of the others. Bellatrix, by Frank's analysis, will use Malfoy Manor as a base of operations because Lucius is the only one of the inner circle left to give her shelter. Bellatrix, by Frank's analysis, presents an opportunity to take Malfoy and Lestrange in the same operation. Frank and the kid plan the Malfoy Manor operation for 2 weeks. They plan it down to the schematic. They plan it with the Goblins' wards diagrams and the House Elf Network's intelligence on which corridors are occupied at what hours, and Sandy's small careful sketch of the kitchen door that is, on every Malfoy Manor night, attended by exactly one elf who, when given a small note that contains a single line of polite request, will at the appropriate hour open the door and look the other way. April 5th, Malfoy Manor. The operation is, by Frank's standards, the most complex they have done. The operation takes 4 hours of execution. The operation involves the simultaneous breaching of 3 sets of wards, the disabling of a defensive portrait gallery, the silencing of a peacock, the neutralization of 2 house elves bound to the Malfoy family who must not, by Sandy's careful instruction, be killed but may, with Sandy's introduction, be persuaded to a long sleep. The operation involves the kid moving on foot through the east wing while Frank covers the west wing from a rooftop perch. The operation involves the kid encountering, in a small interior hallway on the 2nd floor, the kid's school friend Draco Malfoy, age 14, in pajamas, blinking in the dim corridor light, asking what is going on. The kid says very calmly, "Draco, there is an emergency, you need to go to your room and lock the door and not come out until morning." Draco says, "What kind of emergency?" The kid says, "A muggle emergency." Draco says, "A muggle in the house." The kid says, "There has been a muggle in this house for an hour and a half. The muggle is not here for you. The muggle is here for your father and for your father's guest. The muggle is going to leave when those 2 are taken care of. You are not on any list. Your mother is not on any list. The muggle has been instructed at length and in writing to leave you and your mother alone." Draco says, "Who is the muggle?" The kid says, "My father." Draco, after a long moment, looking at Harry, "Your father?" The kid says, "Yes." Draco says, "Your father is the muggle." The kid says, "Yes." Draco says, "Who has been killing them?" The kid says, "Yes." Draco says very slowly, "Are you the one helping him?" The kid says, "Yes." Draco is quiet for a long second. Draco says, "My father has done bad things, Harry. I know that. I have known that since I was 8. My mother has been waiting for him to be arrested for 10 years. The kid says, "Yes." Draco says, "Will my mother be all right?" The kid says, "Your mother is going to be all right. Your mother is going to be a widow tomorrow. Your mother is going to grieve in the way she has decided to grieve. Your mother is also, by tomorrow afternoon, going to be in control of the Malfoy estate, which is sizable and which she is, by my father's reading of her, going to administer well." Draco says, "And me?" The kid says, "You are still my friend. You will be welcome at my table at every meal until we leave this school. After that, your life is your own." Draco, after another long moment, nods. Draco walks back to his room. Draco does not come out until morning. Lucius Malfoy and Bellatrix Lestrange are taken in the study at 1:40 in the morning by Frank with the M1911 and the silver-tipped rounds at point-blank range, after a brief and intense exchange of fire in which Bellatrix manages exactly 1 spell, which Frank, ducking, takes on the left shoulder, which the wards Dumbledore has placed on Frank's coat, reflect at half power back into the wall behind Bellatrix, which gives Frank the half-second he needs. The exchange is over in 3 seconds. The shoulder, Frank determines later, will heal. The Bellatrix, Frank confirms with 2 more rounds to the head, will not. Frank stands in the study with a cooling pistol and a small smell of cordite, with Lucius Malfoy slumped over his own desk and Bellatrix Lestrange on the carpet and the small enchanted mirror in his hand. The mirror in Frank's hand contains the kid's small voice. The kid says, "Confirm." Frank says, "Confirmed." Both walk. The kid says, "Walk." Madame Bones, in her sitting room on the morning of April 6th, with Brandy and the Daily Prophet open before her. 8. She closes the notebook. She puts the notebook in the back of her desk drawer. She does not open the notebook again for 2 years. She is, on the morning of April 6, 1994, the head of a department whose principal multi-year case has just resolved itself by means she has chosen not to investigate. She is, on the same morning, a woman who has been waiting since 1981 for the day a certain list of names would no longer be on the wall of her professional memory. She is, on that morning, by her own honest account, lighter than she has felt in 12 years. She drinks her brandy. She picks up the day's first all-delivered file. She goes to work. The Daily Prophet, in the week after the Malfoy Manor incident, runs 3 consecutive days of front-page coverage. The coverage is, by Frank's careful read, evenly divided between bewilderment, indignation, and the slowly creeping recognition that the recent series of deaths, beginning with McNair in August, have all the marks of a single careful campaign against a single specific category of person. The category the Prophet does not name. The category the Prophet is not yet ready to name. The category, by April 12th, is being named in side conversations in pubs across Wizarding Britain in a tone of voice that does not, on the whole, contain dismay. Several of the names belong to families who, on careful pub conversation, no one really liked. Several of the deaths on pub conversation are not, on reflection, that bad. A small editorial in the Quibbler by a writer named Xenophilius Lovegood suggests that the recent string of deaths may be the work of an avenging spirit summoned during the war by the surviving members of the Order of the Phoenix and only now manifesting its work. The Quibbler editorial is widely mocked. The Quibbler editorial is, by Frank's standards, the closest any published guess has come to the truth, in the sense that the guess at least acknowledges that the deaths are coordinated and have a specific list. Frank, reading the editorial in the keeper's hut, says aloud to the kid, "I want to meet this Lovegood man." The kid says, "He has a daughter in the year below me. Luna, she is, in the words of every other student, strange. She is, in my read, the only second year in this school who has independently noticed that I am not what I seem. Frank says, has she told anyone? The kid says, number she has, however, slipped me 3 different small notes over the term, all of which I have decoded, all of which contain veiled but unmistakable references to specific tactical decisions of mine. She is sending me, in her own way, the message that she sees me and that she is not going to tell. Frank says, why is she not going to tell? The kid says, because she has a private list of her own. Her mother died in a magical accident in 1989, which her father has, in his Quibbler editorials, alluded to as having been arranged by a ministry official who is not on our list but who is, by Mr. Lovegood's strong implication, deserving of being on someone's list. Luna believes that if she is patient and quiet, I will, in time, be willing to add her father's name to my list. Frank says, and the kid says, and we are not going to, we are not in the business of doing other people's contracts. We have our list, we finish our list, we do not become someone else's hand. Frank says, that is the right answer. The kid says, I gave Luna the right answer. Frank says, how did she take it? The kid says, politely, she is reasonable, she accepted that my list is not her list. She has, since I told her, started leaving small handwritten notes on my desk in the library that contain extremely useful information she has gleaned by means I do not understand about ongoing ministry investigations. She is doing it not as an exchange. She is doing it because she has decided I am, in her phrase, on the right side of the larger picture. Frank says, I would like to meet Luna also. The kid says, she would like to meet you, she has asked. Frank says, bring her down for tea sometime. The kid says, I will. Hermione Granger, in the second week of April, walks into the keeper's hut at 5 in the afternoon without knocking, with a stack of books under one arm and a thunderous expression on her face. Frank, at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, looks up. Hermione says, without preamble, Mr. Castle. Frank says, Miss Granger. Hermione says, I have figured it out. Frank says, sit down. Hermione sits down. Hermione puts the books on the table. Hermione, at the age of 14, with bushy hair and her school robes still on and a smudge of ink on her left cheek, looks at Frank Castle across a kitchen table at the edge of the Forbidden Forest and presents her case. Hermione's case takes 35 minutes. Hermione's case is, on Frank's careful evaluation as she walks through it, almost entirely correct. Hermione has identified the pattern of the killings. Hermione has identified the list. Hermione has, by cross-referencing daily Prophet archives, ministry case files Harry has been quietly accessing for her under the cover of a long-running research project on post-war wizarding crime, and a number of Muggle ballistics textbooks she has been reading in the evenings, concluded that the killings are the work of an extremely skilled Muggle operative with intimate knowledge of Death Eater identities and current whereabouts. Hermione has identified that the Muggle operative could not possibly have done this work without a wizarding partner. Hermione has identified that the wizarding partner must be a young person on the grounds of Hogwarts, because the only access point in the wizarding world that aligns with the timeline of the killings is the access available through the school. Hermione has identified, after some hesitation, that the wizarding partner is, on every reasonable reading of the evidence and her own personal knowledge of his daily movements, Harry James Potter. Hermione has identified that Frank Castle is, on the grounds of timing, geographic proximity, and the unmistakable change in Harry's bearing whenever Frank is in the room, the Muggle operative. Hermione has concluded all of this. Hermione has, before coming to the keeper's hut, decided what she is going to do about it. Hermione, finishing the presentation, says, Mr. Castle, I am not going to tell anyone. Frank, very quietly, Miss Granger. Hermione says, I am not going to tell anyone because, on my own honest read of the cases of the 8 people you have killed, every single one of them earned what you did to them. I cross-referenced the names against the surviving Auror reports and the ministry's own internal records, which Harry, with my unwitting assistance, has been quietly making available to me for 2 years. The reports established, to a standard I find personally convincing, that each of the 8 was responsible over the course of their adult lives for the deaths of multiple innocent people, including children. The ministry has, by its own internal record, been aware of the bulk of this evidence for over a decade. The ministry has not acted because the ministry is politically compromised. You have acted because you are not. I am not going to be the person who reverses your work. Frank says, that is a serious decision, Miss Granger. Hermione says, I have made many serious decisions in my life, Mr. Castle. This one is, in my own evaluation, the least difficult I have made this year. Frank says, why are you telling me then? Hermione says, because I have figured it out, which means anyone else of comparable analytical capacity could also figure it out. I am telling you so that you can refine your operational discipline. I am telling you that there are 5 small operational mistakes I noticed in the public record across the 8 cases. I have here a list of them. Hermione produces a list. The list is in her neat round hand. The list has on it 5 small bullet points, each describing a forensic or pattern detail that to a sufficiently determined investigator would be the seed of a successful case. Frank reads the list. Frank says number 3 is wrong. The choice of subsonic ammunition at the Hogsmeade Lane was not a mistake. It was a deliberate trade-off. The other 4 are correct. I will fix the other 4. Hermione says, I had wondered if the subsonic was a deliberate choice. Thank you for the correction. Frank says, you did good work, Miss Granger. Hermione says, I would like to do more. Frank looks at her. Frank says, you want to come in? Hermione says, I want to come in as far as I am useful and no further. I do not want to fire a weapon. I do not want to harm anyone. I want to help with the research, the case building, the pattern analysis, and the operational discipline. I am very good at all 4. I think Harry would be safer with me on the inside than on the outside. Frank thinks about this for a long time. Frank says, Harry is in the next room. Harry, come in here. Harry, who has been sitting at the kitchen window of the keeper's bedroom listening to every word of the 35-minute presentation through the open door, walks in. Harry says, yes, Dad. Frank says, you have heard. Harry says, I have heard. Frank says, operational vote. Do we take her in? Harry says, without hesitation, yes. Frank says, why? Harry says, because she is the smartest person I have met under the age of 30, and because if she has figured it out without my help, she is more useful inside than out, and because on a more personal note, she is my friend and I have been lying to her for 2 years and I am tired of it. I would like to stop. Frank says, Miss Granger. Hermione says, yes, Mr. Castle. Frank says, welcome to the operation. There is a written agreement we are going to walk you through tomorrow morning. There are 5 operational protocols you are going to memorize tonight. There is one specific limit on your role I want you to understand right now and not negotiate. You do not ever take part in a kill. You do not load a weapon, you do not draw a weapon, you do not stand watch on a kill. Your role is preparation and analysis. The kill belongs to me and the kid. Are we clear? Hermione says we are clear. Frank says good, put on the kettle, we are going to start. Hermione puts on the kettle. By the end of year 3, on the night before the Hogwarts Express returns the students to King's Cross for the summer, Harry walks the kid Draco to the platform with a small, companionable silence. Draco, since the night of the manor, has been quieter, smaller, kinder in some ways and harder in others. Draco has not asked Harry any further questions. Draco has, in the common room, in the dining hall, in the corridors, kept his seat next to Harry. Draco has, by the unspoken rede of the entire Slytherin house, become Harry's lieutenant. Draco's mother, Narcissa Malfoy, in the only private letter she has sent her son this term, has written, your friend Mr. Potter is welcome at the manor at any time during the holidays. The garden is yours. At the platform, Draco hands Harry a small wrapped package. Draco says, for your father. Harry says, for my father. Draco says, open it later. Harry says, I will. Draco, after a hesitation, says, tell him from me that the house elves at the manor are very pleased. We have hired 3 new ones and they are paid, which my father would not have allowed. The manor is on every account better. I wanted him to know that. Harry says, I will tell him. Draco gets on the train. Harry, back at the keeper's hut, opens the package. Inside the package, wrapped in soft black velvet, is an old wand. The wand is hawthorn. The wand is 10 inches. The wand is, by the small label that has been pinned to it in Draco's careful handwriting, the personal wand of Lucius Malfoy, used by Lucius for 43 years and recovered by Draco from his father's study after the Auror investigation closed. The wand has on it a small note in Narcissa Malfoy's elegant hand. For Mr. Castle, with my thanks, the wand is no longer in my family's service. Use it as you like or do with it as you will. Frank looks at the wand for a long time. Frank, with the wand in his hand in the kitchen of the keeper's hut at the edge of the Forbidden Forest on the last night of June 1994, says very quietly, Phase 1 is done. The kid says Phase 2. Frank says Phase 2 begins when he comes back. He has been gathering himself somewhere for 30 months. He is going to come back this year or the next. He is going to need a ritual. He is going to need conspirators. The conspirators are all dead. He is going to have to do it himself. Doing it himself is going to take him longer. We have a window. The kid says how big. Frank says a year, maybe 2. The kid says then we use the window. Frank says we use it. The kid says how. Frank says we give him a place to be reborn. We set a trap. We use a ritual he cannot resist. We let the bastard come to us. The kid says a trap. Frank says a trap. The kid says I am thinking the same. Frank says, I figured. The kid says, there is this year a tournament. The headmaster mentioned it last week. The Triwizard Tournament. It is the kind of thing he could not resist. Frank says, that is what I am thinking. The kid says, we let him come into it. We let him pull me into the final task. We let him take me wherever he is going to take me to do the ritual. We have you there waiting. Frank says, that is the structure. The kid says, then we begin planning. Frank says, tomorrow. The kid says, tonight. Frank says, tonight then. Outside, the train carrying the year's students rumbles away from Hogsmeade Station toward the south. Inside the keeper's hut, Frank Castle and Harry James Potter sit at the kitchen table with a fresh sheet of paper between them, and the kid takes the pen and the kid writes in his careful, neat hand at the top of the page, The Goblet of Fire. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Voldemort Endgame, the summer of 1994. A small unfurnished room in a village in northern Albania. Lord Voldemort, who is at this point in his career less a lord than a shape of darkness wearing a coat, who is at this point less a body than a memory of one with intentions, sits cross-legged on a dust-covered floor in front of a fire he has lit with words because he cannot light it with hands he does not have, and reads, by the firelight, a small book of dark ritual that he has stolen from the library of a Romanian sorcerer who is now also dead. The book has, on page 743, a ritual. The ritual will give him a body. The ritual requires 3 ingredients: bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy. The Lord, who has had 30 months to consider this, has, on the question of the father's bone, no difficulty. He knows where his father is buried. He knows where his father's bones lie. He has been there before at the age of 16 on a small private pilgrimage of contempt. He can go again. The bones, he is confident, are unguarded. The Lord, on the question of the servant's flesh, has a more serious difficulty. The Lord, on the question of the servant's flesh, has the following difficulty: the Lord has no servants. The Lord's inner circle, on inquiry, are 8 dead men. The Lord's outer circle, on inquiry, are 18 frightened young purebloods, none of whom have been seen in public in 3 years, all of whom have, the Lord understands from the small frightened wisps of his remaining magical sense, gone to ground in the foreign countries they have moved to in the last 2 years and are not answering the dark marks that should burn on their forearms when the Lord, in his diminished state, manages to send a pulse through what is left of them. The Lord, on the question of the servant's flesh, in fact, faces the possibility that no servant can be found who will willingly give it. The Lord, after a long week of thought, in the dust of the small room, in the firelight, in the ash smell of a country he does not love, concludes that he will have to do it himself. He will have to cut his own flesh from his own body, from the body he does not yet have. He will, that is, have to construct a temporary body, of stolen materials, in a precarious ritual, sufficient to perform a self-mutilation, in order to provide the flesh required by the larger ritual to construct a permanent body. The temporary body is, in the same book on the same page, sketched as a small leech-like form of about 30 pounds, sustained by the milk of a unicorn or the venom of a Romanian longfang, neither of which Lord Voldemort, who at this point has no money, no body, and no functioning agents, is going to easily acquire. The Lord, in a country he does not love, on a floor he hates, with a fire he resents, begins, slowly, with the patient outrage of a being who once commanded armies and is now reduced to begging for the materials of his own resurrection, to take notes. The Lord, in the end, will take 8 months to procure the materials. The Lord, in the end, will need 3 months more to perform the temporary body ritual. The Lord, in the end, will spend the autumn of 1994 in a state of bare ambulatory rage, in a state hidden from every magical sense in Britain, traveling slowly and painfully across Europe in his small, ugly form, scraping together the materials for the larger ritual, one humiliating ingredient at a time. The Lord, in the end, will not arrive at his father's gravesite, with a willing third party to assist him, until the night of the third task of the Triwizard Tournament, June 24, 1995. By that night, Frank Castle has been ready for 10 months. September 1994, Hogwarts Year 4, the Goblet of Fire is announced. The headmaster, in his welcoming feast address, announces with the appropriate combination of solemnity and cheer that the Triwizard Tournament will be held this year, that Hogwarts will host, that the other 2 schools will arrive in October, and that the Goblet of Fire, an impartial magical judge, will select 1 champion from each school to compete in 3 tasks, the third of which will involve a maze on the Quidditch grounds containing a portkey to the Triwizard Cup at its center. Harry at the Slytherin table eats his roast chicken with the measured pace of a 4th year who is, on the surface, mildly interested in the tournament as entertainment. Frank at the end of the staff table in the groundskeeper's chair drinks his tea. In the keeper's hut that night, with the kid and Hermione and the headmaster present, the 4 of them plan. The plan, in its first iteration, has 6 stages. Stage 1, get Harry's name into the goblet against the rules. Done on the night of October 30th by Hermione, who has researched a small reverse confundus charm that allows a 4th year's name to be slipped into the goblet without triggering the age line and without triggering the impartiality check. The goblet, on the night of October 31st, selects Harry as a 4th champion. Stage 2, suffer the public outrage. Done by Harry over the course of November and December with the appropriate dejected innocence of a kid who has, by all appearances, been set up. Stage 3, compete in the first 2 tasks with sufficient competence to maintain credibility. Done with the dragon in November and the lake puzzle in February, with the slight advantage of Hermione's research and the small Imperius the headmaster, with Harry's full consent, has allowed himself to use lightly during the lake task to ensure no merperson gets, in the kid's word, ideas. Stage 4. Identify the agent through whom Voldemort intends to use the tournament as a resurrection mechanism. Done in December. The agent is on the close investigation by Sandy's House Elf Network and Hermione's pattern analysis of staff behavior. A man currently impersonating the new defense against the dark arts teacher, the real Aleister Moody, by use of an advanced shape-shifting potion called Polyjuice. The impersonator is on identification of the man in the trunk in Moody's quarters, Barty Crouch Jr., an escaped Death Eater the Ministry has believed dead for 13 years. Stage 5. Allow the imposter Moody to continue with his plan. Allow the imposter to enchant the Triwizard Cup into a portkey to the gravesite of Tom Riddle Sr. Allow the imposter to escort Harry to the maze. Allow Harry to win the maze. Allow Harry to touch the cup. Allow the cup to deliver Harry at the appointed moment to the gravesite. Stage 6. Frank, having arrived at the gravesite by alternate means several hours earlier, is in position with the rifle. Frank does the work. Frank and the kid walk out. The plan in its first iteration has the additional refinement of leaving the impersonator alive, in his trunk in his quarters, to be recovered by Madame Bones the following morning, with a small carefully prepared letter from the impersonator confessing in detail to the entire plot, which Hermione, with the assistance of a small spell of compelled honesty applied at the headmaster's discretion under the kid's careful supervision, will obtain from the impersonator in the small hours of June 25th. The plan in its first iteration has in Frank's hand at the bottom of the planning document the small note, approved. Execution commences immediately. Frank underlines the word execution and after a half-second lets the double meaning stand. The year passes, the kid plays his part. The kid is on the public stage, the surprise fourth champion who by every appearance did not enter himself in the tournament and is doing his honest best. The kid handles the dragon in the first task with what the Daily Prophet describes as a clever combination of summoning charm and flying skill. The kid handles the lake task in the second with what the prophet describes as moving heroism. The kid handles the public attention with the calm, distant manner of a young man who is not, on his own private accounting, particularly impressed with himself. Hermione in the background prepares, Frank in the keeper's hut prepares, the headmaster in his office prepares, Sandy in the kitchens prepares, Griffook at Gringotts prepares. Madame Bones, who has been told nothing directly, but who has, on her own private read of the staffing changes at Hogwarts and the operational patterns of the last 3 years, deduced approximately 90% of what is going to happen, prepares quietly in her own way, which is by arranging her department's June schedule so that the night of June 24th has, by coincidence, no fewer than 6 of her best aurors stationed within 5 minutes apparition of the Hogwarts grounds. On the cover story of routine perimeter exercises. The Lord in Albania and then in Bulgaria and then in northern Greece and then in southern France and then in a small coastal town in southern Wales prepares, the hour comes. June 24, 1995, 9 in the evening, the third task, the maze on the Quidditch grounds. The 4 champions enter at staggered intervals. The kid enters at 9:04, Harry in the maze with the holly wand in his right hand and the small enchanted mirror in his left and a tiny .22 caliber Walther TPH in his coat pocket, and 3 rounds of silver-tipped ammunition in the chamber, navigates the obstacles. He defeats in turn a blast-ended Scroot, a boggart, a sphinx, and a sudden wall of flame conjured by the maze's enchantments. He encounters Cedric Diggory, his Hufflepuff friend, in a clearing at the maze's center in the company of the cup. Cedric and Harry, who have over the course of the year developed a small but genuine friendship of their own, look at each other for a long second. Cedric says, "After you," Harry says, "With me." Cedric says, "With you." They touch the cup together. The cup is a portkey. The portkey activates. The graveyard is in a small village in the West Country. Tom Riddle Sr.'s grave is the largest stone in the eastern corner. There is a fresh grave 6 feet from the headstone, recently dug, with a half-completed cauldron set into it on a low fire. There is a chair beside the cauldron with leather straps. There is beside the chair a small bundle wrapped in dark cloth from which a thin pale arm protrudes holding a wand. Harry and Cedric land at the edge of the graveyard. Cedric, looking around, says, "Where are we?" Harry says, "A graveyard." Cedric says, "Why are we in a graveyard?" The pale wand in the bundle rises. A voice from the bundle, thin and dry as wind in dead leaves, says, "Kill the spare." A green flash crosses the graveyard. Frank Castle, who has been in this graveyard for 6 hours, who has been in a position behind a wide stone crypt 30 meters from Tom Riddle Sr.'s grave with his rifle and his patience and his old wool coat against the June chill, sees the green flash leave the pale wand at the moment the green flash leaves the pale wand, and in that fraction of a second, with the precision a man earns by spending 30 years arriving early to other people's planned events, fires. Frank's round of silver-tipped subsonic load, prepared by Frank himself in the keeper's hut over the course of the winter for exactly this moment, traveling at exactly the velocity required to arrive at the intercept point in 18 1/1000ths of a second after Frank's squeeze, intersects the green flash at a point approximately 2 meters in front of Cedric Diggory's chest. The green flash on impact fractures. The fracture is, by every account Frank will later read in Hermione's transcribed magical analyses, the first recorded instance of the killing curse failing to reach its target in the history of magical Britain. The killing curse is, the books say, unblockable. The killing curse, however, has not in any of the books been previously encountered by a precisely placed Muggle projectile, fired at exactly the right speed by exactly the right angle by a man whose only training in this particular moment is the cumulative 30-year practice of arriving where bullets need to be. The killing curse on fracture dissipates into the warm June air. Cedric, on the receiving end, blinks. Cedric says in the small, confused voice of a teenager who has not yet understood that he was about to die, "Did somebody fire a gun?" Harry beside him says, "Cedric, listen to me carefully. There is a man near here with a rifle. The man is on our side. There is also a man near here with a wand who is not on our side. I am going to draw the wand man's attention. You are going to crawl behind that crypt. You are going to stay there until I come get you. Do you understand?" Cedric says, "Aye." Harry says, "Do you understand?" Cedric, after a long second, says, "Yes." Harry says, "Go." Cedric goes. Cedric, with the speed of a fit Quidditch player who has been told to move by a friend whose friendship has, in this moment, become a thing he trusts more than his own confusion, crawls behind the crypt. The pale wand in the bundle, having registered the failure of the curse, rises again. The bundle says in its dry voice, "Where is the shooter?" The bundle says, "Wormtail." The bundle on the third syllable of the word wormtail is no longer the only bundle in the clearing. The second bundle, who has been crouched in the shadows beside the cauldron for the past hour, who is a small fat man with a silver hand and the smell of unwashed sleep, who is, on Frank's identification from the surveillance file on Sandy's intelligence network, one Peter Pettigrew, also known as Wormtail, one of 3 remaining marked Death Eaters not on the original list of 8 because Pettigrew was, until last summer, believed by everyone in the wizarding world to have been dead since 1981, stands up. Wormtail says, "My lord. The shooter is perhaps behind that crypt." Wormtail points. The pale wand swings to the crypt behind which Frank Castle is, as it happens, no longer standing because Frank Castle, on a 30-year-old principle, does not stay in a single firing position for more than 2 consecutive rounds. A green flash leaves the wand. The green flash strikes the crypt. The crypt absorbs the flash without comment. The crypt is, by the look of it, the resting place of a long-dead local squire who, in his sleep, accepts unsolicited spells with equanimity. Frank, who has by this time moved 12 meters to his left to a second prepared position behind a stand of yew trees, fires again. This time the target is Wormtail. The round of silver-tipped load arrives in Wormtail's chest at the level of the heart. Wormtail says, "Oh." Wormtail sits down. Wormtail does not get up. The pale bundle in the cradle by the cauldron, the bundle that is Voldemort's pre-resurrection shape, the bundle that requires the willing assistance of a servant to complete the resurrection ritual, screams. The scream is the scream of a being who has, in this exact moment, lost his only remaining servant on the cusp of his return to a body. The scream is also the scream of a being who, in this exact moment, must improvise. The bundle, with a small frantic motion, rolls itself from its cradle into the cauldron. The cauldron, with its half-completed ritual, takes the bundle in. The cauldron, with the bone of the father already in the brew, with the cup of unicorn blood already drunk, with the small jar of stolen flesh from Wormtail's still warm body harvested in the rite Wormtail had performed an hour ago, accepts the bundle. The cauldron boils. The cauldron, on Frank's careful watch, boils for 90 seconds. The cauldron, on the 91st second, ceases boiling. From the cauldron a figure rises. The figure is tall and pale and naked and bald. The figure has, where it should have a nose, 2 thin vertical slits. The figure has in its right hand the pale wand. The figure has eyes the color of fresh blood and a mouth that is, in the firelight, smiling. The figure says in a voice that is now, by every metric, the voice of a body, "Robes, Wormtail, my robes, where is?" The figure stops. The figure looks at Wormtail on the ground. The figure looks at the small bullet hole in Wormtail's chest. The figure looks at the empty crypt where the shooter was. The figure says, "Ah." The figure raises the pale wand. Frank Castle, 12 meters behind a stand of yew trees, has the figure in the iron sights of the rifle. Frank has had the figure in the sights since the figure rose from the cauldron. Frank, on the principle that he wants to be absolutely certain that the figure before him is the figure he has come to kill and not, for example, a final illusion designed to bait Frank into wasting around, has waited for the figure to speak the figure's own pattern of words. The figure has spoken. The figure is the figure. Frank breathes out. Frank squeezes. The round of silver-tipped subsonic. 308, prepared in the keeper's hut 3 nights ago. Sighted by Frank with the iron sights at this exact range from this exact angle 3 nights ago at 3 in the morning by the light of a single lamp in the rifle workshop of the keeper's hut. While Hermione held the candle and the kid spotted the elevation through a borrowed brass scope, travels 12 meters in the air between Frank's barrel and the figure's body, and by the small mercy of the universe and the slightly larger mercy of Frank Castle's preparation, arrives at the figure's chest at exactly the angle Frank has calculated, in the small precise spot where on Frank's anatomical study of the body the cauldron has just produced, the heart of a regenerated Voldemort is, by every available index, located. The round enters the figure's chest. The figure looks down, the figure says, curious, the figure raises the pale wand. Frank on instinct, on the second instinct of a man who has been shooting things that should die for 40 years and who does not yet trust that the silver-tipped round has in fact done its work, fires the second round. The second round of identical load arrives a quarter-inch above the first. The figure says that was, on reflection, the figure says nothing further. The figure, with the slow, surprised dignity of a tall, naked, bald man who has just had two small, precise objects pass through the muscle that the man requires for the operation of his own circulatory system, sits down on the wet grass of the graveyard. The figure on his knees looks at the pale wand in his hand. The figure tries to lift the wand. The figure's hand does not respond. The figure looks up. The figure says to the air, to the yew trees, to the gravestones, to the warm June night, I have made a mistake somewhere. The figure pitches forward into the grass. The figure does not move. Frank behind the yew trees lowers the rifle. Frank behind the yew trees watches the figure for 30 seconds. The figure does not move. Frank behind the yew trees watches the figure for 60 seconds. The figure does not move. Frank behind the yew trees watches the figure for 180 seconds by the small watch on his wrist. The figure does not move. Frank behind the yew trees says into the small enchanted mirror in his hand, confirm position. The kid's voice in the mirror, behind the gravestone of one Eliza Cooper, 3 rows in from the eastern wall. Cedric is 20 meters east of me. Cedric does not have a line of sight. Cedric does not know what is happening. Frank says, confirm visual on the body. Kid says, I see the body, it is not moving. I have been watching it as long as you have. Frank says, move in. The kid moves in. Frank from behind the yew trees with the rifle still up watches as his son walks slowly across the wet grass of the graveyard, holly wand in his right hand, small Walther TPH in his left, and approaches the body of the man who killed his parents. The kid stops 2 meters from the body. The kid looks at the body for a long second. The kid kneels beside the body. The kid puts the holly wand on the grass beside him. The kid, with the muzzle of the Walther held 2 inches from the temple of the body, says, in a clear, quiet voice, this is for Lily Potter. The kid fires. The shot is loud in the warm June night. The kid says, this is for James Potter. The kid fires again. The kid says, this is for the McKinnon family. This is for the Bones family. This is for the Pruitt brothers. This is for the Longbottom parents who are alive but cannot speak. This is for the 17 years of grief in the room of every house in Britain you touched. The kid fires 4 more times. The kid empties the Walther into the head of the figure on the grass. When the magazine is empty, the kid stands up. The kid, with the Walther in his hand, looks out across the graveyard at the stand of yew trees behind which Frank has been standing. The kid says in the clear, quiet voice, Dad, come out. Frank stands. Frank walks out from behind the yew trees. Frank walks across the wet grass. Frank reaches the kid. Frank beside the kid looks at the figure on the grass. Frank says, confirm. The kid says, confirmed. Frank says, confirm again. We are not leaving this graveyard without confirming twice. The kid kneels. The kid takes the kid's wand. The kid casts with care the spell Hermione has spent 2 weeks teaching the kid for exactly this purpose, the spell that confirms the absence of the soul from a body. The kid casts the spell 3 times. The kid stands up. The kid says, there is nothing left in him, not a fragment. Not a thread, the piece in my forehead is gone too. I felt it go the moment your first round entered him. Frank says, it is done then. The kid says, it is done. Frank says, Cedric. The kid says, Cedric is hiding behind a crypt 20 meters that way and is, by the small sound of his breathing, alive and unhurt. Frank says, get him. We are going home. The kid says, a moment, Dad. The kid stands beside the body for 1 more long second. The kid says very quietly to no one in particular, to himself, perhaps to Lily, perhaps to James, job's done. Frank says, job's done, kid. The kid says, looking up at Frank, with the small, grim half-smile of a young man who has just become, in the small, precise moment of his pulling a trigger 6 times in succession into a fallen body, an adult, job's never done, Frank. Frank looks at the kid for a long second. Frank's mouth on the right side does the small thing Frank's mouth has not done since June of 1981. The thing is not a smile. The thing is the older cousin of a smile, the thing that smiles grew out of, a small private acknowledgement at the corner of a man's face that the universe has, on this one Tuesday, done what the universe should do. Frank says very quietly, that's my boy. They retrieve Cedric. Cedric, on being told that the body in the grass is the body of Lord Voldemort and that the body of Lord Voldemort is dead and that the body of Lord Voldemort will not be coming back, sits down on a gravestone for several minutes and processes the information. Cedric in those minutes asks one question. Cedric says, looking at Harry, was this what the tournament was about? The whole time, was this what you were doing? Harry says, yes. Cedric says, and you knew from the start. Harry says, from the start. Cedric says, why did you let me come into the maze with you? Why did you not just take the cup and go alone? Harry says, because if you had not come, the imposter who put my name in the goblet would have known something was wrong and would have raised the alarm and we would have lost the chance. You being here was, on the imposter's read, a problem he could not solve. You being here is what kept his attention on me long enough for my father to be in position. If you had stayed out, my father would not have had his shot. Cedric says, so you used me as cover. Harry says, yes. Cedric says, after a long second, did you know my father? Harry says, I have met him 3 times this year. Cedric says, did you tell my father? Harry says, number I did not, I will not. I am telling you only because you have asked and because I do not lie to my friends when they ask. I have, however, been instructed by my own father to ask here in this graveyard for your silence. Cedric says, why should I keep your silence? Harry says, because I have just helped to kill the man who killed my parents and ended the threat that killed all of your father's friends and would have eventually killed your father and you, because the killing is over. Because there is nothing for the world to gain by knowing how it happened. Because, on Madame Bones's read, there is something for the world to lose. The world is very quietly going to be told that you and I were attacked in the graveyard by Lord Voldemort and that Lord Voldemort died in the encounter, and the precise mechanism will be left on Madame Bones's discretion vague. The world will be allowed to think what the world wants to think. The world will in time settle on a story it finds acceptable. Cedric says, a lie. Harry says, a redacted truth. Cedric, after a long minute, says, all right, Harry, I will keep your silence. Not because I owe you a favor. Because I do not want the country I am about to graduate into to be a country in which the muggle who killed Lord Voldemort is the next national news story. I want the country to be a country in which Lord Voldemort died and the wizarding world goes on. I will keep the silence for the country, not for you. Harry says, that is the right reason. Cedric, standing up, says, take me home, please. Harry says, we are going. The body of Lord Voldemort, on Frank's instruction, is not left in the graveyard. The body is instead wrapped in a tarpaulin Frank has brought for the purpose, loaded into a borrowed ministry van that Madame Bones has arranged to be waiting at the gate of the graveyard, driven to a small private crematorium in Bristol that is run by a third cousin of Sandy the house elf and whose furnace burns at 1200 degrees Celsius for a sustained 8 hours. The body at the end of the 8 hours is a small jar of ash. The jar of ash is, at 4 in the morning of June 25th, mixed by Frank with a quantity of common iron filings and a handful of salt and a single drop of holy water Frank has been carrying in a small vial since 1981, and the resulting mixture is by dawn scattered at sea from the deck of a small fishing boat 50 miles off the western coast of Ireland. There will be no resurrection ritual. There will be no return. The morning of June 25th, at Hogwarts, the headmaster in his office with the small remaining members of the operation present signs into the official record the following statement. The statement says, at approximately 9:45 p.m. on the evening of June 24th, 1995, the Triwizard Cup at the center of the maze on the Hogwarts Quidditch grounds was discovered to have been illegally enchanted as a portkey to a remote location by a person now identified as Bartemius Crouch Jr., an escaped fugitive operating under the assumed identity of Professor Alistair Moody. Champions Harry Potter and Cedric Diggory were transported by the portkey to the said remote location, where they were attacked by the resurrected body of Lord Voldemort. In the course of the encounter, Lord Voldemort died. The 2 champions returned to the school via emergency means provided by the headmaster's office. Both champions are in good health. Mr. Crouch Jr. is in custody. The Ministry, in coordination with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, will release a public statement at noon. The statement is signed by the headmaster, the deputy headmistress, Madame Bones, Mr. Diggory Sr., and the Minister of Magic, who has been roused from sleep at 3 in the morning by an owl from Madame Bones and informed of approximately 70% of the truth, which is the percentage Madame Bones has determined the minister can safely be entrusted with. Frank Castle does not sign the statement. Harry Potter does not sign the statement. Neither name appears anywhere on the record of the night's events. The afternoon of June 25th, the keeper's hut at the edge of the Forbidden Forest, Frank Castle in his groundskeeper's chair at the kitchen table with a cup of tea is reading the Daily Prophet's special evening edition. The headline says, Dark Lord dead, investigation ongoing. The lead photograph is of the maze on the Quidditch grounds, taken at dawn by a prophet photographer who did not, on Madame Bones's careful coordination, manage to photograph the actual scene of the death. Harry Potter in the chair across the table with a cup of tea is reading nothing. Harry Potter is looking out the window. Harry Potter, at the age of 14, is looking out the window with the long, quiet look of a young man who has just completed a project he has been working on, in some sense, since the age of 1. Hermione Granger in the third chair with her own cup of tea is reading a small handwritten note from Sandy the house elf that confirms that the imposter Moody has under appropriate compulsion confessed in writing to the entire plot and that the confession is on Madame Bones's evaluation sufficient to convict in front of a Wisengamot. Frank after a long quiet minute sets down the prophet. Frank says, "Kid," Harry says, "Yeah, Dad." Frank says, 3 years left at this school. Harry says, 3 years. Frank says, "You can go normal now." Harry says, "Normal?" Frank says, "You can sit at the Slytherin table, you can pass charms, you can study for owls, you can be a student, you can leave the wall there at home. You can let the network shut down, you can spend the next 3 years on books and friends. I will be here, I will be the groundskeeper. I will be 10 meters from the keeper's hut on any given afternoon. I will be a presence and not a hand. The hand is finished. The mission is finished. You are done." Harry after a long second, "I am done with what we set out to do." Frank says, "Yes." Harry says, "I am not done with the work." Frank says, "I know." Harry says, "There are 18 apprentices on the not file. There is a department at the ministry that Madame Bones cannot yet clean. There is a wizard prison full of men, some of whom should not be in it and some of whom should never get out of it. There is a school in the south of France I have been reading about that has, on its grounds, by Sandy's network's information, 3 things that need to be looked at. There is a wizard police force in Australia that on Hermione's read of an Australian magical paper has not had an honest investigator in 4 years. There is..." Frank says, "Stop." Harry stops. Frank says, "You are 14. Harry says, "I am almost 15. Frank says, "Almost 15. Harry says, "Yes." Frank says, hear me carefully. We are not going to take a new list tomorrow. We are not going to take a new list next week. We are going to take, you and me, between now and your 17th birthday, 3 years off. 3 years in which you finish your school the right way. 3 years in which I, as the groundskeeper, sit on my porch and watch you do that. 3 years in which we go fishing on the lake on weekends. 3 years in which you have, for once, the kid year you did not get to have. After 3 years, when you are 17 and a wizarding adult and you have your wand and your degree and your full grown-up voice, we will sit down at this table and we will look at any new list you want to bring me. We will go through it. We will, if it is a list that meets the code, work it if you want my help." Harry says, "You will still help." Frank says, "Kid, I am going to help you for as long as I am breathing. I am going to be in your shadow until I am not. Then when I am not, I am going to be in your bag, in the spare clip you carry, in the small voice in your ear, in the small phrase you say to yourself before a hit. I am going to be in you. That is the deal. I made the deal in November of 1981 in a basement in Antwerp. I am not changing the deal." Harry very quietly, 3 years off then. Frank says, 3 years off. Harry says, "Then back to the list." Frank says, "Then back to the list, if you still want to." Harry says, "I will want to." Frank says, "Then." The kid finishes his tea. The kid sets the cup down. The kid says, "Dad." Frank says, "Yeah." The kid says, "There is a lake in the village. Did you know that? Hogsmeade has a lake. Not the Great Lake, the smaller one behind the Hog's Head. It has trout." Frank says, "I did not know that." The kid says, "It is a 4-mile walk. We could go this weekend." Frank says, "We can." The kid says, "I would like that." Frank says, "I would too." Hermione in the third chair has been very still. Hermione, after a small respectful pause, says, "I can pack the sandwiches." Harry says, "Hermione." "Yes." Hermione says, "I will bring my book." Frank says, "Bring your book." Hermione says, "I will bring the small one Sandy gave me on the secret history of the Wizarding Postal Service." Frank says, "Bring it." Hermione nods. The 3 of them sit for a while in the keeper's hut, drinking the rest of the tea in the warm June afternoon, with the Quidditch grounds visible through the window and the Lake of Hogwarts beyond, and the small private knowledge between them that the work that has occupied them for 4 years is on this afternoon complete, and that there will be sandwiches on Saturday, and that there will be trout, and that there will be, possibly in the years to come, additional lists. But that today is for tea and a borrowed quiet and the long, contented look of a young man at a window through which, for the first time in a very long time, there is nothing in particular that needs to be killed. That night in the keeper's hut, after Harry has gone back to the Slytherin Tower for the last week of term and Hermione has gone back to her dormitory and Frank is alone, Frank takes from the bottom of his duffel bag the small notebook he has carried for 14 years. He opens it to the page on which in November of 1981 in Bay Ridge, in a walk-up over a closed deli with a 14-month-old asleep on a milk crate, he wrote in block capitals the shape of the next 10 years. He turns to a fresh page. He writes in the same block capitals he has used for 14 years, Phase 1 complete, kid alive, kid whole. Piece of soul removed from kid's forehead 18:48 p.m. June 24, 1995. Principal deceased. 8 inner circle deceased. WORMTIL deceased. Confirmed causality 0. Bystanders. Confirmed operational failures 0. Kids next 3 years. School, friends, sandwiches, owing, boat, lake, trout, debt to be paid. Continuing, he closes the notebook. He puts the notebook in the duffel bag. he goes to the porch of the keeper's hut. He sits in the rocking chair. He looks across the grounds at the lit window of the Slytherin Tower 7 floors above the Great Hall. The window is this evening dim. The young man in the window is this evening asleep. Frank sits. Frank watches the window. Frank, who has not in 14 years allowed himself to fall asleep in a chair on a porch, falls asleep in the chair on the porch with the small, honest, dreamless sleep of a man whose work for the first time in a long time is by every measure in good order. In the morning the kid is awake before him and is at the foot of the porch steps with a thermos of coffee and a small plate of toast, smiling. The kid says, "Dad, wake up. Sandwich practice. We have a lake on Saturday." Frank opens his eyes. Frank sees the kid at the foot of the porch steps with the thermos and the toast and the morning sun behind him. Frank says, "Yeah, kid." Frank stands up. Frank, taking the thermos, walking down the porch steps to the gravel path, putting his hand on the kid's shoulder for the short second of a man's daily morning small gesture, says, "Walk." The kid, with the morning sun on his face, with his father's hand on his shoulder, with the work of his childhood completed in his 14-year-old hand, with 3 years of school and a lifetime of further lists still ahead, says, "Walk." They walk. 3 years later, on the morning of Harry Potter's 17th birthday, at the kitchen table of the keeper's hut at the edge of the Forbidden Forest, with the breakfast plates still on the table and the small chipped teapot between them, Frank Castle slides a folder across the table to his son. The folder is plain manila. The folder has on its front, in Frank's careful block capitals, the single word, work. Harry, who has just finished his defense against the dark arts newt with the highest mark recorded in 50 years, who has, on the night of his birthday, gathered with Hermione and Draco and Luna and Cedric and the headmaster and McGonagall and Madame Bones and Sandy in the Great Hall for a small, careful, private celebration of his coming of age that Bones, in her toast, called the cleanest 17-year-old's party I have ever attended, opens the folder. Inside the folder, on a single page in Frank's hand, are 17 names. The first 6 names are, by their occupations, members of the 18 not apprentices, the ones who, in the 3 years since their pipeline's collapse, have not gone quietly into civilian wizarding life, but have instead attempted to rebuild a quieter version of the Death Eater operation under new banners. The next 4 names are, by their occupations, the senior members of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement that Yaxley installed and that Madame Bones, on her own quiet count, has been unable to remove. The next 4 names are, by their occupations, 4 wizards in 3 different countries currently engaged in the trafficking of magical children for the use of dark practitioners, a pattern Hermione has, over the last 8 months, slowly and carefully documented from a small office in the keeper's hut with the assistance of Sandy's expanded house elf network now operating across 4 continents. The last 3 names are blank lines. Harry, looking at the page, says, 3 blank. Frank says, "For names you will find. The work is the work, kid. The work does not run out. We do not have to do the whole list this year. We do not have to do most of it this year. We pick one, we do it right. Then we pick the next. We are slow now, we are old now." Harry says, "You are old, I am 17. Frank says, "You are old enough." Harry smiles small. Harry says, "1. Frank says, 1. Harry says, "I would like to start with the 4 in the trafficking ring." Frank, after a long second, says, "Yeah, kid, that is the right place to start." Harry says, "When?" Frank says, "Tomorrow." Harry says, "Tomorrow." Frank says, "Walk." Harry, standing with the folder in his hand and the late summer sunlight in his hair and the small, honest morning ahead of him, walk, they walk. End of chapter 7. End of book.